Hi, everybody. Before I start my true crime live chats, I prefer to acknowledge the victims of the cases. In this case, it is John O'Keefe. He was a Boston police sergeant who raised his niece and nephew after their parents died in 2013 and 14. And then John died in January 2022 when he was found in the snow on a lawn around 6 a.m. Before we start debating the case details, just a general chat overview. I turned on slow mode, so you have to wait 30 seconds between messages. In my live chats, all types of opinions are welcome. All I ask is that people just be polite, or my moderators will ban anybody being rude or commenting negatively about people instead of chatting politely about the case facts. If you're an adult, don't act like a child. Click on the name of an annoying person in the chat to get the option to block them. I never see hundreds of comments, so use the chat to talk to other people. I try to highlight a variety of comments from a variety of people as I go along. In the top of the chat box, it defaults to show top chat, but you can change that to live chat to see all comments. Finally, I try not to curse, but I cannot promise anything. I do not highlight comments with curses on the screen. Hello again. So today, we're getting right into it. As always, we have the doctors. Dr. Justin Rice, Teri Kun, maybe, K-U-N. She is a vet and DNA expert, Dr. Stonebridge. Then the medical examiner is going to be the longest one at 2 hours and 5 minutes, Dr. Irini Scordi-Bello. Dr. Marie Rusell, who is going to maybe say that the scratches on John's arm are related to a dog. And finally, Dr. Frank Sheridan. I'm not sure what he's going to talk about. As always, I'm going to put it at 1.5 speed so we can try and speed this up. And we're going to get right to it. Thank you for joining. Here we go. Please stand by.
And where is it that you work now?
My current employer is South Shore Health.
And how long have you been working for South Shore Health?
I started there.
And where is it that you work now?
My current employer is South Shore Health.
And how long have you been working for South Shore Health?
I started there in October of this past year, 2023.
And where did you work prior to that?
Before that, I'd been full-time at Good Samaritan Hospital in Brockton.
And how long was it that you worked at Good Samaritan?
Let's see. I started at Good Samaritan in 2010.
Now, sir, if I could, I'd like to just talk a little bit about your educational background. Where did you go to school as far as your undergrad business?
I went to undergraduate at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia.
And what, if any, degrees did you graduate from there?
I obtained a Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry.
And following your graduation from there, where did you go to school after that?
So after that, I attended University of Virginia for medical school. Is that what you asked me? I'm sorry.
And following your graduation from medical school, where did you go after that?
Then I did an emergency medicine residency in Philadelphia at University of Pennsylvania.
And what is a residency, sir?
So residency is this is several years of training, and that's where doctors will specialize. For me, in emergency medicine, some people choose to be surgeons, pediatricians. That's when more of the specialization, if you will, happens in medicine, medical training.
And how long was your residency?
It was 4 years.
And following your residency, where did you go from there?
So I, in 2008, finished residency. I worked for 2 years in Manassas, Virginia at Prince William Hospital for 2 years.
And are you board certified?
I am by American Board of Emergency Medicine, yes.
And what is it that you're board certified?
Specifically emergency medicine.
And when you use that term as far as board certification is concerned, what goes into that? What does that entail?
So when I obtained board certification, it was a two-step process where there was a written exam administered at one of the testing centers. And after you pass that, then there's an in-person oral exam, I guess is what they're called. And that's where you've given like didactic or individual cases. Assuming you pass that, then you're board certified.
And your board certification is up to date currently?
Yes.
Now, with reference to the time that you worked at Good Samaritan, as far as the emergency department is concerned, can you describe to the jury sort of what does the emergency department at Good Samaritan look like as far as staff, bedding, sort of layout, like describe that to the jury?
Sure. So at the time and currently, there's 36 treatment rooms in the main ER, a lot of hallway stretchers as well. There's also an express care kind of area, but for the purposes of this conversation, 36 beds in the main ER. Staffing wise, there'd be anywhere between 4 to 5 and 12 nurses. And for the purposes of this discussion, it would have been 2 docs on, and probably one, either nurse practitioner or physician assistant in the morning.
And as far as the morning I'm going to turn your attention to is the morning of January 29th, 2022. Were you working at Good Samaritan on that day?
If that's the morning of this incident, then yes. Yeah.
And is there a particular shift or what kind of hours would you be working around that time at Good Samaritan?
I'm pretty sure I started my shift at 6 a.m. that day. There was a 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. It was either 2 or 3 to, excuse me. It was either 6 to 2 or 6 to 3 p.m., but the shift would have started at 6 a.m. as I recall.
And on that date at Good Samaritan, do you recall becoming involved with a treatment of a patient by the name of John O'Keefe?
Yes.
And you may approach the witness?
Yes.
I'm showing you a document. If you could just take a look at that and look up on your face.
You want me to look through each page or just acknowledge that
Just as far as do you recognize that to be?
is a transcription or a copy of dictated, and on the front page is also a like a code sheet which was signed off on detailing what resuscitative efforts, as in the specific that were performed on Mr. O'Keefe's behalf.
Thanks. Your Honor, with permission, may the
Yes.
and Your Honor, what I would seek to introduce in a minute as an next exhibit would be a redacted copy of those same records.
Objection?
Now, Dr. Rice, with regard to Mr. O'Keefe, about what time did he come into your facility at Good Samaritan?
Would you like me to look at the chart here? Let's see.
If you can't remember things and you need to reference the chart, you can do that, Doctor.
Okay, thanks. So it looks like, based on the code sheet, first line starting at 0647, so I'll say 6:47 a.m.
And as far as his presentation, Mr. O'Keefe's presentation, when he came into the emergency department, how would you describe his presentation upon his arrival there?
So he would have been, well, he was unresponsive and intubated, as in with a breathing tube into his airway via his mouth.
And as he came into the emergency department, what, if anything, was fixed in regard to CPR or other resuscitative efforts?
So he would have had CPR in progress, and also someone would have been ventilating his lungs via the endotracheal tube.
Now, there's mention within that record as far as a cardiac arrest. Is that correct?
I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't understand what you're asking me.
Let me just ask you, familiar with the term cardiac arrest?
Yes.
Can you describe to the jury, based on your training and experience, what your understanding of that term is?
Sure. So, as in he arrived with in cardiac arrest, which by definition means that his heart was not autonomously or independently pumping blood, or in his case, without electrical activity as well of the heart.
And are you familiar with another term called perfusion?
Yes.
And can you explain what perfusion is and how that relates to the condition of cardiac arrest?
Sure. So, for example, you and I right now, because our heart is autonomously, pumping blood, the heart is the pump and responsible for pushing blood throughout your body, therefore perfusing your body. In a scenario like this, where a patient is in cardiac arrest or asystole, or as in not having any electrical activity in his heart or mechanical activity in his heart, the perfusion that is happening is by CPR, as in the chest being pushed upon, indirectly is, you call it maybe indirectly pumping or moving blood flow. So there is perfusion, but in a significantly limited compared to someone not in cardiac arrest.
And as far as that perfusion process is concerned, what, if any, relation does that have to the organs within the body?
Well, so, if your perfusion is limited, then your organs are not getting the normal amount of blood flow and therefore oxygen and all the other nutrients that your blood is providing. So your organs will begin the process of failure.
We've used the term in there as far as asystole. Could you explain to the jury what you understand that term to mean?
Sure. So asystole would be when you put the electrical leads on a patient's heart, the complete absence of intrinsic electrical activity from the heart would be asystole. So as in not having any observable or detectable electrical activity would be asystole.
Now, as far as these conditions, as far as cardiac arrest and asystole, what, if any, concerns does that raise from a diagnostic perspective in relation to Mr. O'Keefe?
I guess your question with respect to it from a diagnostic perspective, I don't know exactly what you're asking me there.
Let me rephrase that. So with regard to those conditions that are observed and noted within the medical chart for Mr. O'Keefe that you have before you, how would that relate to his condition or sort of how he's presenting and what, if anything, you're doing treatment-wise?
Well, so even with good CPR, the perfusion of the brain, for example, and this is what I think about frequently during resuscitative efforts like this, as in, I couldn't tell you an exact time, but there's a certain, without perfusion of the brain for a certain amount of time, you're limited with respect to, well, the concern is that the patient, even if you resuscitate their body, that there's potentially going to be brain death or anoxia or lack of oxygen to the brain, and a poor outcome with respect to neurological outcome.
Now, as far as the resuscitative efforts are concerned, is there any sort of standard sort of resuscitative protocols that would be undergone with someone who presents as Mr. O'Keefe did?
Yes.
And can you explain what those are?
So, in broad terms, there's ACLS, which is Advanced Cardiac Life Support. That's an algorithm that, through medical training, I've learned and is frequently the algorithm can be adjusted. There's also a ATLS for trauma patients. So there's an algorithm there with respect to resuscitation or guidelines, I guess, with respect to resuscitation.
And within those sort of guidelines or protocols, are you familiar with a medication called epinephrine?
Yes.
How would epinephrine play into sort of the treatment or the diagnosis of Mr. O'Keefe?
So, in the time that I've been practicing, epinephrine is probably the only medication or drug that has persistently been in the ACLS pathway. It's adrenaline. So the idea is loosely that you're attempting to affect upon the heart itself more squeeze, as in more pressure, and also to increase the potential, or if there is electrical activity, to increase the amplitude of that electrical function at the cellular level.
Now, in addition to the cardiac arrest and the asystole, as far as Mr. O'Keefe was concerned, what, if any, presentation did he have related to hypothermia?
So I know his initial temperature was low. I'd have to look, but I can see here that the nursing wrote in their notes that his, I see T equals 80.1 R. So I interpret that to be his temperature was 80.1 degrees by rectal temperature.
And if you could explain to the jury sort of your understanding as far as hypothermia, what is it and how does that present itself?
So, as it pertains to this case, there's a few ways to get hypothermic. If I at 12:20 were to have a cardiac arrest right now and stop perfusing, my current temperature I'm guessing is 98.6, right? A normal temperature. Without perfusion, the body will the core temperature will decrease over time. The specifics of that I couldn't, or beyond my knowledge and training, but does that answer your question?
Yes. And so as far as hypothermia is concerned, is there a certain sort of baseline or what is sort of the typical temperature under which someone would be declared sort of hypothermic or treated?
I don't know if I could give you a definition of medically what a quote diagnosis of hypothermia. I couldn't tell you a number. I can tell you that 80 qualifies as hypothermia, but I couldn't tell you a number under which that definition applies.
But the temperature that Mr. O'Keefe presented with certainly fits within those parameters. Is that correct?
Yes, 80 degrees is very cold.
And as far as resuscitative efforts as they pertain to the core body temperature or the low core body temperature of Mr. O'Keefe, what, if anything, was done with relation to treatment of that?
Sure. So as the nursing note mentions, there's a bear hugger was applied. So that's a blanket that has warmed air being pumped through it. So that's a way of externally warming someone. He also, having reviewed the chart earlier, I don't see it right in front of you. Actually, I take that back. He had warm IV fluids running. So IV fluids not at room temperature, as in a worm or an oven of sorts, would have been given to him via intravenous or central venous access.
And as far as the body temperature is concerned, what any relationship does the body temperature have and the warming process have as to a declaration of deceased in relation to this?
Well, so there's a goal in resuscitative medicine to attempt to rewarm a body. Loosely, the idea being that the heart, among other organs, will function better or function at all in a warmer environment. That's one goal of resuscitation. With him, as I recall, despite resuscitative efforts for approximately half an hour, there was not a significant warming of his core temperature.
And so, sir, with reference to Mr. O'Keefe, at some point, was he pronounced deceased by yourself?
Yes.
And do you see any indication within the chart as to what time that was?
Sure. I'll just need this moment here. According to my note, it looks like the time of death was death declaration was 7:50 in the morning.
Is that 50 or 15?
50.
Now, as far as the observations that you made as far as a systole and the cardiac arrest, did that persist throughout the course of your treatment of Mr. O'Keefe?
Yes.
May I approach the witness?
Yes.
Let me just see that document.
Mhm.
Direct your attention to what's the fourth page in, bottom of it says 2 of 4, and I direct your attention to the top of that page. Do you see that, sir?
Yes.
And as far as this is sort of a listing of observations, or well, let me ask you, can you describe what is listed at the top of that page there?
Sure. So this would have been the physical exam documentation of my note. So with respect to the head, it says, excuse me, the first word is other, which I believe is a function of the computer system. As in, I typed in there right superior orbital ridge region, approximately 7 millimeter laceration, and then with surrounding soft tissue swelling / contusion.
So if I could just stop you there. As far as what you're talking about with the right superior orbital ridge region, could you explain to the jury or demonstrate to the jury?
Sure. So the orbital ridge is the bone above your eye that you can, like where your eyebrow is or would normally be.
And as far as the other sort of things that you noted over the course of your physical exam or review of Mr. O'Keefe, what, if anything else, of note did you observe?
Well, according to my note, the only other kind of observations other than would be that he had breath sounds present bilaterally. I observed that he was pulseless. His abdominal exam was atraumatic on my chart, and then extremity exam or musculoskeletal exam, I wrote that he had superficial abrasions on the right forearm.
And from a medical perspective, when you use that term abrasion, so can you explain to the jury what you understand the term abrasions to mean?
Yeah, I use it as a medical synonym for scratches, if you will.
And under neuro or neurological, there's a listing as far as a GC3, is that correct?
Yes.
And can you explain what that is and what that means?
So GC is what I charted. What I intended to write there was GCS, which is a Glasgow Coma Scale, which is a scoring system to identify someone's level of consciousness or unresponsiveness.
And as far as the 3, where does the scale start? Where does it go to? And where does the 3 fit in?
So there's 3 components: verbal function, motor function, and eye or ocular function. And someone who's completely unresponsive, as in no motor, no verbal, and no eye movement or function, completely unresponsive. The lowest you can get on the scale is 3.
Thank you, sir. May I approach this retreat?
Yes.
Later on over the course of that same morning, did you have occasion to become involved in the treatment of another patient by the name of Karen Reed?
Yes.
And may I approach the witness again, Your Honor?
Yes.
So I'm showing you another document just asking you to look at that. To the extent you recognize it and look up whenever you finish. In general, sir, do you recognize what that is?
Yes.
So what do you recognize it?
The first part I recognized would have been the medical record or medical note with respect to Miss Reed, who was also a patient that morning.
Thank you. Your Honor, the Commonwealth seeks to introduce in a minute the next exhibit, a redacted copy of those records. Now, sir, if you know about what time was it that Miss Reed came into the emergency department at Good Samaritan that morning?
I can tell you from this chart, it looks like that at least the first posted vital signs were from 7:51 in the morning.
And in reference to Miss Reed, what is it that she came into Good Samaritan in regard to? Why did she there?
I'd have to review Daisy's note. So,
Well, let me ask you this, sir. Was it in reference to Section 12? Do you recall?
yes.
And with regard to Section 12, patients that come in regard to that, what kind of involvement do you have, or who, if anyone, do you work with in regard to those types of patients?
Sure. So Section 12, I would define as an involuntary detention of a person, usually for a mental health concern, whether that's self-harm or harm to others, or if someone who's, afflicted with schizophrenia or psychosis, members of the public can bring someone to the police, or members of the public can bring someone to the hospital on a Section 12, which, again, involuntarily detains them for evaluation.
And in addition to yourself, is there other staff? You mentioned that there were physician's assistants or nurses that were working. How much involvement would you typically have with someone who comes in on that kind of prognosis or diagnosis?
I would say, to answer your question, my involvement is variable and dependent a lot of times on what that nurse practitioner or physician assistant feels like they need or want my involvement to be.
And what kind of involvement would you have as far as when someone comes in with that kind of issue? What is sort of the typical protocol or policies that Good Samaritan would undergo with reference to that patient? What are you doing with reference to the patient when they arrive?
I'm sorry, I don't really understand what the question is.
No, understood. Let me rephrase that. So with regard to a patient coming in on a Section 12, what happens with that person once they present in the ER?
So whether they're evaluated by me or a nurse practitioner or physician assistant, if that person feels like, based on their evaluation, that they need a mental health consult or evaluation, then they would have that initiated, as well as what we do for a lot of patients, or all patients' vital signs, and sometimes blood work as well.
And when it comes to that sort of blood work, or say, as far as what's being done with someone who comes in with that kind of report, what is sort of being tested, and what is being looked at as far as the blood work is concerned?
Well, there's a few reasons to get blood work, but in general, part of the evaluation is, with respect to the medical presentation, to make sure there's no medical emergencies present, in addition to whatever the mental health concern may be. There's also blood work drawn with respect to disposition, as far as some people, for example, it would be inappropriate to have a mental health evaluation if, for example, I were intoxicated on alcohol and my alcohol level were elevated, because I think the idea is that you're not getting, a true representation maybe of what's going on.
So am I correct in that someone presents and then there's like sort of you medically clear that person as far as any sort of injuries or anything like that first?
I wouldn't say first necessarily. I think a lot of times these processes happen in parallel.
So in parallel, you have the medical clearance and then sort of a psychological clearance as well?
Sometimes, yes.
And then sort of involved in both of those, there would be blood drawn in reference to Section 12, as far as a typical one would be looking for sort of alcohol and drugs of abuse, things of that nature.
I mean, I'm hesitant to answer yes because of the word typical, because I wouldn't say there's really a typical presentation with respect to mental health presentations in the ER.
And from your memory and or your review of the chart, was that done as far as the blood work done with regard to Ms. Reed on this day?
Are you asking me if blood work was drawn?
Yes.
I believe so. I have to double check. So yes, it looks like there was blood work drawn.
And among the things that were tested within the facility, within Good Samaritan, was an alcohol screen. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what is the result of that alcohol screen that's contained within those records?
Do I answer or no?
Yes.
So it looks like 93.93. I'd have to maybe look deeper in the chart to tell you the units of that measurement. I don't want to guess. So to answer your question, 93.
May I approach this briefly on?
Yes.
I'm directing your attention to a tab portion of that.
Sure.
Do you see the units that 93 pertains to contained within that record, sir?
So yes, it looks like it's milligrams per deciliter.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I have no further questions of this witness, Your Honor.
Right, Ms. Little? Good afternoon.
Hi.
You testified that you treated Ms. Reed when she arrived at the hospital on January 29th, correct?
I don't know if I testified that I treated her, but I was involved in her care. Yes,
You actually wrote the reports regarding her care, correct?
that is not correct.
Would it refresh your recollection to take a look at the report?
The report, I believe we're talking about the note, the emergency room note was written by a nurse practitioner.
Would it refresh your recollection to take a look at some additional reports from January 29th?
Sounds like you want to show me some reports, so sure. Yep, okay.
Is your recollection refreshed? Do you recall treating Ms. Reed on January 29th?
I do not.
Do you recall writing a report that has your name, Justin Rice, on it from January 29th?
No, it depends what you define report as. To best answer your, well, do I recall writing this note? No. Is that what your question was?
So is it your testimony that do you recall treating Ms. Reed at all?
No, I don't.
Do you recall actually ordering her blood in this case?
No.
Do you recall sending it out to the labs at all?
No.
As you sit here today, you don't know who collected the blood?
That's correct.
You don't know who packaged the blood?
That would also be a fair assessment, yes.
And you don't know who submitted that to the lab?
Correct.
And it wasn't you, correct?
I can confidently say that I did not collect blood work. I did not do that.
Okay. You testified that you treated Mr. O'Keefe upon arrival on January 29th, correct?
Yes.
Did a firefighter ever approach you on the morning of January 29th and tell you that he had information suggesting that the victim had been struck by a vehicle?
Objection.
Do you remember that?
I do not.
So if a firefighter indicated that he informed you that he had information suggesting that Mr. O'Keefe had been in some sort of vehicular accident, that's something that you would have included in your report, correct?
I don't know if that's a fair assumption.
But as you sit here today, you have no recollection whatsoever of anyone telling you that the victim had appeared to be in some sort of car accident, correct?
Well, I think, I don't have it in front of me, but I think my note that I prepared for Mr. O'Keefe states that per EMS for.
Sorry, so I don't think he finished his answer.
So I think that what I was trying to say, right, was that on my note it says per EMS report. So one of the medics, as in one of the folks on the ambulance who brought Mr. O'Keefe in, again, I'm not right in front of my note, but as I recall, it said something to the effect of per EMS report, the patient may have been struck by a vehicle.
Well, can I show you a copy of that report?
Please. All right, so
I'll ask the question. Is your recollection
course.
fresh?
yes,
Is there anywhere on that report that says that the patient came in and there was a statement by EMS that the victim appeared to have been struck by a vehicle?
just give me a moment to read through the. So no, there's not.
In fact, there's no mention of a vehicle whatsoever, correct?
That's correct.
Dr. Rice, did you observe Mr. O'Keefe's injuries when he arrived at the hospital that morning?
I guess you'd have to define what observe injuries means.
Well, during the course of your treatment, did you inspect him for injuries?
So, yes,
You testified that you observed certain abrasions and scratches on his right arm, correct?
yes.
Aside from his injuries to his right arm, and I believe you described sort of laceration above his eye, John O'Keefe did not have a single other injury on his body from the neck down, correct?
I don't know if that's fair to say.
Well, you didn't report a single injury to his shoulders, correct?
Correct.
You did not report a single injury to his chest, correct?
Correct.
You did not report a single injury to his torso, correct?
Correct.
You did not report a single injury to his back, correct?
Correct.
You also did not report a single injury to his ribs, correct?
Correct.
No injury to his hips, right?
Correct.
You observed no injury to his knees, correct?
I reported no injuries to his knees. Correct.
No injuries to his shins, correct?
Correct.
No injuries to his ankles, right?
Correct.
And no injuries to his feet.
Correct.
From the neck down, he did not have a single broken bone, right?
I don't know if that's a fair assessment or a statement.
You certainly didn't notate in your report that he had any broken bones from the neck down, correct?
No, I did not. I'd happy to explain that, but to answer your question, no, I did not.
You did not report a single fracture from the neck down, correct?
I did not report a single fracture. Correct.
The injuries that you testified to today were that he had sort of a laceration above his eyelid, correct?
The injuries that I testified to today, correct. Yes.
And the scratches on his right arm.
On the right forearm. Yes.
No further questions.
Okay, Mr. Lally?
Dr. Rice, with reference to fractures or broken bones, can you explain sort of why that may not have been noted or why that wasn't included within the chart?
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to. So with a patient like Mr. O'Keefe who came in, the focus of myself and the team of physician assistant, nurse practitioner, and nurses, whoever was helping in a case like this, the focus is in core resuscitative medicine, of securing an airway, making sure he has a breathing tube in, making sure that the CPR is being applied the right pressure to the right place, making sure that the core resuscitative elements of medicine are happening, unless as in the mind can only focus on so much. So I think in cases like this, because the attention is on resuscitation of someone's heartbeat, their life, there's less focus on injuries or observations that don't coincide with the resuscitation effort or not pertinent to that resuscitative effort. If that answers if that answers your question.
So in that vein, it's not like you're doing x-rays or a full skeletal survey or something like that.
No, we're not doing a full skeletal survey. No.
Because you're more concerned with the fact that his body core temperature is 80, his heart isn't pumping blood, and he's pulsing, correct?
Correct, unless there was an extremity injury that would be pertinent to his resuscitation. If he had had a traumatic amputation, as in removal of a leg, for example, that would be pertinent to a resuscitation. But an otherwise intact extremity, that is not necessarily within the realm of resuscitation.
Can I approach the witness?
Yes.
I'm going to direct your attention on document gets discharged and clinical impression. If you could just read from that, look up when you finish. Read to yourself.
Let's see what you'd like me to read out loud.
So as far as the chart is concerned, as far as your clinical impression of Mr. O'Keefe, can you read sort of what you...
Sure, right. So I wrote clinical impression, cardiac arrest, head trauma, exposure to environmental cold.
May I approach this retriever?
Yes.
No further questions.
Anything further, Ms. Little?
No further questions.
All right, thank you, Dr. You are all set.
Thanks.
Morning, ma'am.
Morning.
Could you please state your name and spell your last name?
It's Teri Kun. It's Terikun.
And Ms. Kun, please, what do you do for work?
I work for UC Davis at the Veterinary Genetics Lab in the Forensics Unit.
And what is your job title there?
My job title is Forensic Scientist, DNA Technical Lead. My UC classification is SRA4.
And that UC classification as far as SRA4, what does that mean?
Oh, Staff Research Associate.
And how long have you worked there?
Almost 25 years now.
And I'd like to talk a little bit about your educational background, starting with undergraduate. Where did you go and what have been your degrees?
So I went to Sacramento State, or California State University, Sacramento. I received a minor in chemistry and a biological science degree in molecular biology.
And following receiving those degrees, where did you go education?
I went to UC Davis and I received a Master of Science degree in Forensic Science DNA.
And was that prior to you joining the lab there, or what, if any, relationship to that?
I actually started my job at the lab after my undergraduate degree in 1999, and I started my postgraduate degree, I believe, in 2009 and finished in 2011. So I was actually already working at the lab at that time.
Now, with regard to the forensic program at UC Davis, what training role did you have in sort of creation of that lab?
I was actually one of the people who helped establish our forensics program in our lab, and I currently help with all the training, and any future forensic scientists that we employ, I do their training as well.
Now, have you been invited to speak at any sort of conferences or things of that nature in regard to your work in forensic science?
Yes, I've spoken at the California Association of Criminalists, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, the Northwestern Forensic Sciences, and Rural Livestock in the Western states.
Have you been published in this particular area?
Yes, I've published 7 times, most of them in Forensic Science International Genetics.
And when it comes to those publications, are you familiar with the process called peer review?
Yes.
And can you explain to the jury sort of what that process entails and how that implicates things that are published?
So anytime we go to publish, we put out an article to whatever publication we would like to, and it goes through a peer review process, which the article is sent out to peers in our industry, and they review our work to see that it is solid. And if they approve it, then the article does get published.
Now, over the course of your years with the lab at UC Davis, how many forensic samples of DNA have you tested?
Oh, in the thousands.
Now, if you could describe to the jury the type of work that your lab performs.
So we have 2 sides of our lab. We have a service side, which provides diagnostic testing, parent verification testing, and then we have our forensic side. We do animal parent verification as well. We also do match comparison, which we compare samples to see if they're coming from the same source, and we do species identification.
Now, what kind of cases do you typically see like in the lab?
We can do anything from homicides to helping people see if remains are their lost pet to provide closure for them.
And what are the sort of different types of agencies that you've done work for over the years of your work at the lab?
We've worked for police agencies, humane agencies, animal control agencies, and even private individuals, anybody who believes they can use our services.
And the lab that you work for, UC Davis, is that lab accredited?
Yes, it is. It's accredited. Oh, sorry.
Answer my next question. As far as the lab accreditation, can you explain to the jury sort of what that process is and what's entailed in accreditation?
So our lab is accredited by a group called ANAB, and that's the American National Standards Institute National Accreditation. They accredit labs to ensure that the policies and the procedures that we're following, they set a standard for those, and they come and check our standards. Are we meeting those standards? And it's also the same standards that most crime labs are associated with.
Now, in reference to that, labs that do DNA testing specifically and only in regard to humans, the accreditation that your lab has versus the accreditation that those types of labs have, what many differences is there?
There's no difference. The accreditation is the same.
Now, if you could explain to the jury, what exactly is DNA?
So DNA is the blueprint of your life. It's what makes your eye color what it is. It's makes your hair color, how tall you're going to be. And you get one half of that from your mom and one half from your dad.
And where is DNA found?
So DNA is found in most cells. It's in the nucleus of the cell. You get one copy of DNA per cell. There's also another kind of DNA called mitochondrial DNA. And in a cell, that is found in the plasma of a cell, and there'll be thousands of copies of mitochondrial.
And if you could explain sort of the difference between mitochondrial DNA versus what would you classify the other type of DNA?
So nuclear DNA is, again, that individual type of DNA. It's the DNA where we could say that that's you or that's a particular animal, and it would be a statistic of 1 in 3,000 or 1 in 350 million type thing. Mitochondrial DNA actually runs along the maternal line. So if your mom and you have a couple kids and a grandma there, they would all share the same maternal type.
And how is DNA used in forensic science?
For what we do in forensic science for animal DNA, we use it for parent verification. We use it for determining if 2 samples come from the same source, and we use it for species identification.
And is DNA testing just generally accepted in the scientific community?
Yes, it is.
And can you explain to the jury sort of DNA typing, that process? How does that work? What is it sort of specifically that you do?
So the main steps are when we get a sample, we need to lyse open those cells. That DNA is in the center of the cell, those mitochondria are there, but they're protected by a cell wall. So our first step is to lyse that cell wall and release the DNA. Once that is done, we want to see how much DNA that we have. And so we have something called qPCR or quantitative PCR that allows us to tell how much of that nuclear DNA is in a sample. From there, we would go to a DNA typing. As you can imagine, if you only have 1 copy of DNA in a cell, it would take a lot of cells to be able to visualize that DNA. So we have to go through a process of making multiple copies. We use something called pointers. It tells us what parts of the DNA that we're looking for that can vary from species to species or from test to test of what we're trying to do. And we amplify that in a process called PCR. And that can be kind of, you could think of it like a photocopier. Every time it goes through a cycle, it makes a copy. So if we start off with 1 copy, we get 2. From 2, we get 4. 4, we get 8. And by the end of this cycling, we have millions of copies that actually allow us to be able to visualize that DNA. And then the last step is actually visualizing it. The DNA actually has to run through a matrix. It's kind of like a sponge with all the little holes. Small pieces of DNA go out first, and we can see those first, and the larger pieces of DNA come out last. So it's allowing us to both see the DNA, and it separates it by size.
And did you do the forensic testing with regard to samples that were submitted to your lab in this case?
Yes, I did.
And as far as those steps that you just described, are those the steps that you followed in regard to this?
Yes, they were.
And do you have sort of standard procedures for what you do in the lab?
Yes, we have standard procedures or SOPs that we follow for all of our work that we do.
So fair to say in this case, you followed those same sort of standard procedures and protocols?
Yes, I did.
Now, what if any efforts are taken in your lab to preserve the evidence or prevent contamination?
So what we do to preserve evidence, prevent contamination, one of the things we use is a bleach product. So anytime we're using a surface, be it for sample collection, doing PCR, doing the extraction, we're wiping down everything with this bleach product, doing our work, and then wiping it down again. Samples are stored according to what we have. So dry evidence is stored in a locked cabinet. Wet evidence, such as blood, is stored in a fridge. Tissue is stored in a locked freezer. The fridge is also locked as well. So they're also kept in their original packaging, and they're sealed, and they're only unsealed and used when they're being actually manipulated for sample collection.
And what samples did you receive in this case?
In this case, we received 2 swabs.
And just a moment.
Yes.
Sir, may I approach the witness?
Yes.
I'm just going to show you a series of 7 photographs. I just ask you to look those and then
What?
in just in general terms, you recognize what's depicted in those 7 photographs?
Yes, this is the evidence that we received.
And those photographs that you would have taken as you were unpacking the samples in this case?
Yes, and they contain a sticker on there that has our case number, the date we received it, and my initials.
May I approach again, Your Honor?
Yes.
I will introduce them as the next exhibit.
Thank you.
Ms. Kuhn, now place before you, what I place for you, on the mark as exhibit 7480. With regard to the first exhibit that you have before you, what's up on the screen? Is that what you have before you as exhibit 74?
Yes, it is.
Can you describe to the jury what we're looking at in this particular program?
So this is the evidence that we received. The little sticker on the bottom is the one that we applied at our lab. It includes the case number, the date, and my initials. And we do this to ensure that, so that we can show that this is how the evidence arrived. It arrived in a sealed and packaged manner.
And the following exhibit number 75, that's essentially another photograph of the same packaging, is that correct?
So it's the same packaging, but it's the back of the packaging, because in this instance, that actually shows where the evidence was sealed as well, and the date as well.
And who, if anyone, or what entity did you receive this package from?
Can I look at my notes? I don't recall the exact entity.
Yes, you can.
So the client in this case was the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office, Adam Lilly.
And so, but as far as the samples from whom you received, was that the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab?
They were the people I was in contact with about sending them. We consider the client is the one who submitted the sample on our submission form.
But the person who physically sent the sample from one lab to the other was the MSPCL, is that correct?
Let me look at their form here. There was a form that came with it as well. Let me find it. So yes, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Department of State Police Forensic Services Division Crime Lab was the one who submitted the samples to our lab.
And are you familiar with, or did you have any conversations with a forensic scientist at the State Police Lab in Massachusetts named Maureen Hartman?
Yes, I did.
Is that someone that you have worked with on prior cases in the past?
Yes, I have.
Now, if I could direct your attention to the next exhibit before you, number 6. Again, what's up on the screen is that what we have for you?
Yes.
And if you could just describe to the jury what we're looking at.
So that brown packaging you saw before, this was actually what was inside of that brown packaging.
And the next exhibit.
And this is that same item that was inside, but the back side of the packaging. And that shows the 2 swabs that were contained inside that packaging. And that was the first swab that we selected for testing.
What's contained in those photographs, is that a fair and accurate portrayal of what you received and sort of how you delineated those items as far as labeling them by your case number?
Yes, it was.
And for the case number, as far as the FCD and the number, sort of how was that determined, or what is that?
So FC always refers to forensic case. In this case, D is for dog because they were asking for dog DNA testing. If it was C, it would be for cattle. F would be for feline, but the FC is always the beginning part. The third letter always kind of denotes what species we're looking for.
Now, pursuant to receiving those particular items, are you also given any sort of identifier as far as from the outside lab or the external vendor, as far as what label they have for the sample, where the sample came from the outside lab?
We did receive a piece of paper that with the submission saying it was taken from a shirt.
And do you recall specifically what the item number was or where it was swabbed on that shirt?
No, do you remember that?
I do not know. It would be on that piece of paper, I believe.
Would that also be delineated somewhere within your report and your findings?
The case number would be in our findings.
And I'm sorry, not specifically in your findings, but within the context of your report. With that,
In the report, the case number that they gave us is listed in the report.
Your Honor, you have your report with you now?
Yes, I do.
Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would ask that the witness be allowed to refer to the report.
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
And I'm sorry, what is that?
Did you want the case number there?
The case number,
the-
the item number.
So the case number was listed as MSCLP number 22-02184, item 7-18.16.
Now, with reference to these samples, did the samples arrive as you expected as far as the packaging and things of that nature?
Yes, everything was arrived sealed, and as you saw, that was documented in our with our photos, and it's also documented in my notes.
Did you test all of the samples that were submitted now?
Yes, we did.
And what is it that you were asked to
We were asked to determine species via canine qPCR. qPCR is that quantitative PCR that tells us how much DNA is in a sample, and it is specific for canine because the next goal they asked is if we could develop a DNA profile to possibly use for a comparison with a reference sample to be submitted later. If we weren't able to see anything with canine DNA there, we were asked to do our species test called Meat ID.
Now, first, with reference to the sort of nuclear DNA testing that you did, what were the results of that initial test?
For the canine qPCR testing, we did not see any canine DNA.
And when you say, just if you could explain to the jury or expound upon that, as far as what are you looking at and what are you seeing or not seeing that leads you to that?
So the canine DNA we're looking for in that is that nuclear DNA, that DNA that's used for an individual, because the idea was if we see canine DNA in the quantitative qPCR, then we know we have canine DNA on that swab, and we can try and use that to develop the DNA profile for a later comparison.
Now, per the questions that you were asked or what you were asked to test, upon not finding any canine DNA from the PCR test or the qPCR test, what if any steps did you take for the test?
The next test we performed was our Meat ID test. It's a general species test. It tests for 12 species altogether. They would include dog, cat, bison, cattle, horse, sheep, goat, mouse, rat, pig, and rabbit. I'm pretty sure I got them all, but I can't guarantee.
Now, and I'm sorry to jump around here a little bit, but when going back to sort of the qPCR testing, can you explain to the jury sort of what is it, what type of instruments are you using and what exactly goes into that process?
So we're taking the sample and we're using primers that concentrate, that point to a small piece of DNA for canine, and it's supposed to amplify it. And every time it's amplifying, it's actually releasing a color, fluorescent color that it's measuring. So if there's canine DNA, this fluorescent color keeps popping up, and it gives it a measurement in which it will tell us how much of the canine DNA we have. But in this case, the test did not see any fluorescence for canine DNA, so it was a negative result.
And then as far as when you say canine DNA, is that dogs specifically, or what if anything else will be included within canine?
In this qPCR test, other canines will work, or canids will work, like wolves, coyotes, and we are now doing some further testing on foxes, but we have not concluded those tests.
Now, as far as the Meat ID test that you're talking about, that sort of second, can you explain again to the jury sort of what is involved in that and what are you doing with regard to that?
So the Meat ID test actually targets the mitochondrial DNA, which makes it a little bit better. There's, like I said, there's 1,000 mitochondrial in a cell versus that one nuclear DNA, so it's a lot more there. It's also a circular piece of DNA, so it's a little bit more hardy. It sticks around. And we have regions of the mitochondria that are specific to each of those species that I listed. And if we have, let me see this here. We have pointers that actually will give us 2 different peaks. If we get 2 peaks that are both for pig, we have a pig result. If we get them 2 peaks for dog, we have a dog result, or the same can go for any of the species that we have. If we only get 1 peak, then we don't quantify that as being a positive result for that species.
And so you would need more than 1 peak in order to make that sort of opinion or qualification as far as species goes?
Right. We always have to have the 2 peaks for the species that we're getting results for.
And so with regard to Meat ID testing that you did with these swabs, these 2 swabs, what if any results did you receive, or what if anything did you observe on completion of the test?
So for both the swabs, we did see pig. And we also actually I did a little bit of a test where we only concentrated on the dog portion of the Meat ID. You can think of it as when we have all 12 species there's a lot of competition going on. By just concentrating on the dog Meat ID, it eliminates all the competition. It gives us a better chance of getting a result if there is canine DNA there, and that result was negative. So the only result we got for both those swabs was for the pig.
And so again, just to be clear, as far as the canine was concerned, there was not even 1 peak?
There was absolutely no canine DNA.
Now, as far as the pig is concerned, what, if anything, could that be from?
I don't know where that could come from. That would be speculation on my part. It's a sensitive test, I can tell you. So yeah, it would depend on where that shirt had been and what the person had been doing with it.
My question, I guess, is if it, as far as the source, could that be from beyond just an animal? Could it be from some other source such as food or something like that?
Yes, it could be from food. We have tested the Meat ID test. In fact, that's what it was developed for, was for testing food products. And so we've seen it come from cooked pork, cooked bacon, in terms of pig. I do remember those were tested specifically.
So Ms. Kun, just lastly, just to be crystal clear, from your testing in regards to both qPCR and the Meat ID testing, there was absolutely no canine DNA that you observed on the 2 samples that were submitted to you from the State Police Lab, Massachusetts.
That's correct. We observed no canine DNA.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
All right, Mr. Jackson.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Newman.
Hi.
Just to finish that thought, to start off, there was no canine DNA detected in your testing, correct?
Correct.
So when you say there's no canine DNA, that's a little bit of an overstatement, correct?
There was no canine DNA in the swabs that we tested.
Exactly. Okay, perfect. So the Massachusetts State Police did not send you any actual items of clothing or cuttings or source material, did they?
No, they did not.
As a matter of fact, the only thing to be tested were the swabs that you received, those 2 swabs that we saw very nicely photographed.
Yes.
You'd agree that your analysis of those swabs is only as good as the starting material with which you have to work, correct?
That would be correct. I only have the swabs to test. That's the only thing I can talk about.
So the integrity of any DNA testing has to start foundationally with the proper recovery techniques for what's being tested, what goes on the swab.
I have no idea how the agency collected the swabs.
So you're left, I guess the next question would be, you're left to assume that proper techniques were used to swab the source material.
Yes.
And for forensic scientists, that assumption may not always be valid.
Well, in cases cases can vary for us. Sometimes we get the actual source material. Sometimes we do get the swabs. It's dependent upon the agency sending it in. It depends on their policies and procedures, which I cannot dictate.
Right. So that because if the swab is not collected properly, or the source material is not swabbed properly, then you're left with sort of a garbage in, garbage out analysis, right?
But I wasn't there to see the swabs being collected, so I have no idea. I couldn't comment on that.
So that answers my next question. You were not present when the swabs were taken, correct?
No.
You couldn't oversee the collection of those swabs.
No,
You didn't take the swabs yourself.
No.
Okay. And you never did receive any of the source material from which those swabs were taken.
no, only the 2 swabs.
You do understand very clearly from your testimony and UC Davis, University of California Davis lab, and the impressive work that y'all do, you do understand proper protocols for evidence collection, correct?
Right, when we do collection at our lab.
For one thing, you keep proper logs, correct?
Correct.
As a matter of fact, in your report, there's a log, a couple pages of logs that literally detail down to the minute when somebody touched those swabs, correct?
Correct.
That's because it's important to maintain those types of logs to avoid contamination on the one hand, right?
I don't know if keeping the logs prevents contamination.
That's a fair correction. The logs would give you an idea of who touched something when, and if there was some contamination, you might be able to work backwards to figure out how that contamination occurred.
Correct.
That's why the logs are in place, correct?
It's to be able to see step by step where everything was going.
It maintains a very, very specific chain of custody.
Correct.
So everybody that touches those swabs or that item is going into an evidence locker or coming out of an evidence locker or being tested. That's highly, highly regulated, and it's marked on a log.
It's documented in my case notes and it's documented on our internal chain of custody.
So there's literally multiple documents that dictate, that memorialize the movement of that evidence, right?
As it goes through our lab, yes.
Right. And your lab, that those criteria include the time that something was touched,
Yes.
the place where it was touched.
We don't document the place.
Meaning it was taken out of this particular locker and put on.
Oh, yes.
The person that manipulated those items or that.
Yes.
Okay. You were asked about the processes that your lab undertakes to avoid or reduce contamination.
Correct.
You were asked that by Mr. Lowry under examination. You call that.
Yes.
You went through what your lab and the accreditation process, the protocols that you would employ to make sure that contamination is reduced, hopefully to a minimum.
Yes.
But you don't know what any other lab might employ in terms of their reduction of contamination processes.
No, I don't know this.
And you specifically don't know what the Massachusetts Crime Lab did or didn't do with this subject material before you got the swabs.
Correct.
You don't know if they took any steps, as a matter of fact, to reduce contamination of the source material before the swabs were taken.
I don't know anything about how they took those swabs.
You agree that, for instance, if the source material had been tossed on the bottom of an animal's floor, that could encourage contamination of that source material.
Objection.
Can you answer that question?
I don't know because we haven't tested that sort of thing.
Well,
It's an interesting question. I do agree, but we have not done any validation, which would be able to prove that sort of thing.
well, I guess what I'm asking is if the item is supposed to be not contaminated, right? It's supposed to be relatively pristine, and it drops on the floor, that might encourage contamination of that particular item. It's supposed to be left as pristine as possible, correct?
Again, I don't know the history of the item, so I couldn't speak to it.
All right, so I think you have to move on from that.
If in fact the source material was not packaged properly, would that encourage contamination?
But I didn't see how the items were packaged.
I'm not asking that. I'm asking you hypothetically. If an item, a source item, is going to be tested, is not packaged and handled properly, that could encourage contamination, correct?
I have not seen that. What I've seen when something's been packaged incorrectly is I've seen the induction of mold growth, which has prevented bacteria, which causes bacteria, which eats away at DNA. So it doesn't give me contamination, but it does mean that I don't see DNA.
There might be, if something is handled inappropriate, for instance, if something is handled sloppily before it's tested, it might reduce the validity of the ultimate test that's undertaken, correct?
Objection.
I'm going to sustain that.
There are certain proper swabbing techniques involved in the preparation of a swab, correct?
Yes,
That includes wearing gloves, using clean tools, correct?
correct,
It includes proper documentation of the swabbing.
correct,
The documentation might include the location or the description of exactly where the item was swabbed, is that right?
correct.
That would be helpful in your analysis to know exactly where something was swabbed.
No,
What about any visible markings to show where swabbing was taken? Is that normally done?
again, it varies from lab to lab what we get. I unfortunately can't dictate what every other lab does. They all have their own policies and procedures, and we work with labs across the United States and the world.
If you were swabbing something in your lab, which is an accredited lab, would you encourage marking exactly where something was swabbed so it can later be documented?
If when I swab things in my lab, I actually circle on the item. There's a note with the case number, my initials, the date, and also a ruler present in the photo.
So if we have to go back in your circumstance that you just described, if we have to go back and try to replicate exactly where that swab was taken, you can do that.
Yes,
And you think that's obviously an important protocol.
that's the protocol in our lab.
So the swabs that are used are sterile swabs, obviously.
Yes,
In fact, Isn't it true that crime labs discourage, for the purposes of DNA swabbing, discourage the use of swabs with wooden sticks because they can encourage contamination as opposed to plastic sticks?
I have not heard that.
The swab is supposed to be moistened, right?
I do suggest that people moisten with water in order to make a better transfer.
And that needs to be distilled water, sterile water. right?
Sterile water.
And you swab over an area of interest, and then generally you would photograph the area that's being swabbed, correct?
I do.
You would want to air dry that swab
Yes.
before you package it. Is that right?
When I do my collection, I don't need to air dry my swabs because the next step is actually the extraction process. So I'm not doing collection and then pausing. I'm doing collection and starting my extraction.
When you, as a matter of fact, when you're collecting biomaterial, tissue samples, for instance, blood, other biomaterials, you would not want to package those in plastic because that would encourage some sort of mold growth.
Mold and bacteria, yes.
So it's discouraged putting blood, for instance, in plastic containers.
Correct.
You certainly wouldn't put blood material that you're working with in non-sterile containers, would you?
Objection.
Would you put biological material in non-sterile containers?
Objection.
I'll allow that.
We don't have, everything that we use is sterile. All of our tubes that we would use, or once we do a collection, we put it in a tube for the extraction process. Those tubes are autoclaved and they don't have contamination. They are sterile.
You would use a solo cup.
I'm sorry, what?
Objection, Your Honor.
Solo cup.
The objection system.
You would maintain a strict chain of custody over that item to ensure the integrity and the admissibility of that cleaner.
I did, yes.
And I think we've covered this. You may have answered this already. That your personal protocol is that you actually photograph where everything is being swabbed from, correct?
Correct.
If there was DNA present on a source item, and it wasn't sampled properly or swabbed properly in the right spot, then that DNA would likely not be detected, correct?
I don't know why, I don't know the circumstances or why you would swab things, in a specific spot. I know in my lab how we do things.
What I'm asking is, if you have a source material and there's DNA over here and it's swabbed over here, you would expect this swab to detect that DNA.
That's correct.
Objection, Your Honor. I'm sorry.
That's fine. I'll allow it.
What information were you provided about these two particular samples?
I wasn't really provided any information. I had to work with the person from the crime lab asking about what they wanted to test and try and narrow down the testing in terms of species, simply because it helps us make sure that we're directing the testing in the correct way for the answer that they're, or for the question that they're answering. So knowing the species in this case was important. It also made it so that we made sure that the testing was affordable as possible.
Understood. Would it be important for you to understand the condition of the material that was being swabbed as you engage your analysis?
I'm not-
Condition meaning, was it clean? Was it dirty? Did it have blood on it? Did it not have blood on it? Things of that nature.
No, since we don't get to choose how evidence is given to us, nice and clean with nice and clean DNA would be perfect, but that's not our perfect world we get samples from. So
Hardly ever happens, does it?
no, it hardly ever happens.
It would be important, however, to know whether or not there were obvious inhibitors on the source item when it was swabbed.
Knowing that there's dirt would be helpful, or possibly blood, because those can inhibit, but not necessarily. We don't necessarily have to know that ahead of time.
Were you told in this instance that the swabs were taken from a garment that had blood on it?
No.
Is blood an inhibitor?
It can be, yes,
Is garment dye an inhibitor?
yes,
Were you told that there was blood on a dyed garment when you received swabs?
No.
Your report indicates that the swabs that you did test, these two swabs, quote, did not indicate the presence of canine nuclear DNA, but did indicate the presence of inhibitors, end quote, correct?
that was in our qPCR.
You explained that, quote, this result is obtained when either, number one, the canine nuclear DNA is degraded, is that right?
Correct.
Number two, is, quote, obscured by inhibition, end quote.
Quote.
Or number three, there is no canine nuclear DNA present, correct?
Correct.
So in your report, you indicated that there are three reasons that you list for the possibility of not finding or not detecting the canine nuclear DNA in that sample.
Correct.
Two of those three reasons allow for the idea that the DNA is actually present, but it's either obscured by inhibitors or it's so degraded that it can't be detected.
The nuclear DNA.
Right? But it still could exist.
It could, yes,
It's just not, you can't see it if it's obscured, and you can't see it if it's just degraded.
correct.
Explain how an inhibitor works in your testing.
Excuse me, an inhibitor just actually stops the PCR process from happening, and so therefore you would see no results.
So did you find inhibitors in this sample?
In the nuclear DNA testing, yes,
And was that the qualitative Polymerase chain reaction test, qPCR test?
yes,
And in fact, an inhibitor is pretty much any chemical that's literally going to inhibit the enzyme from helping make the copies.
correct,
Certain dyes inhibit,
yes.
and certainly blood inhibits.
Heme from blood, yes.
And because of that, at least in that sample, the nuclear DNA sample, you're not saying that there was no canine DNA there. You're saying that the testing did not detect it.
In the qPCR nuclear test, correct.
And you've heard, obviously, there's a famous quote in science: "The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence." Right?
Correct.
Can you describe to Jewish what that phrase means?
Objection.
Sustain.
It means just because you don't find something means it's not there.
Objection.
Sustain.
said on direct examination that could come from a number of sources, including food sources, right?
Correct.
Could come from dog treats.
Pardon me? Yes.
Could come from dog treats. Dog treats that are pig ears.
Objection.
Allow it.
I believe so.
Or it could be that the shirt that was the source material was contaminated and not properly preserved.
I can't say where that DNA came from.
You're not aware of any feral pig populations in Massachusetts, are you?
I'm not.
Dog saliva would obviously be a good and rich source of DNA, correct? Do you agree?
It depends on the context. We have cases where, I mean, I can refer to 2 cases that we did recently where there were small bites and we were able to get nuclear DNA from those sources.
Because it was probably saliva.
Yes,
Right. So saliva contains active, living, growing cells that slough off in the salivating process, right?
correct.
That's why oftentimes for 23andMe or other companies, they want you to swab it inside your cheek.
Right.
DNA, right? So that's a relatively rich.
It depends on the amount of contact in the attack.
However, dog claws, the claws would not be a good source of DNA, would they?
No.
And the reason for that is because the claws are like human fingernails. They're made of keratin.
Correct.
Keratin is dead, hardened cells, and not a good source of DNA.
Not in terms of scratching. We can do something where we polarize them and we can get DNA from them then.
You have to have a claw.
Generally, yes, we have to have the claw material.
I spoke over it a little bit, but I want to make sure we're clear about that. You're talking about you can DNA in a mitochondrial test if you have the claw and polarize the claw.
Correct.
Possible to find DNA. But in terms of touch DNA,
We don't.
very difficult to find from a claw.
I really can't speak about touch DNA because it's not something we tested or validated in our lab.
So you didn't have any claws that you tested here,
No.
but you were just testing swabs from shirt.
Correct.
And you've already agreed that keratin is not a good DNA source because it's dead. So it's not
Correct.
alive. Would you agree that one of the reasons that it's difficult to detect canine DNA, it was difficult to detect canine DNA in this case, is because it was potentially degraded? Right?
Objection.
Ask the question differently.
Sure. In your report, you indicated that there were 2 obvious possibilities of not detecting the DNA. One was obscuring because of inhibitors, and one was degradation. The DNA would be too big.
Again, that was for the nuclear canine DNA.
Understand that? So to be clear, in your you're not saying, you're not testifying today that there was no dog DNA on that source shirt. That you're saying that the 2 swabs that you got did not detect the DNA, correct?
In our meat ID test, we also have a test for an IPC. It's the same initial internal positive control. And that's what did not work in the nuclear testing. It did work, and it worked very well in ID. So there wasn't any inhibition that we were seeing on the meat ID test.
But that's the ID test that you found.
Right, but it also was testing for dog at the same time.
But when you tested for dog for nuclear DNA, that test was either inhibited or so degraded that you couldn't tell.
For the nuclear test, yes.
Thanks. That's all I have.
Okay, Mr. Lally.
Ms. Kuhn, on that last point, it was, when it pertains to the nuclear DNA testing, was either inhibited, degraded, or wasn't there. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, as far as samples in your line of work, are you typically going like outside of the lab or going out to like a scene or anything like samples in that regard?
No, everything is sent to us.
So when you're collecting from a sample, it's done in the lab setting. Is that correct?
And if we get the item, we're collecting it. But we have times in this case where the samples are sampled at the other crime lab, and then we just get those samples. So it happens both ways.
Now, if you recall, what if any conversations did you have with Ms. Hartnett or anybody from the Massachusetts State Lab in regard to the swabbing of the collection process?
Objection.
I'm going to allow it.
I gave her our basic swabbing practice. Even though they are a crime lab, I would assume that they would know what they were doing, which would be to swab with a sterile swab, using sterile water, allowing the swab to dry completely, and then packaging in paper and storing at room temperature before sending it to us.
And when you received it in those, so 7 photographs before you, was the packaging that you received, was that appropriate? Was that what you expected?
Yes, it was what I expected.
And you described on direct, as far as the mitochondrial DNA testing in the meat ID as being hardier DNA, is that correct?
So yes, the mitochondrial DNA is a hardier DNA. There's a lot more of it when we're testing for nuclear DNA. Like I explained before, there's only 1 copy of DNA in a cell, which is for the mitochondrial cell. There's thousands. So you can have a lot more there. It makes for a better test, at least in terms of species. It's just a more sensitive test.
And there were no inhibitors or anything like that in the mitochondrial meat ID testing that you did?
No, the IPC worked very well.
May I approach this Richard?
Yes. Did you have anything further, Mr. Jackson?
Very good.
Okay.
You indicated that you gave Ms. Marty Hartnett certain protocols to follow in terms of her swabbing and recovery. Is that right?
Yes.
Are you aware that Ms. Hartnett had also failed certain of her proficiencies?
Objection, Your Honor.
And I am going to strike that, and the objection sustained.
Thank you.
Nothing further.
All right, you are all set. Thank you very much. Could I see counsel just briefly, please?
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you shall give to the court and the jury in the matter now pending shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Thank you.
So once you sit, I'm going to tell you that you have to keep your voice up. We want to keep our air conditioning on. So just if you'd speak loudly into the microphone, that would be great. Yes, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Lally.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Could you please state your name and spell your last name for the jury?
Yes, my name is Renee Stonebridge. Last name Stonebridge, Stonebridge.
And what do you do for work?
I am employed through the Chief Medical Examiner's Office at Boston as Director of Cardiac and Neuropathology and Medical Examiner.
Now, if I could ask you just a few questions about sort of your educational and work history background, if that's all right.
Yes.
Starting with your bachelor's degree, where did you go and what, if any, areas did you receive a degree in?
So I went to SUNY at Stony Brook in New York. I was a double major in biology and Germanic languages and literature. I graduated with a Bachelor's of Science degree. After that, I went to the American University of Antigua for medical school, and I graduated with honors, magna cum laude. After that, I did a 4-year combined anatomic and clinical pathology residency program at NYU Winthrop Hospital in Long Island, New York. After that, I did a 1-year forensic pathology fellowship at the Boston office of the Chief Medical Examiner. And after that, I did a 2-year neuropathology fellowship program through Brown University at Rhode Island Hospital.
And doctor, are you board certified?
Yes, I am board certified in anatomic pathology, clinical pathology, forensic pathology, and neuropathology.
And if you could just explain to the jury a little bit about what does board certified mean?
Board certification means that every medical specialty has their own board. So for example, the American Board of Pathology dictates whether or not you can be board certified based on certain criteria. So you have to meet certain criteria, meaning that you have to complete a certain number of surgical specimens, a certain number of autopsies. And then once you meet that criteria, you can take an exam, which if you pass, leads to your board certification.
Now, if I could ask you just a couple, and your board certification is up to date at this point, is that correct?
Yes.
In each of those areas that you just spoke of?
Yes.
Now, if I could ask you some general terms as far as if you could define them for the jury. First of all, what is pathology in a general sense?
Pathology is essentially the study of any sort of disease or abnormal state of the body tissues. So anything that can go wrong in the body and any of the body systems is essentially the study of pathology.
And now starting with anatomic pathology, what is anatomic pathology more specifically?
Anatomic pathology consists of the study of surgical specimens. So for example, if someone goes to the hospital to have a tumor removed, that specimen will go to pathology. The pathologist will look at it, cut it, look at specimens under the microscope, order any ancillary tests if necessary, and then make a diagnosis, which is then conveyed to the clinician. Anatomic pathology also consists of cytopathology, which is looking at individual cells, and then it also consists of autopsy pathology.
And as far as clinical pathology, what does that mean?
Clinical pathology is anything that is lab-related in pathology. So if you have to get blood drawn and then the results come back, that is clinical pathology. If there's any sort of blood work that needs to be done, for example, if you're going to have a surgery and they have to cross-match and type you in case you have a blood transfusion, that's considered clinical pathology. Also microbiology, so anything infectious. So essentially anything that goes through a lab is clinical pathology.
And what is forensic pathology?
Forensic pathology is the study of autopsies in a medical legal sense. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be something that is legal. Sometimes it may be just a person who has not seen a doctor in many years, dies at home. There's no physician that is willing to sign a death certificate. So we work on those types of cases plus anything that is not natural.
Now, neuropathology, what is that?
Neuropathology is the study of the brain, spinal cord, eyes, muscles, and nerves.
And if you could, just again, in general terms, as far as casework is concerned, related to your work as a director of neuropathology, can you explain to the jury sort of what it is that you do with respect to neuropathology?
Yes. So my job primarily entails me to be a consultant for the medical examiners. So the medical examiners have a certain set of criteria that they follow in order to determine whether or not a brain needs to be saved for a neuropathologic analysis. So upon following that criteria, if the brain is saved, it gets put into formalin, which essentially fixes the brain so it firms it up, so it makes it easier to analyze. So after the brain has been fixed, I usually let them fix about 2 weeks. Sometimes it could be a little more, a little less, depending on circumstances. I will then look at the brain, take photographs of it from all sides, and then cut the brain, take photographs, document any sort of abnormalities. And then if I feel the need to take sections to look at under the microscope, then I will take those sections. They will be processed through histology. I will look at the slides. Sometimes you may have to add in additional testing, for example, immunohistochemistry, to see if there's anything in particular that you cannot maybe diagnose solely on looking at the histology. And then once that is done, I will issue a report to the medical examiner, and then they use it in terms of determining their cause and manner of death, if necessary.
Now, as far as that formalin process, as far as the solution is concerned, is there a typical time period that the brain would have to be in that solution prior to you examining it or cutting it or any of those other things?
Usually about 2 weeks, give or take maybe a few days here and there, but I usually try to let them fix at least 10 days minimum.
And again, in general terms, with respect to the types of cases that are referred to you, what types of cases are typically referred to you?
So part of the criteria that we use is that any cases for children or babies under the age of 2 years, those always come to me. Also, if there is any cases that have blunt head trauma that may be suspicious or homicidal in nature, those will typically come to me as well. Some of the other cases may be just a difficult neuropathologic entity that a non-neuropath trained medical examiner may not be able to really diagnose. And then sometimes there's cases that are just surprise cases where the medical examiner opens up the head and they see something interesting or abnormal, and they decide to save that case for me to look at further.
Now, with respect to the cases that you do see, at some point did you become involved in analysis or testing of a brain belonging to John O'Keefe?
Yes,
And who was the doctor that was the medical examiner that made that referral in this case?
it was Dr. Irini Scordi-Bello.
And with respect to your analysis here, obviously you looked at the brain. What, if any, other sources of information did you review, or did you look at in ultimately formulating your opinion in this case?
So at the time when I was able to cut the brain of Mr. O'Keefe, I had information that was relayed to us from our intake department. So when a case gets called into the medical examiner, it gets taken by the intake department, and they're given kind of just a rough summary of the case. I also had the police report, I had the EMS report, I had the medical records from when Mr. O'Keefe was in the hospital. I also had medical records from the primary care physician. I had autopsy photos, and I also had, I believe just refer to my notes here because I had a lot of notes. I also had the inventory and tracking sheets, which are notes created by the medical examiner, and the neuropath request itself.
Now, are you familiar with some terms in relation to injuries that you would observe as far as from a neuropathological perspective, as far as injuries being acute, subacute, or remote?
Yes.
And can you explain to the jury sort of what those are and what those mean?
So it depends on circumstances. Acute generally is something that happened within a very short time frame. So when I refer to something as being acute, I usually refer to that as something that's occurring from the time of an injury to maybe a day or so afterwards. As I said, it's variable, dependent on circumstances. Subacute is something that has not happened within the last few minutes, few hours, maybe even a day, and maybe something that is now in the process of healing. And then chronic is usually something that has happened a while ago in the past. You may see some sort of evidence of some type of injury in a chronic state. You may also not see any evidence because it may have completely healed by that point.
And so from your analysis in this case, how did you characterize, in your opinion, from everything that you reviewed as far as the injuries you observed in Mr. O'Keefe's brain?
The injuries I observed were acute injuries, meaning that they probably occurred minutes to hours.
Now, if I could turn your attention to your findings as far as when you conducted your analysis and your testing in this particular case, what, if anything, did you find as far as injuries to Mr. O'Keefe's brain?
So when I look at the brain, what I do is I look at all surfaces from all sides. And one of the things that I look for is anything grossly obvious, meaning anything I could look at the brain and see that there's something there that shouldn't be there. So one of the first things I noticed was a subarachnoid hemorrhage. And subarachnoid hemorrhage is something that occurs when you have bleeding within the leptomeninges. The leptomeninges are a very thin membrane that encase the brain and the spinal cord, and there should not be blood freely floating within the leptomeninges. So if you have a subarachnoid hemorrhage, most of the time the causes are either a ruptured aneurysm, which is something I would see upon cutting the brain, or some type of trauma. So that was the first finding.
Can I stop you there just for a second? Of those taking notes and for our court reporter, could you spell the type of hemorrhage and the membrane?
Yes. Subarachnoid is SUBARACHNOID. And leptomeninges, LEPTOMENINGES.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Now, with regard to anything related to the aneurysm that you indicated that you would have seen, what, if anything, did you see during the course of your review or testing or analysis of Mr. O'Keefe's brain?
So aneurysms are typically seen in the cerebral vessels that sit around the base of the brain. So there's something called the circle of Willis, which is the main arterial supply. It sits around the base of the brain, and it's kind of shaped like a circle that has vessels that come off that extend to other areas of the brain. So typically, if there is an aneurysm that is ruptured, it's going to be located somewhere in one of those vessels. So upon observing those vessels, I did not see any evidence of any aneurysm or any sort of natural disease state that might have led to a rupture in one of these vessels. Also, sometimes these vessels, since they do go deep into the brain, you may only see the rupture upon cutting the brain. And I did not see any evidence of any rupture of any of these vessels anywhere in the brain.
Now, as far as the subarachnoid hemorrhage that you observed, where was that located within the brain, if you could?
So the subarachnoid hemorrhage was on the frontal poles, which is essentially right here in the front of the brain. So the frontal lobes obviously sit in the front, and then the poles are the very frontmost portion of the brain. So it was on the frontal poles. It was also on the left temporal pole. So the temporal region is right here in the temporal region. And because of the way that the temporal lobe is shaped, it kind of has a little loop right in the front. So it has a pole as well. So it was on the left temporal pole. And then it was also in the left lateral fissure. So you have a frontal pole here. You have the temporal lobe right here. And then the lateral fissure goes kind of in between the temporal and the frontal lobes. So you have the hemorrhage here, and then hemorrhage right there. So it's kind of all concentrated almost in one area. But then there was also hemorrhage of the posterior surface of the right temporal as well, so on this side.
Now, doctor, I'm probably going to butcher this horribly, but just as far as the bilateral unci, are you familiar with that?
Yes, so the unci are the medial portion of the temporal lobes. So the brain is essentially oriented in a way that each hemisphere, the right and left hemisphere, are the same. The unci are the most inner portion of the temporal lobes. So the unci sit just next to the brainstem. So if you have anything that causes herniation of these unci, they start to push inwards onto the brainstem. So say this is the brainstem, here the unci, they start to push in. And because the brain is within the skull is hard, you have no room for any sort of expansion of the brain. If there is herniation, it will start to push in that area because the brainstem turns into the spinal cord and goes out of the skull through the foramen magnum. So you have this hole about this big or so at the base of the skull where the brainstem turns to the spinal cord, then comes out. So that's one of the only areas in which the brain can actually move because it's encased in the hard skull. So if you have herniation, it'll start to push and then push downwards.
Could I ask you to spell unci?
UNCI.
And with reference to this bilateral unci area, what, if any, herniation did you observe?
So when the unci herniate, it can be subtle. Sometimes if it's herniated enough, you may see hemorrhages in the brainstem. And this happens because this tissue is now pushing on the brainstem and it's essentially being compressed. So there was herniation noted, and then there was hemorrhage within the brainstem.
Now, if I could ask you, doctor, just to be familiar with the term, or medical term known as a contusion.
Yes.
And can you explain just in general terms to the jury what you understand that term to mean?
So a contusion is essentially a bruise. It's blood that's coming out from a blood vessel. It's the blood vessel that has been broken in some way, and now there's blood coming out.
And are you also familiar with another term, part of that term, known as a punctate contusion?
Yeah, so punctate is essentially just a way to describe the size of a contusion. When I say punctate, I need something that's very, very tiny, almost just like a dot.
And with respect to punctate contusion, what, if anything, did you observe in the O'Keefe's brain, and where was it located?
So there were punctate contusions in the frontal and temporal cortices. So frontal, once again, is the front portion right here. Temporal is kind of right behind it in this area. And the cortex is the gray matter of the brain. So it's a thin strip that kind of just goes around the brain. And then the white matter is underneath all that. So in traumatic injuries, you can see punctate contusions or even larger contusions in the cortex. It usually indicates that the brain has been pushed against something, which is now causing these little blood vessels to rupture, hence seeing the contusions because the blood is no longer contained in the blood vessels.
Now, doctor, with regard to the subarachnoid hemorrhage, is there anything that you're able to do as far as measuring that?
It's hard to measure because it's usually pretty vague. It's not usually something that is a well circumscribed, meaning I could say it starts here and ends here. A lot of times a subarachnoid hemorrhage, because it's sitting in this space that it's not supposed to be in, it can spread. So it may be thicker in one area, thinner in another. So you may have some that may appear just as a very faint hemorrhage, and then some that might be very thick, which you can physically measure. So I usually just give an area where it is and say it's here, it's there, because it's almost like measuring something that has blurred edges. You can't really get a completely accurate measurement.
And what, if anything, were you able to observe or measure with regard to subarachnoid hemorrhage in the area of the left prefrontal lobe?
So it appeared thicker in that area, meaning that as opposed to it looking just like a faint red color that should not be that color, it was actually thick enough that it was obscuring the underlying brain parenchyma.
If I could turn your attention, doctor, just back for a moment to the punctate contusions that you were testifying about before. As far as your observations of those, was that one or more than one, or how many did you observe?
So there were multiple. There were multiple contusions to the point where it's not something that you can count. I mean, you could count it, but it would probably take a very long time. If it had been something like 1 or 2, 3, 4, maybe a handful, it would probably be something I would say there are 3 here, 4 there, but there were so many that it didn't serve a purpose to count.
And the number of those, what, if any, significance does that have in regard to your analysis, your observations, or your opinion?
So given that there's multiple, it means that there's enough pressure in the brain that there were many surfaces that were pressing on the bony prominences of the skull, which was leading to a lot of blood vessels rupturing, causing these contusions.
Now, I think you've talked a little bit, but just in general terms, if you could describe for the jury, what is a hemorrhage?
So a hemorrhage is essentially blood that's coming out from a vessel. So it's like a bruise. Hemorrhage, bruise, contusion, they're fairly similar. Some people use them interchangeably, but it's essentially blood that's no longer contained in a blood vessel.
When something is termed medically, based on your training experience, as a diffuse hemorrhage, what does that mean?
So diffuse means it's over a very large area. It's not something that's just a tiny little area. You could say, okay, I'm looking at this person's, let's say, liver, and there's a 2 by 2 centimeter hemorrhage sitting right there in the right lobe of the liver. Diffuse would mean there's hemorrhage throughout nearly the entirety of the liver.
Now, with regard to, you made a note as far as there being a diffuse hemorrhage within the pons, P-O-N-S, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury sort of what that means and where is that located within the brain?
So the pons is part of the brainstem. So the brainstem starts right in the middle of the brain, and you have the midbrain, the pons, the medulla, and then it turns into the spinal cord. So the pons is kind of in the middle of the brainstem. And when you have hemorrhage in the pons, in this circumstance, it was because there was the herniation of those unci, which began moving closer and closer towards the pons, pressing on it, causing hemorrhage, because now the tissue is compressed. The blood is not going to be able to flow in and out freely, therefore hemorrhage.
Now, with regard to the totality of what you reviewed in this case in regard to Mr. O'Keefe, be able to form any opinions to a reasonable degree of medical certainty in regard to the injuries that you observed to Mr. O'Keefe's brain?
I was able to determine that these are acute traumatic injuries. I know that based on what I observed and in combination with the autopsy findings, that this is due to some type of trauma.
If I could ask, as far as you have certain findings as far as an intraventricular hemorrhage and occipital horns of the lateral ventricles, correct?
Yes.
If you could please explain to the jury what exactly does that mean?
Yes. So the ventricles are almost like a tunnel system of the brain in which the cerebrospinal fluid flows through. So the cerebrospinal fluid serves as a fluid that nourishes the brain. It provides a flow of nutrients, oxygen, things like that. And it starts in the frontal portion of the brain, and then it goes backwards towards the occipital, which is the back. And it also flows downward through the brainstem and then into the spinal cord as well. So the occipital horns of the lateral ventricles are in the back of the head, and having hemorrhage in those areas and in any area of the ventricular system is usually indicative of some type of trauma. So there should not be blood freely flowing within the ventricular system.
Now, Dr. Stonebridge, with regard to your findings, you mentioned that your findings were that the injuries were acute and that the injuries were the result of trauma, correct?
Yes.
What, if anything, can you say or can you opine as to the mechanism for those acute traumatic injuries?
It was something that required some type of force, given that there were skull fractures. I can't say what type of force or how much force, but it was definitely something that caused some type of force, which led to the skull fractures and then the subsequent brain findings.
And the brain findings in particular that you made, were those consistent with the fall?
They can be, yes.
Can they also be consistent with being struck by a vehicle and then going to the ground?
Yes, they can be.
Thank you, Doctor. I have no further questions.
You're welcome.
Cross-examination?
For questions, thank you.
You're welcome.
Doctor, thank you very much. You are all set.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
Could you please state your name and spell your last name for the jury?
My name is Irini Scordi-Bello. My last name is spelled Scordi-Bello.
And how are you employed, ma'am?
I am employed as a medical examiner.
And for whom are you employed?
I'm employed by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
And how long has it been that you've been medical examiner for the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Massachusetts?
I have been with OCME in Massachusetts since December of 2016.
Now, ma'am, if I could take you back and just ask you a few questions regarding your educational background, work history a little bit prior to working at the OCME in Massachusetts. If I could start with your undergraduate work, as far as where did you go and what, if anything, did you receive a degree?
I completed a bachelor's degree in microbiology at the University of California.
And after receiving that degree, where did you go from there?
I went on to the University of Miami, where I completed my doctorate degree in immunology. And following that, I moved up to New York City, where I went to medical school. I completed 4 years of medical school at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine. And following medical school, I completed 3 years of pathology residency at the Mount Sinai Hospital.
And then following your residency at Mount Sinai, where did you go from there?
And from there, I went downtown in New York City, and I completed a 1-year fellowship in forensic pathology at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the City of New York.
And following that 1-year fellowship there, where did you go from there?
I worked in New York City until 2016 when I moved here to Massachusetts.
Now, are you board certified?
Yes, I am.
What are you board certified in?
I'm board certified in anatomic pathology and forensic pathology.
And if you could explain to the jury just briefly, what does it mean to be board certified and sort of what is entailed in that process?
Board certification is actually a voluntary process that a physician decides to go through. It involves completing an accredited program in the specialty of choice. In my case, it was pathology and forensic pathology, and then completing a number of requirements as well as taking and successfully passing exams, and then being able to say that you're board certified.
And is that certification at this time, is that up to date?
Yes.
Now, with regard to the time that you've been working as a forensic pathologist, are there any organizations that you belong to in relation to your work in that field?
Yes, I am a member of the National Association of Medical Examiners.
And that's an acronym as far as NAME,
NAME.
is that correct?
Yes.
Now, with respect to that time frame as well, what, if any, experience do you have in regard to teaching the areas related to your field?
I've always been interested in teaching. I started teaching as a pathology resident, teaching other residents and medical students. And during my time in New York City, I enjoyed teaching medical students and residents. We had a very active education program in New York City. So I've always been involved with teaching both pathology and forensic pathology.
Now, to those terms themselves, if I could ask you briefly just to describe to the jury as far as pathology in general sense, what does pathology mean?
Pathology is a specialty of medicine, and pathology looks at disease processes and as well as trauma and the effect they have on the human body.
And what is forensic pathology?
Forensic pathology looks at disease processes and injuries in the human body and tries to determine the cause of death in deceased individuals.
And as far as anatomic pathology, what exactly is it?
Anatomic pathology, as opposed to clinical pathology, is it has to do with any organ that is in the body versus clinical pathology that deals with fluids and blood analysis and things like that. So anatomic pathology, a lot of anatomic pathologists are surgical pathologists. That's another term that you will hear. These are pathologists in the hospital that look at tissues under the microscope and they come to a diagnosis, whether something is benign or malignant. And forensic pathology takes anatomic pathology to another step, to another level by looking at the whole body and trying to determine the cause of death instead of organ specific. Instead of just looking at one organ, forensic pathology looks at the whole body.
Now, you're also familiar through your work and training experience in regard to forensic pathology with the term called autopsy.
Yes.
And is that something that typically you would do in the case of for your investigation and your analysis in regard to a pathological analysis when it came to a body or a patient that comes in?
Yes, an autopsy is a procedure that we do to determine the cause and manner of death.
And so, doctor, with respect to an autopsy, maybe a term that's pretty well understood, but if you could explain in general terms as far as when a body or a patient comes in to the OCME, as far as what is an autopsy, what is involved in it, and sort of what does that consist of?
Yes. When a case, a death is first reported to the medical examiner's office, we make a determination as to whether that death falls under our jurisdiction. Cases that fall under the jurisdiction of the medical examiner include all violent deaths, all deaths that are due to not natural causes, all accidents, intoxications, deaths of babies and children, and deaths in individuals that were not under the care of a physician when the death occurred. So once a case is accepted and it falls under our jurisdiction, it is given a numerical number, and then the body is transported from either the location of the death or the hospital to our facility. Our facilities, we have 3 facilities in the state of Massachusetts. Once the body comes to our facility, then there are a number of steps that are taken. The body is processed. What that means is that their pictures are taken, a weight is taken, a height is taken. Everything is input into our computer system, and then a determination is made as to whether an autopsy is required in order for us to determine the cause and manner of death. If the answer is yes, then we proceed with the autopsy.
Now, as far as an autopsy is concerned, there are 2 sort of primary components of that as far as an external examination and an internal examination. Is that correct?
Yes.
And can you describe to the jury in general terms sort of what the process is in reference to both external and internal?
Yes. So the autopsy or the postmortem examination has 2 main parts. The first one is the external exam, and it is basically what it sounds like. We do a very thorough exam of the outside of the body. We document physical characteristics, eye color, hair color. We document any scars or tattoos that may be on the body. We take pictures, we make notes, we look for any signs of disease and any signs of injury. All that is, as I mentioned, documented. And once we're, during the external examination, sometimes we will take evidence. We will collect hair and nails from the body we think that is necessary or warranted. And once the external examination is done, then we proceed to the internal examination. That involves making surgical type cuts on the body, what's known as the Y incision that goes from shoulder to shoulder and down the middle of the body. And the organs of the neck, the chest, the abdomen are examined thoroughly, again, looking for and documenting signs of disease or signs of injury. We do the same thing with the head. The head is open, the brain is removed, and we document any disease or injury.
Now, turning your attention to January 31st, 2022, did you have occasion to perform an autopsy in regard to a patient of a body of John O'Keefe?
I did.
And do you recall which of, you mentioned there were 3 different offices of the chief medical examiner within the state of Massachusetts, correct?
Yes, it was in the Cape Cod office.
Is that the office that you typically work out of?
No, that's not the office I typically work out of. My permanent position is in the Westfield office in Western Massachusetts. I was covering the office that day because we were short-staffed.
And in the reference to the autopsy that you performed with regard to Mr. O'Keefe, was that in conformity with what you were speaking about just before, generally as far as how we conduct autopsies?
Yes.
Now, during the course of the autopsy that you performed in reference to Mr. O'Keefe, during the course of the external examination, what, if anything, did you note in reference to that external examination of Mr. O'Keefe?
First, I noted that there was evidence of medical intervention. Mr. O'Keefe's body was transported to our facility from the hospital, and he had evidence of attempted resuscitation. After I documented that, I proceeded to document some injuries that I saw on Mr. O'Keefe's body.
And before we turn to that, if I could just ask you a couple more general questions. You've made some mention earlier in your testimony as far as the cause and manner of death in general. That's 2 things that you're trying to determine during any sort of forensic pathological examination, correct?
Yes.
And what I'm going to ask you first is just in reference to manner of death. Can you describe for the jury sort of what are the different types of manner of death and how are they sort of classified from a perspective from your office?
Okay. Yes. So the manner of death are the circumstances that led to the cause of death. The cause of death being the disease or the injury that initiated the sequence that led to the fatal events. So the manner of death is circumstance dependent. There are 5 general manners of death or 5 umbrellas. The first one is natural. When we determine manner of death to be natural, it means that the death was caused exclusively by natural disease. That would be heart disease, liver disease, cancer, aging, Alzheimer's, dementia, etc. The second manner of death is accident. That means that the cause of death was due to an injury or due to an intoxication, either a physical injury or a chemical injury. But the circumstances show little or no evidence that that intoxication or that injury was intentional. So most motor vehicle accidents, most drug overdoses, most elderly falls are classified as accidents. The fatal outcome was not intentional. Homicide is a manner of death when there is injury inflicted by another person, but there is evidence that there was intent to cause fear, harm, or death to the other individual. And suicide is due to either an injury or an intoxication. And again, the circumstances and the evidence suggest or point strongly to the fact that that was a self-inflicted, intentional act on behalf of the person with the intent to cause harm to themselves or cause death to themselves. So most hangings, intentional overdoses by prescription medications are classified as suicides. And then we have, one more manner that we call undetermined. Some jurisdictions, they call it could not be determined. That means that evidence pointing towards one set of circumstances or one manner is no more compelling than evidence pointing towards another manner of death. So if we don't have enough information to know whether something, or to be able to determine the circumstances, then we are left with an undetermined manner of death.
Now, am I correct in stating that the cause of death is something that's more like a medical determination? Is that correct?
Yes, the cause.
So watch the leading questions, Mr. Elliott. Sustained.
How would you characterize the determination that you make in regard to a cause of death?
The cause of death is based on my findings at the time of autopsy, along with any medical information that I may have on that deceased individual.
Now, as far as the manner of death, how are you making that determination?
The manner of death, as I mentioned, is circumstance dependent. I make that determination based on investigative information that is provided to me by law enforcement, by the people who did the investigation.
And what, if any, legal determination are you making as far as when you classify something as either of those 5 categories in a manner of death?
I'm not making a legal determination. I'm making a medical determination.
And so as far as the medical determination is manner of death, specifically when I'm talking about something that could be ruled or listed as manner of death as accident, is that, what if anything, what if any determination are you making as far as that is?
I'm making the determination that the information that I have either shows no evidence or very little evidence that the injury that led to the cause of death was intentional. So I don't have any information to suggest that that was an intentional act.
And am I correct in saying that routinely people charged with, say, motor vehicle homicides, it gets classified as a manner of death as accident, correct?
Objection.
Sustained.
May I approach him?
Yes.
Doctor, I'm showing you the documents as you review it about we finished.
Yes,
And you recognize that document, Doctor?
I do.
And what do you recognize that to be?
This is a copy of the death certificate for Mr. John O'Keefe.
That's signed by yourself, is that correct?
Correct.
And as far as the listing related to cause of death, what did you list as cause of death on Mr. O'Keefe with regard to his death certificate?
Cause of death was blunt impact injuries of head and hypothermia.
And with reference to manner of death, what, if anything, did you list on Mr. O'Keefe's death certificate in relation to manner of death?
I listed could not be determined.
And as far as that listing for could not be determined, if you could explain to the jury why it was that you have that listed as manner of death with relation to Mr. O'Keefe.
Again, the cause of death is something that I can determine by the autopsy. I did the autopsy on Mr. O'Keefe and determined that he had injuries to his head as well as signs of hypothermia. So the combination of those two was the cause of death. The manner of death has to do with the circumstances under which Mr. O'Keefe sustained those injuries. And I did not have enough information to be able to determine whether those injuries were accidental or not. And so my manner of death was undetermined or could not be determined.
And just on the spectrum that you had just talked about, sort of the 5 different manners of death, fair to say that you did not determine that this was either suicide or natural causes, correct?
Correct.
And so as far as your determination of manner of death being could not be determined, Which of the two were you sort of in between?
The two manners of death that remain are accident and homicide.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Scordi-Bello, you had made reference as far as cause of death being a blunt force injury. Is that correct?
Correct.
At least one of the contributing causes. If you could explain to the jury sort of what you understand that to mean as far as what is a blunt force injury.
Blunt force injuries are caused by any blunt object. That is a very big category of objects. A microphone could be a blunt object. This bottle, if heavy enough, could be a blunt object. The ground can be a blunt object. So anything that doesn't have a sharp edge or a razor edge, not a knife, not a scalpel, is a blunt object. Blunt impact injuries are categorized into contusions, which are bruises, abrasions, which are scratches, fractures, which are a break in the bone, and lacerations, which are tears in the skin. So when we say blunt impact injuries, we could be referring to any of those or a combination of those four types. And all those are the result of impact of the body with a blunt object.
Now, we'll get more into specifics in a moment, just in general terms as far as from your external examination of Mr. O'Keefe's body, whereabouts sort of geographically on the body did you observe these blunt force injuries?
The majority of the blunt force injuries were to the face and the head, as well as to the upper extremities, the arms.
Now, starting with Mr. O'Keefe's head, what was it specifically, or where was it that you observed blunt force injuries to Mr. O'Keefe's head?
Okay, I observed a number of different injuries on Mr. O'Keefe's head, starting with his eyes. He had hemorrhage or bleeding on the upper eyelids of both eyes, as well as swelling of the eyes. He had a small laceration, a small tear in the skin on the right eyelid, again associated with the bleeding. He had some abrasions. Abrasions are superficial scratches on the skin on the left side of his nose, I believe. And when I looked at the back of Mr. O'Keefe's head, he had a laceration, a tear in the skin that was surrounded, or it was associated with an abrasion, a scrape.
Now, in terms of the extremities, and I'll start with upper extremities as far as his arms, what, if anything, did you observe in regard to blunt impact injuries to his arms?
He had, on the right upper extremity, he had a number of somewhat linear, somewhat patterned abrasions, scrapes, varying sizes, ranging from small, 2 to 3 millimeters to, I believe, 5 or 6 centimeters, both on the upper arm and part of his forearm. He had some contusions or some bruising on the dorsal aspect of the right hand that I measured and documented. He had he had a very small abrasion, I believe, on the lower extremities near the right knee, but I would have to look at my notes to be absolutely sure.
You can go ahead and look at your notes anytime you need to, Doctor.
I can go into my notes?
Yes.
Okay. So as far as his extremities, I noted a 3 centimeter superficial abrasion to his right medial upper arm. That would be the medial aspect, would be the inner aspect of the right arm. I noted the abrasions on his posterior right arm and forearm. Those ranged from 3 millimeters to up to 7 centimeters. I noted 2 red contusions on the dorsal aspect of the right hand. Again, that's the back of the hand. A faint abrasion, a faint scratch on the dorsal aspect of the left hand, and a small 0.5 centimeter abrasion on his right lateral knee, on the side of his knee, on the right side.
Now, I think you've defined it fairly well so far, but I'm just going to ask you, just for delineation purposes, if you could explain to the jury sort of what is the difference between an abrasion versus a contusion versus a laceration.
Okay. An abrasion is a scrape. It's a scrape of the superficial layers of the skin. A contusion is a bruise. So if I hit myself hard enough on my nightstand, and I break blood vessels under the skin, then I can end up with a bruise or a contusion. A laceration is a tear. Not necessarily a cut. There's a distinction between a cut and a tear. A tear in the skin is due to a blunt object, maybe the corner of the nightstand that's sharp enough to tear my skin, but not so sharp as a blade that would actually cut the skin smoothly. So we differentiate between lacerations and cuts because cuts are due to sharp objects, lacerations are due to blunt objects. And fractures are basically a break in the bone, again, due to blunt trauma.
Are you familiar with what is termed as an incised wound?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Incised, I-N-C-I.
Incised, yes.
if you could explain the difference between sort of the mechanism and sort of what you observe between a laceration and an incised wound.
Yes. So an incised wound is what I previously called a cut. So the analogy I like to give is if you have a loaf of bread and you're trying to cut the bread. If you take a very good bread knife, sharp knife, you will be able to smoothly cut the bread. If you take a hammer, which is a blunt object, and you try to cut the bread, you're going to shred it up. So an incised wound is a smooth cut. Knives, razors will cause incised wounds on the skin. A blunt object will cause a laceration. It will break the skin, and the edges will not be uniform, and there might even be some bruising around it.
Now, with respect to the injuries that you talked about as far as the abrasions on Mr. O'Keefe's right arm, how was that located in reference to sort of the circumference of the arm? And what I'm asking there is, was it on top, on the bottom, or everywhere?
I describe them as being on the posterior right arm and forearm. So when we examine a body, we examine the body in what's known as the anatomic position, which is the body on the table with the palms upwards. And so the posterior right arm and forearm would be what would be facing the table as the body is laying on the table, the backside of the arm and the forearm.
So the opposite of posterior would be what?
Would be anterior, and it would be this area right here that points up.
And as far
Or
as
forward.
the interior of Mr. O'Keefe's right arm, what, if anything, did you observe as far as injuries there?
Again, I noted in my diagrams and my charts that they were mostly on the posterior right arm and forearm.
Now, Dr. Scordi-Bello, if I could turn your attention to the internal examination as far as the injuries that you observed there, what, if anything, did you observe during the course of your internal examination of Mr. O'Keefe?
Okay, the internal examination, I will start with the head. Once the skull was open and the head was examined, I noted that there were skull fractures in Mr. O'Keefe's skull, both in the back and the front aspect of his skull. I noted that there was recent subdural hemorrhage. That is blood that is under the dura, and the dura is a very tough protective cover that sits over the brain. I noted that there was subarachnoid hemorrhage. That's hemorrhage that is directly on top of the brain under the leptomeninges, which is a very thin membrane that covers the brain. And at that point, I removed the brain, and I, instead of examining it right then and there, I saved it in a special solution, and I sent it to our office in Boston for a neuropathologist to fully examine.
Is it your understanding that a neuropathologist ultimately conducted a fuller examination of Mr. O'Keefe's brain?
Yes,
And who was that neuropathologist within your office?
Dr. Stonebridge.
Now, with reference to the head, as far as the skull, you indicated that there were fractures as in plural, correct?
Yes.
And with reference to the fractures, what, if any, relationship did you know between the fractures that you observed and the laceration to the back of Mr. O'Keefe's head that you spoke about in your external examination?
So the laceration on the scalp that I observed was overlying the area of the skull that appeared to be fractured, or at least appeared that the fractures were originating from that point of impact and extending into the rest of the skull.
Now, I want to get anything as far as your observations of the skull and that point in the, I'm sorry, which part of the skull was the originating fracture?
This would be on the back of the skull, slightly right of midline.
Is that the medical term that's referred to as?
I'm sorry?
Is there a medical term that's referred to as far as the right rear sort of?
It's the right occipital.
What, if anything, led you to that opinion that that was sort of the originating source of the multiple fractures in the skull that you observed?
Again, observing or looking at the skull fractures and their pattern, there appeared to be a central point with fractures radiating or originating from that central point and going into other parts of the skull.
Now, in reference to that laceration in the area of the originating fracture in the back of the skull, what, if anything, did you determine in regard to impact in regard to that area of the head?
Well, the laceration along with, so the tear in the skin along with the scrape, because they were adjacent, are both evidence of blunt impact. So I knew at that point that Mr. O'Keefe's head had come in contact with a blunt object.
Would that be sort of the point of impact between the blunt object and Mr. O'Keefe's head?
Right.
Now, with reference to the fractures that you would observe, how extensive were the fractures that you observed, the multiple ones?
Well, there were multiple fractures. So by definition, multiple fractures in multiple chambers or parts of the skull. So I would say they were extensive.
Now, when you're conducting this internal examination, is there sort of a division of the body that you're doing as far as what you're examining and in what order and sort of things that you're looking at from the internal examination?
Well, we examine everything, and usually we start in the external examination, we start from the head and work our way down. During the internal examination, we're doing two things at the same time sometimes. And so I start with the chest, move to the abdomen, and then the pelvis, while at the same time, we're working on the head.
All right, I'm going to pause you there for a minute. We're going to take a short recess and we'll be back.
Now, doctor, as far as the internal examination was concerned with regard to Mr. O'Keefe, starting with his stomach, what, if anything, did you observe of any significance in that area?
I observed that there were some small hemorrhages, small areas of bleeding in Mr. O'Keefe's stomach.
And are those described in medical literature as a specific type of spot?
They have a name. They're called Wisniewski spots. Wischnewski. And they have been associated with cases of hypothermia.
And how so? How have they been associated with cases of hypothermia?
They have been seen in cases of hypothermia. It's one of the findings that support the diagnosis of hypothermia. They are not always there, and their presence doesn't definitively diagnose hypothermia, but they are one of the findings that, if present, suggest the diagnosis of hypothermia.
And based on your training and experience, based on other types of literature that you've reviewed in regard to hypothermia, what is, as far as these Wisniewski spots, and thank you very much for saying that until after you had said it, with regard to that, what if anything does it say as far as the causality of that, or how that occurs or is related to hypothermia?
We don't really know the pathophysiology of these spots. There have been various hypotheses. People have suggested that they are a response to stress. Some people have suggested that hypothermia increases secretion of acid in the stomach, and that leads to these spots, but their exact pathophysiology is still under investigation.
Now, in addition to these areas of small hemorrhage in Mr. O'Keefe's stomach, what, if anything, did you observe in the pancreas?
In the pancreas, I again observed some more diffuse hemorrhage of the pancreas and the tissues around it.
And same question with regard to the spots and hemorrhages you observed in the stomach. What, if any, relationship do the hemorrhages or the bleeding of the pancreas have in relation to hypothermia?
Again, it's one of the findings that, if present, should alert the medical examiner to consider the possibility of hypothermia.
And as far as the observations that you made, as far as the hemorrhages in the stomach area of Mr. O'Keefe and the hemorrhages in the pancreatic area of Mr. O'Keefe, the sort of juxtaposition of those, what, if any, significance did that have in regards to your hypothermic diagnosis?
When the case was called into our office and when we accepted the case, it was reported to us that this was an individual that was found in the snow, covered with snow, and it appeared that he may have been there for a period of time. So one of the questions for me as a medical examiner is to determine whether there are any signs of hypothermia in addition to what I had already observed, which was the blunt impact injuries. And the combination of the gastric, the stomach, and the pancreatic hemorrhages strongly suggested, given the circumstances and how the body was found, that hypothermia did in fact play a role in his death.
Now, I've asked this sort of precursor. When you use the term hypothermia, what do you understand? What does hypothermia mean from a medical diagnostic?
Right. Hypothermia is a term used to describe low body temperature, by definition, 35 degrees centigrade or below. And there are levels of hypothermia, from mild hypothermia to severe hypothermia. It just basically means the body is losing heat faster than it can generate it.
And typically, what would be the sort of core body temperature that would determine someone is hypothermic versus not?
We're usually at 98 degrees or 37 degrees centigrade. So anything higher than that is considered a fever or hyperthermia. Anything lower than 35 degrees centigrade or 95 degrees Fahrenheit is considered hypothermia.
Now, if you could explain to the jury sort of a little bit about the type of diagnosis that is involved in hypothermia, and sort of what other sort of types of information you would be looking at in order to make that diagnosis.
Hypothermia is a difficult diagnosis to make, and sometimes it's a diagnosis of exclusion, meaning that all other possible causes of death have been ruled out and you're left with hypothermia. So a body that is found in the snow or in a cold environment and has a core body temperature of 85 degrees and is unresponsive or asystolic, meaning that there is no heart activity, could be a hypothermic death, or it could not be a hypothermic death. And it's up to us to determine by doing the autopsy what other factors are at play. So the example I like to give is a person with severe coronary artery disease goes out to shovel their driveway, suffers a heart attack, and drops to the ground and is dead within seconds. And no one discovers their body for a few hours during the storm. When they're found, they're asystolic, their core body temperature is 80 degrees. But the autopsy shows another reason for their death. It shows a massive heart attack, which is what killed them. They just happened to be outside after they died and they lost heat and their body temperature dropped. Doesn't mean they died from hypothermia. However, if you take a person, an elderly person, or any person, an intoxicated person, a person who's intoxicated with drugs, that goes out into bad weather, gets confused, loses their direction, isn't able to get to shelter, and they die. Their body temperature starts to drop. They get more disoriented. They get more confused. Their organ systems start to shut down, and eventually they die from hypothermia. So that person will also be found in the snow with a core body temperature of 80, 85 degrees. But when we do the autopsy, if we see those gastric hemorrhages, if we see that bleeding in the stomach, if we see the bleeding in the pancreas, if we look at their toxicology and we see that they were intoxicated with multiple substances, then we can determine, or we can opine, that the cause of death was at least partly due to the hypothermia, because they were still alive when they started losing heat, as opposed to someone who had the heart attack and was already dead when they started losing heat from their body.
Doctor, when coming to your opinion in relation to the cause of death in Mr. O'Keefe, in addition to your autopsy, your internal, your external examination, what, if any, other materials were you provided, and what, if any, other materials did you review in relation?
I was provided with a police report, an investigative report. I was provided with some of his prior medical records. I was provided with records from the hospital where he was first taken by emergency medical personnel. And during the course of the autopsy, of course, I didn't mention this. We also, during the autopsy, collect fluids from the body that are sent to the lab for toxicologic analysis. And after a few weeks after the autopsy, we get a report from the toxicology lab. And in this case, I looked at the toxicology report. As I mentioned, all the information from the investigators, the autopsy findings, the neuropathology findings, and came to a conclusion as to the cause.
Now, as part of the documentation that you received from the investigators, did that include photographs of the scene as well?
Yes, it did. Some photographs.
Turning back to the toxicological findings that you received, what, if any, indication did those findings have, or did they indicate in regard to blood alcohol concentration with regard to Mr. O'Keefe?
Mr. O'Keefe had alcohol in his system, and I do believe, I don't have the toxicology in front of me, but in his blood at the time of autopsy, the level was 0.21 grams per deciliter.
Now, contained within those toxicology findings, there's also something listed as a vitreous humor. Is that correct?
Yes.
And can you explain to the jury sort of what that is, where that sample is taken from, and why?
Yeah, that sample, the vitreous humor, is taken from the back chamber of the eye. It's one of the routine samples that we take in addition to blood from the body and urine. And it's, again, used to look for the presence of different drugs. In cases of alcohol intoxication, sometimes we will get a value for the vitreous, and sometimes that value might not be exactly the same as the value that we get for the blood. It gives us an idea of where in the curve of alcohol metabolism, the individual is.
And so, based on sort of the disparity between the vitreous humor level and the, I'm sorry, I may not have asked, what was the level in the vitreous humor?
I believe it was higher. Sorry, I just have to find it. I think it was 0.26. I'm sorry, I can't find it in his notes. I don't know if you have the, yes. Yes, it was 0.28.
Now, doctor, with respect to the disparity between what was contained as a VAC and vitreous humor versus the other number from his blood, what, if anything, does that indicate to you as far as, or what, if anything, do you take from it?
That suggests that the level in Mr. O'Keefe's blood had been higher than 0.21, and that's reflected by the 0.28 that was in the vitreous. The vitreous metabolism of alcohol lags. It's a little slower, lags behind that of the blood and the circulation. The alcohol is metabolized in the liver. But the fact that it is higher in the vitreous suggests that the level in the blood was also higher at some point prior.
So at some point, whenever Mr. O'Keefe died, his level of alcohol was on the decrease. Is that fair to say?
Correct.
Now, with respect to, you mentioned that you had reviewed the EMS reports from Mr. O'Keefe as well as his medical records from Good Samaritan. Is that correct?
Correct.
And if you could just briefly for the jury explain your understanding as far as some of the terms within those medical records. Familiar with your review of Mr. O'Keefe's medical records that he was labeled as being in cardiac arrest?
Yes.
And can you explain to the jury what that is?
Yes, he was labeled as asystolic or in asystole, which is basically a flat line. So if you attach leads to the body, there is no electrical activity coming from the heart.
Now, with respect to Mr. O'Keefe, as far as certain vital signs were taken in the course of his treatment at the Good Samaritan, is that correct?
Yes.
Including a core temperature, is that correct?
Yes.
Would you recall what that core temperature was?
Yes. It was noted as 80.1.
And that was a temperature reading that was taken at 7:19 a.m., is that correct?
It was taken, actually, this temperature reading in the records that I'm looking at was taken at 6:57 a.m.
And with respect to that 80.1 degree temperature, that's in Fahrenheit, is that correct?
Yes.
And so what, if any, relationship does that have, or what, if any, relationship does that have to your hypothermic diagnosis?
Well, that is the temperature. At this point, Mr. O'Keefe is asystolic, meaning he has no cardiac activity. That is the temperature of his body at the time that he was taken to, that he was examined by EMS and taken to the hospital. So it is a very hypothermic temperature. It is well below the 95 degrees, which we consider hypothermia.
Now, I believe you alluded to it earlier in your testimony, but with respect to hypothermia, what are some of the manifestations of that type of onset as it progresses?
Well, the first evidence of hypothermia, which we have no problem in this room, is shivering. When someone starts to get cold, they start to shiver to conserve heat. But then as the body loses more and more heat, there are neurologic consequences. People can get confused. We see this in the elderly all the time. They can get disoriented. And eventually at very low temperatures, below 90 degrees, everything ceases to function. The heart stops.
And would physical weakness or lack of strength be one of those manifestations as well?
Yes.
And how many different sort of stages of hypothermia are there from the beginning of or onset of progression to the end?
There is mild hypothermia to extreme severe hypothermia.
Now, with regard, as far as the type of clothing that someone is wearing when they're outside in these types of conditions, what, if any, relationship would that have with regard to the quickness or the rapidity of the onset of hypothermia?
Clearly, the more layers someone has, the slower they will lose heat from their body. The fewer layers, the faster they can become hypothermic.
And what, if any, information did you have as far as how Mr. O'Keefe was dressed when he was found in the snow on the morning of the 29th?
The information that I was given stated that he was wearing a pair of jeans and a long sleeve shirt.
Now, with respect to someone as far as that hypothermia onset and rapidity of it, what, if any, relationship with the condition of the clothing? What I'm asking there is more sort of the dryness versus wet clothing. What, if any, relationship with that?
Well, again, wet clothing or wet conditions will speed up the rate at which the body loses heat.
Now, lastly, with regard to this area, Doctor, in regard to Mr. O'Keefe having sort of alcohol on board in his system at the time the hypothermia onsets, what, if any, relationship does that have in respect to the onset of hypothermia and the rapidity of that?
Alcohol intoxication, it has been shown to inhibit some of the mechanisms that the body uses to maintain heat. So it's definitely a factor that is a negative factor when it comes to hypothermia.
May I approach?
Yes.
Doctor, I'm showing you a single-page document. You can just review that, look up when you're finished. Do you
Yes.
recognize that, Doctor?
I do. It is a photocopy of the exam notes that I took at the time of autopsy.
Okay. Does that also contain a body diagram with relation to your notes as far as where you observed injuries on Mr. O'Keefe?
Yes.
Okay. Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
I'm off the seat. Next exhibit.
No objection.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Scordi-Bello, what's up on the screen? Is that what you have before you as the next exhibit?
Yes.
And on this, as far as the examination that you conducted, that also included sort of measurements as far as height, weight, things like that you did with regard to Mr. O'Keefe's body, correct?
Correct.
And if you could, what did you record as your measurements for both height and weight of Mr. O'Keefe?
He was weighed by our staff as 216 pounds and measuring 73 inches, which is 6 feet 1 inch.
Now, Doctor, if you could, using the laser pointer before you, direct the jury's attention to starting with the front or facial area and then to the back of the head, but just with reference to the head area, directing their attention to what, if anything, you observed in the area of the head of Mr. O'Keefe.
In terms of injuries,
Yes.
would you like me to point out the injuries? So as I mentioned, there were ecchymosis, that's another word for collection of blood under the upper eyelids on Mr. O'Keefe. The ecchymosis on the right eyelid was also associated with a very small laceration. Then there was an abrasion on the left side of the nose. And then on the back of the head, there was a 3 centimeter laceration. So this is the right side. It would be towards, the back lower side on the right side of the head.
And that laceration on the lower side or right side of the head, is that in the same area that you observed what you described as sort of the originating skull fracture?
Yes, when the scalp was reflected, there was bleeding under the scalp in that particular area, and then when the skull was opened, that's the area that appeared fractured and appeared to have other fractures originating or radiating from it.
This gentleman, if you wouldn't mind scrolling down just for the middle of the torso. And Dr. Scordi-Bello, if you could again using the laser pointer, just direct jury's attention to what, if any, injuries you noted in this sort of middle torso or upper extremity portion of Ms. Hope.
So on the right upper extremity, and again, this is the back of the body, we have this collection of linear abrasions. I think the battery is dead. That measured up to 7 centimeters and extended from the upper arm down to the middle of the forearm.
If I can interrupt you for 1 second,
Yes. This would be the abrasions.
Ms. Gilman, if I could ask you to scroll down to the lower extremities. And again, Dr. Scordi-Bello, if you could, again, using laser pointer, direct jury's attention to what, if any, injuries you observed at the lower extremities in regard to Ms. Hope.
The lower extremities didn't have a lot of injuries. There was a small abrasion on his right knee area on the side. And if you don't mind pushing the diagram just a little bit more up to see the hands, there were some contusions or some bruises on the dorsal aspects of the right hand and some very faint bruise on the left.
Thank you, Doctor, if I could show you what's a 2-page document, ask you to just review that up and finish.
Yes,
And do you recognize what that is?
I do.
And what do you recognize that to be?
These are copies of diagrams that I used at the time of autopsy to document some of the injuries on the face and the skull.
May I approach again, Your Honor?
Yes.
I'll have to seek to introduce in the minutes the next exhibit.
Any objection? No objection. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Scordi-Bello, do you recognize what's picked up on the screen? It's the next exhibit for you.
Yes.
And if you could, again, using the laser pointer, direct jury's attention to what, if anything, you observed or noted of significance in these particular diagrams.
So the upper eyelids, the areas of the upper eyelids on both sides had ecchymosis or blood. Under them, on the right side, there was a very small laceration or a small tear associated with that. Both eyes had some swelling to them. And then on the nose, there were 2 abrasions, 2 scrapes. One was small at 0.5 centimeters. The other one was 1 centimeter, and it was linear. And I noted them right there.
I'm going to scroll down a bit. And again, from the bottom right diagram for you, Doctor, if you could use the laser pointer, direct jury's attention to what any injuries of significance you noted in that portion of the diagram.
This is the area where I noted the laceration to the scalp. I noted something called tissue bridging, which is a morphologic feature of a laceration, is what makes it different from an incised wound or from a cut, because again, the skin is crushed and now it's more irregular. The edges are more irregular. And then above that laceration, I noted that there was a scrape as well associated with it. So that was 1 injury.
In this moment, I have the next page. Dr. if I could direct you to the next page of that exhibit before you. And this moment, if you could, really sort of mark on the top of that diagram.
Yes.
Now, Doctor, before we get into a diagram that's up on the screen, if I could ask just a bit more, if you could expound upon when you use the term ecchymosis, what exactly does that mean in specific reference to the area of the eyes?
Ecchymoses are a word that we use to describe bruising. Orbital ecchymosis or periorbital ecchymosis or supraorbital ecchymosis just refer to the location of the bleeding in relation to the eye. And when we see ecchymosis or bleeding around the eyes, one of the differential diagnoses, one of the etiologies is blunt trauma to the head, and specifically fractures to what is known as the base of the skull. And this, what you're seeing here, is the base of the skull.
Now, Doctor, if you could, using that diagram up on the screen, explain to the jury, when we asked first, sorry, were you able to formulate an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to how the injuries within the skull and the brain interacted with each other, in particular interacted also with the ecchymosis that you described in the origin?
So the injuries inside the skull, this is the base of the skull. This is, think of it as the tray where the brain would be sitting on top. The brain has been removed, and now we're looking at the bones. Right here is where I noted the skull, one of the skull fractures to be originating or starting with fractures. These are linear fractures that are extending or radiating from this one point of impact. This is known as the posterior fossa of the base. These 2 chambers are known as the middle cranial fossa, and this area is known as the anterior cranial fossa. As you look at this, the eyes would be sitting back here. So the eyes are actually very intimately associated with the anterior cranial fossa, which is very thin, and the bones are quite thin and friable. So an impact to the back of the head was in this case, because we do have a laceration and we do have an abrasion. So we know that the head impacted something blunt with enough force to break the skull and enough force for those fractures to propagate or radiate into the middle cranial fossa and also the anterior cranial fossa, which is the front chambers of the base. When the anterior cranial fossa are fractured, as I mentioned, they are very thin bones. Blood can seep from this area into the soft tissues and manifest as hemorrhage or bleeding or a contusion or an ecchymosis around the eye when you look at the person face, when you look at their face. So it is a well-known fact that fractures to the base of the skull can present with orbital ecchymosis, and that particular manifestation has a name. It's called raccoon eye because it resembles, I guess, what raccoon eyes look like. But emergency room physicians are always very alerted to any hemorrhage and any bleeding around the eyes, because it could signify, or it could mean that there's a much bigger injury inside the skull, and that is not just some bleeding around the eyes, that it actually is associated with a skull fracture.
So the ecchymosis itself, as far as the sort of drainage or seepage of blood, that's coming into, that's what causes the eyes to sort of swell up. Is that correct?
Correct.
And doctor, if I could ask you with reference to, if you could illustrate with the laser pointer on the diagram up on the screen, as far as the subarachnoid hemorrhage, subdural hematoma, as far as the bleeding with injury, what if any impact that has on the skull as far as the fractures are concerned, or just building up a pressure itself?
The subarachnoid hemorrhage is a thin layer of hemorrhage on top of the brain, directly on top of the brain under the lepta meninges. The main effect, or I guess one of the effects that subarachnoid hemorrhage has, is that it is very irritating to the brain and can lead to seizures. Subdural hemorrhage is hemorrhage that is due to veins in the dura, that very tough protective cover on top of the brain, that are broken and leak blood into the space between the dura and the brain. That kind of injury, given enough time, you can have accumulation of the blood, and you can cause significant shift into the brain. That's not something that we had here. Here we had some subdural hemorrhage, but not enough that it was what we call space occupying, but it was present. So it was due to bridging veins in the dura being injured from the trauma, from the fractures. And in terms of the effect that all these injuries have, the subdural and the subarachnoid and the skull fractures, anytime the brain is injured, it responds by swelling. And the skull is a closed space without the ability to expand, unlike the skin, where you can have a bruise or a significant amount of blood accumulate under the skin. In the skull, once the brain starts to react to the injury and it starts to swell, there's nowhere to go except for down. And that's the foramen magnum. That is the area where the brainstem and the spinal cord will run out. You know, spinal cord connects, obviously, the brain to the rest of the body. And this is one of the few spaces that the brain can try and squeeze into because it has nowhere else to go. So herniation, brain swelling and herniation are a general response that the brain has to any sort of trauma.
And it's coming. Thank you very much. You can now, doctor, with respect to the head injury, specifically the fracture, what, if any, opinion can you give or can you say in regard to the type of force or amount of force necessary to cause the fracture of the skull that you observed with regard to Ms. O'Keefe?
I can't really give you a number. I'm not a physicist. I can tell you that the skull is a pretty thick bone. It takes considerable amount of force to fracture the skull. So that was a pretty considerable impact.
Now, with respect to the injuries to Mr. O'Keefe's head and the onset of hypothermia, what, if any, opinion do you have with regard to the timing of those respective to each other?
Well, I do believe the injuries, the blunt impact injuries, were sustained first. These are not injuries that are immediately lethal. This is not something that would cause death in seconds. And therefore, Mr. O'Keefe may have been incapacitated by the injuries or knocked out, if you will. And was not able to get himself into a warmer environment, and therefore hypothermia set in, given the environmental conditions and given the clothing on the body, or the lack of clothing, I should say, no big jacket or anything like that.
Now, when you say something as far as some type of injury being immediately lethal, can you give an example of that?
The one that forensic pathologists like to use is a gunshot wound to the head that goes from one side to the other, disrupting the neural systems of the brain and causing the person to immediately drop and die within seconds or milliseconds. This is not that kind of injury. This is an injury that took a little bit of time to develop, as is manifested by the fact that we have some bleeding, which means that the heart is still pumping and blood is still coming out of the vessels.
And so I guess to that point, as far as what was it from your examination and your findings and your review of sort of the overall materials that leads you to believe that the head injuries happened prior to hypothermia setting in?
Again, the findings of hypothermia, the blunt impact injuries, if someone is, it's not completely out of the realm of possibility that someone becomes hypothermic and then falls as a result. But the hypothermia would continue along with the brain injuries that took some time to develop. So in my opinion, I believe the impact, the injury to the head came first. Mr. O'Keefe was most likely incapacitated or unable to move into a warmer environment, and then the hypothermia set in.
And if you can, what, if anything, can you say as to the sort of, in contrast to sort of the bullet to the head or the instantaneous death, what, if anything, can you say as to the time that this would take to manifest itself as far as the injury to the head in hypothermic state?
Again, I can't give you specifics. I would say this was definitely in the matter of minutes, many minutes, or hours.
Now, Doctor, you had mentioned that at some point you had reviewed some photographs from the scene where Mr. O'Keefe's body was recovered. Is that correct?
Yes, I was shown some photographs.
And from the photographs that you were shown, what, if anything, of significance did you observe or lack thereof in the area where Mr. O'Keefe's body was recovered?
Well, based on those photographs, limited number of photographs that I saw and I was shown, there didn't appear to be a lot of disruption around the area where I was told that Mr. O'Keefe's body was found.
And that lack of sort of disruption in the snow around where Mr. O'Keefe's body was found, what, if any, significance would that have to you as far as from a diagnostic perspective?
Well, it suggests that he really didn't travel a very long distance once the injury was inflicted.
And as far as anything related to footprints, drag marks, anything like that, did you observe anything like that in that area?
On the pictures that I saw, no.
Now, from your extent of your examination of Mr. O'Keefe's body, what, if anything, did you observe that would indicate any sort of altercation or a fight or anything like that from Mr. O'Keefe?
I didn't see any major signs of what I would call a significant altercation.
And with regard to that, as far as signs, what are some of the signs, and what would you be expecting to see, and what was lacking as far as your observations of Mr. O'Keefe?
I looked at Mr. O'Keefe's hands. As you saw on the diagrams, I did document that there were some contusions on the dorsal aspect, very vague and faint contusion on the left, and contusion on the right hand. That particular contusion has a central little pinpoint mark that may suggest that it was due to attempts to get IV access on his hand. That's a very common place, but I didn't see any bruising on Mr. O'Keefe's knuckles. His nails were intact. I didn't see any breaks on his nails, and I didn't see any fractures or feel any fractures on any of his hands.
Now, with respect to the diagrams that were up on the screen before, as well as your observations from internal examination, you observed some fractures in Mr. O'Keefe's ribs. Is that correct?
Yes, he did have some fractures, I believe, to the 4th and 5th ribs near the sternum. It's a very common location for CPR-associated fractures.
And so I believe you just alluded to it right there, but as far as any fractures to Mr. O'Keefe's ribs, what, if any, opinion do you have as to the origination or causality of those rib fractures?
As I mentioned, those are very consistent with resuscitation. We see those quite often, given the history that I was provided that extensive resuscitation was attempted. I documented those as most likely due to resuscitation.
Now, Doctor, with regard to the, this by way of contrast, you talked a bit about the significant impact or the thickness of the skull. How does that relate to the area of the ribs that you're talking about as far as can be fractured and resuscitated?
Well, I don't understand the question.
Let me rephrase. What is the difference sort of between the thickness of the bone in the skull versus the thickness of the bone in the ribs?
The skull in general is a thicker bone. It requires more force.
Now, Doctor, if I could, are you familiar with a medical term known as vasodilation?
Yes.
And can you explain what that term is and how it relates to Mr. O'Keefe's condition?
I can explain what the term is. Dilation means opening up. Vaso refers to blood vessels. So vasodilation is the opening up of blood vessels to bring more blood to the extremities or any part of the body.
And again, that's a bit of an unfair question to me as far as relations. But so how does that manifest itself as far as someone who's in colder conditions or has that sort of onset of hypothermia? What, if any, relation does vasodilation have to that?
Well, you can see vasodilation. You can see vasoconstriction and vasodilation in hypothermia. Initially, the blood vessels will constrict in an attempt to reduce blood flow to the extremities so there's no heat loss. Anyone who has Raynaud's knows what that feels like. Then ultimately the blood vessels will dilate, bringing more blood to the extremities. Again, the normal regulatory mechanisms that the brain has to maintain our body temperature are disrupted when you get into those very low temperatures. And therefore, sometimes in hypothermia, you can see very, very red extremities due to vasodilation.
And with regard to the redness due to vasodilation, is there also a whiteness, sort of discoloration to the extremities that can be observed in hypothermic patients as well?
That's been described as well, yes.
Now, with reference to when you make your observations of Mr. O'Keefe, why is it that, well, let me ask you this, you didn't see any signs of vasodilation or white fingertips or anything like that, is that correct?
Correct. I rarely see signs of vasodilation, especially if someone has died in the hospital.
And can you explain to the jury sort of why that is?
So for two reasons. In this particular reason, Mr. O'Keefe was taken to the hospital and attempts were made at rewarming the body. So he was given warm intravenous fluids and attempts were made to bring the body temperature up with the hope that the heart would start working once that happened. Also, I did not physically see the body until Monday morning. And therefore, I can't really comment on vasodilation or any effects that hypothermia may or may not have had acutely on the body, because I'm seeing the body hours after death. And already the body has been transferred from the scene to the hospital, stored at the hospital, and then transferred from the hospital to our facility. So there's just too much time between when the body was discovered to when I looked at the body to make any reasonable comments on whether there was vasodilation or not.
Dr. Scordi-Bello, if I can ask you some questions, just turning back a little bit from what you were testifying to about yesterday. You had mentioned in your testimony yesterday that you had received some, in addition to the internal and external examination that you conducted with Mr. O'Keefe, you had received some other material that you had reviewed, correct?
Correct.
Now, included within that material was some material from the state police as far as the investigative agency investigating Mr. O'Keefe's death.
Correct.
Now, is that something, is that typical? Is that abnormal? If you could describe sort of in general terms, as far as what, if any, communication would you typically have with the investigating body or agency in relation to any sort of autopsy or examination you do?
Yes. In Massachusetts, under Massachusetts law, the medical examiner's office is responsible, and our role is to determine the cause and manner of death by doing an autopsy. The scene or the scene of death or the place where the decedent is found is controlled by the district attorney's office, and state police will do an investigation. When we accept a case into our office, we request reports, police reports, to explain and describe the circumstances of the death. It could be a house, it could be somewhere else, it could be outside. Every case comes with a police report, and we review that police report, and if we feel that we need more information, then we contact the investigating body and ask for more information, again, depending on the case.
And specifically in this case, in regard to Mr. O'Keefe, did you reach out to get some more information?
I did reach out, yes.
Was that in part in relation to what you were talking about in your testimony yesterday, as far as the diagnosis of hypothermia and trying to sort of better understand the circumstances?
Sustained.
Why did you reach out?
I reached out because when the case was presented to us, and after I did the autopsy, I did not have all the information that I needed in order to certify the manner. The cause of death to me was, I was able to determine the cause of death from the autopsy. When an event is unwitnessed, we usually reach out to the investigating agency and ask them whether they have any more information than they did on the day that the autopsy was done, because investigations sometimes take some time. So in the days and the weeks following the autopsy, I reached out and asked if there was any more information than what I was originally presented with. Was there any video from the surrounding areas? Did anybody come forward to say that they actually witnessed whatever happened? Again, by the time I was ready to finalize the case, and we have approximately 3 months or 90 days from the day of the autopsy until we issue a report, I was not provided with enough information for me to be able to determine the manner.
Now, Doctor, do you recall specifically who it was that you spoke with from the state police?
Yes, I documented that I spoke with Trooper Proctor, I believe, twice.
And with reference, not asking you anything as far as what that conversation consisted of, but as far as the tone of that conversation, did you feel pressured or coerced to come up with a certain determination?
No, I did not.
And even if you had been, what would your response have been in reference to that?
My response was that I am responsible for what goes on the death certificate, and unless I have enough information, clear and convincing evidence, I cannot determine a manner.
May I approach?
Yes.
Doctor, I'm showing you 5 photographs that I gave you yesterday. Do you recognize those?
Yes, I do.
And what do you recognize those to be?
I recognize these as photographs of Mr. O'Keefe's body. I believe these were taken at the hospital. One of them is a photograph taken at the time of autopsy.
May I approach you?
Yes.
I'm going to seek to introduce in the minutes next case.
Ms. Little?
No objection.
Ms. Gilman, if I can have photograph 2853. Doctor, do you recognize what's on the screen?
Yes, this is a picture taken of Mr. O'Keefe's body.
And Doctor, if you could, using the laser pointer, that you have there, direct your attention to what, if anything, you observe of significance in this photograph related to the injuries that you were testifying about.
Yes. So first thing you notice is the medical intervention, which I talked about yesterday. There's defibrillator adhesive pads on the chest. There is what's known as a C collar, a cervical stabilization collar for the neck, and he has been intubated prior to going to the hospital. The injuries that are obvious in this picture include the abrasions on his right forearm and arm. And you can see here, there is discoloration of the upper eyelid of the right eye with some blood that's dripping. That's the orbital or supraorbital ecchymosis that I described before with, we're too far to see the very, very small laceration that is present there, but that's what's causing the bleeding.
And it's going to like that photograph, 5-7. Now, Doctor, this is not before you had the current time of Harley market, it's 442. Do you recognize what's up on the screen?
Yes, this is a picture of the abrasions that I described in my report. Posterior upper arm and forearm. You can see that they have some sort of pattern to it. Anytime we see a pattern, we try to document it as best as we possibly can.
Now, Doctor, with reference to these injuries as far as the abrasions to Mr. O'Keefe's right arm, what kind of role would that play as far as your determination as far as the cause of death of injury?
These are superficial abrasions to the skin. They are not lethal. They're not contributory to the cause of death. The trauma that I observed on the head along with the hypothermia are the two factors contributing to his death. These are present, they're noted, they're described, they're photographed, but I do not know how they came to be, and I did not contribute them to the cause of death.
Ms. Gilman, if I could have photographs, please. Doctor, returning to the exhibits or the photos that you have for you, you recognize what's up on the screen here?
Yes, this is a photograph of Mr. O'Keefe's right hand. This is the dorsum or the dorsal aspect of the hand as opposed to the palm. And you can see that there are some contusions or bruises. There's a larger one here and 2 very small ones here. This particular contusion has 2 pinpoint small defects associated with it. I believe this could be due to attempts at gaining IV access during the many attempts of resuscitation, but I cannot be absolutely sure.
Ms. Gilman, if I could have a photograph of 865. And Dr. Scordi-Bello, if you could, again, you can wait to point of record attention to what anything of significance you notice in this photo.
Again, this is a slightly closer view of Mr. O'Keefe's face. You can see the discoloration, the ecchymosis on the right eye with a slight amount of bleeding. You can see here that there's also some discoloration of his left eyelid.
And Doctor, with reference to the other injuries that you were testifying about yesterday, as far as the small pox or abrasions or lacerations, are those visible in this photograph as well?
I can't hear your question. If you could just repeat it and a little louder.
Sure. My apologies, Doctor. With reference to this photograph, as far as your testimony yesterday in regard to the other smaller injuries around the nose and eyes area of Mr. O'Keefe, are those visible in this photograph as well?
You can see some discoloration of the nose, but this is not a very good picture of it. I think there's a linear abrasion on the left side of the nose that I described, and it's probably this.
Ms. Gilman, can I have photograph 2877? And Doctor, if you could, again, you can laser point of record attention to what anything significant you observed in this photograph.
Yes, this is a view of the left side of Mr. O'Keefe's face. You can see the discoloration of the left eyelid, and now you can see this linear abrasion on his nose and a small abrasion more towards the middle of his nose.
And lastly, in this set, if I could have photograph 9488. Saying, Dr. Scordi-Bello, if you could, you can laser point of record attention to what anything significant you observed.
This is the laceration to the back of Mr. O'Keefe's head. You can see this defect here. It's ragged. It's a typical classic blunt impact injury, and you can see the abrasion, the scrape that is adjacent to it.
I'm just going to take over. Now, Doctor, with reference to what you were testifying yesterday as far as the subscapular bleeding, bleeding under the scalp, is that more or less prominent on one side versus the other side of Mr. O'Keefe's scalp?
Yes, it was more prominent under that laceration that we just looked at.
And so would that be more prominent on the right side? Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, you testified yesterday about a blunt object injury in relation to the injury to the back of the head, then leading to the fractures and the bleeding in the brain, right?
Correct.
And then further leading to the ecchymosis, is that correct?
In the eyes, yes.
Now, that blunt object, what, if anything, can you say about what that blunt object could be?
Could be any blunt object.
Now, from your training experience with reference to the number of autopsies and examinations that you've conducted over the years, would that blunt object possibility include the ground, especially if it was frozen ground?
Objection.
Ask the question differently.
The injuries that you observed to the back of Mr. O'Keefe's head, skull fracture, would that be consistent with a fall to the ground?
It could be.
Would that be consistent with being projected by an object, say a pedestrian collision, and then striking your head on the ground?
It's possible.
The arm injuries that you observed, would those be consistent with scratches from either glass or a piece of plastic or a piece of metal?
It's possible.
And the injuries that you observed, would that be consistent with injuries that you observed in other cases of a pedestrian collision?
They're not the classic pedestrian injuries that we observe, no.
And to that point, as far as when you say classic, as far as a pedestrian collision is concerned, you've conducted autopsies on a number of different pedestrian collisions over the course of your career, is that correct?
Yes, I have.
Do they all sort of mirror each other? Is there sort of a disparity depending on how the person interacted with the car?
Objection.
Sustained. Watch the form, Mr. Lally.
What, if anything, are every injuries from a pedestrian collision the same?
No.
And why not?
It depends on many factors. It depends on the position of the body, of the pedestrian or the person being struck. It depends on whether they are moving or standing still. It depends on the speed of the car. It depends on whether brakes were applied or not. There's a lot of factors that come into play.
Would another factor be sort of the shape of the vehicle that strikes a pedestrian?
That's also possible. Yes, that's a factor.
And did you have occasion to see any photographs, or have you seen any photographs in relation to the defendant's vehicle in this case?
I have seen photographs, yes.
And the size or shape of that vehicle, what, if any, significance did that have to you as far as your examination?
Objection.
I'll allow it.
When we have a potential vehicle, clearly we look at the height, because one of the things that we do in most or all pedestrian or people struck by a motor vehicle is look at the legs, because in the majority, we see injuries to the legs from the bumper of the car. Again, depending on the kind of car, the size of the car, and the height of the bumper. So in Mr. O'Keefe, I did not see any injuries in the lower extremities. And looking at the car, I did note that it was a much bigger car with much higher, I would say much higher tail light bumper. It was not a sedan or a car that's low to the ground where the bumper would be at the level of, let's say, the knee or slightly above or slightly below.
And again, I believe yesterday in your testimony, you indicated that the skull is a pretty thick bone. Is that correct?
Yes.
Sustained.
With regards to the thickness of the skull bone, what, if any, significance, or what, if any, can you say as far as the type or amount of force that would be necessary to cause the fracture that you observed?
Objection.
Overruled.
I would consider the amount of force to be significant, again, without being able to quantify it.
Now, Doctor, from the internal and external examination that you conducted in regard to Mr. O'Keefe, as well as the other materials that you reviewed, were you able to come to an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to the cause of death of Jonathan?
Yes, the cause of death was due to blunt impact injuries of the head and hypothermia.
Thank you, Doctor. Your Honor, I have no further questions.
All right, cross-examination.
Good morning, Dr. Scordi-Bello.
Good morning.
Ms. Little, keep your voice up.
Absolutely. You testified regarding a number of injuries that you referred to as blunt impact injuries, correct?
Yes.
And to be clear, blunt impact injuries are a very, very large category that includes contusions, lacerations, abrasions, and fractures.
Correct.
And you testified similarly that a blunt object can also refer to a large range of objects. Is that right?
Correct.
And I think yesterday you gave the example of a microphone being a blunt object.
Correct.
It could also include something like a baseball bat,
Correct.
a dumbbell,
Could be.
the ground.
Yes.
or a German Shepherd's claws?
Claws. Possibly, yes.
You'd agree that John O'Keefe had a number of blunt impact injuries on his face, on his head, and his right arm.
Yes.
Besides his right arm, which we'll discuss in a second, taking his body from the neck down, he did not have any significant injuries.
From the neck down. Not significant, no.
Let's take those one at a time. No injury whatsoever to his shoulders.
Correct.
No injuries whatsoever to his chest area, aside from sort of the CPR-related injuries that he discussed.
Yes, correct.
And that was in the sternum, is that right?
It was in the ribs, just adjacent to the sternum, yes.
Okay. No injuries to his torso, other than that?
No.
No injuries to his back?
No.
No injuries to his hips?
Correct.
No injuries to his pelvis?
Correct.
No injuries to his thighs?
To his,
Thighs?
no.
No injuries to his knees?
Correct.
No injuries to his shins?
Correct.
No injuries to his ankles?
Correct.
No injuries to his feet?
Correct.
From the neck down, he did not have a single broken bone, again, aside from those CPR-related injuries we discussed, correct?
That's correct.
Not a single fracture.
Other than CPR, correct.
And you spoke earlier about how the bumper was a little higher than on, say, a regular sedan, correct?
Correct.
And so usually in a pedestrian collision, you would see injuries to the knees, is that right?
Objection.
I'll allow it.
Depending on the kind of car, depending on the speed, depending on the height of the individual and the car, you might see injuries to their lower extremity. Yeah.
But in this case, you didn't see any injuries to his thighs, to his pelvis, anything even at the height of the bumper, is that correct?
Correct. A very minor abrasion to the side of his right knee.
So surely you'd agree that John O'Keefe's injuries, or lack thereof, are inconsistent with having been struck by a 7,000-pound vehicle at 24 miles per hour and being projected 30 feet.
Objection.
Sustain. Break it down. Ask it differently.
Would you agree that John O'Keefe's injuries, or lack thereof, are inconsistent with having been struck by a vehicle at 24 miles per hour?
I would say it's likely and unlikely at the same time, depending on the position of the body and the vehicle in question.
Well, let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say the person were standing with their arm like this, and they were struck by the rear taillight of a vehicle at 24 miles per hour. Would you agree that his injuries are inconsistent with that scenario?
Objection.
Sustain.
Maybe approach on it.
Sure.
Would you agree that John O'Keefe's injuries to his arm, let's start there, are inconsistent with having been struck by a vehicle at 24 miles per hour and then causing him to spin around and be projected 30 feet?
Okay, so you need to break it down.
Would you agree that John O'Keefe's injury to his arm are inconsistent with having been struck by a vehicle at 24 miles per hour?
I don't know. I am not a reconstruction expert. I'm not a biomechanics expert. I never personally inspected the car, so I can't offer an opinion on that.
You did examine John O'Keefe's arm, correct?
Yes,
You observed no significant bruising,
correct.
no fractures,
Correct.
and no broken bones.
Correct.
I'd like to talk about the injuries to John O'Keefe's face. You testified that Mr. O'Keefe had a laceration on his right upper eyelid.
Correct.
You also described multiple abrasions on his nose.
2. Yes.
Although these injuries may not have been the ultimate cause of his death, you'd agree that less severe injuries can still be very important in interpreting the manner or the context in which that person died, correct?
Correct.
And in furtherance of that, you've been taught that when doing an autopsy, details matter,
Correct.
no matter how small.
Correct.
And that's one of the reasons as a medical examiner, you have to notate every single injury you find on the person.
Correct.
If I could show you. Can I approach on it?
Yes.
Do you recognize that photograph?
I do.
And is that a photograph that was taken in connection with your autopsy?
Yes, it was taken at the time of autopsy after the face was cleaned.
You have to admit.
I'm sorry, after what?
The face was cleaned up.
Okay.
I have to admit, Your Honor.
Any objections, Mr. Lally?
No.
Are these the facial injuries that you were testifying to earlier?
Yes.
And could you kind of describe in that photograph what injuries you observed in his face?
The orbital ecchymosis on both eyes, the small laceration to the right eyelid, the abrasions on the nose.
And you testified that the injuries to his face were also the result of a blunt force trauma.
Correct.
So that's the laceration to the eye and the 2 abrasions that we see there on his nose.
Correct.
And you agree that those injuries don't just manifest out of nowhere, right?
Absolutely.
They have to originate from something.
Yes.
Would you agree that his injuries to his face are consistent with having been punched?
That is a possibility.
Your internal examination notes also cite a tongue laceration on the right front of the victim's tongue. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you'd agree that tongue laceration can be also caused by blunt force trauma.
Correct.
And that could also include something like a punch to the victim's face or jaw.
That's a possibility.
In addition to the facial injuries, you described that Mr. O'Keefe had a significant laceration on the back of his head.
He had 1 laceration to the back of his head. Correct.
I believe we saw a photograph of that
Yes.
a little bit earlier. You testified that the skin around the laceration on the back of his head was also scratched. Do you recall
Yes, I do.
that? But you did not testify as to how you opined that might have happened.
No.
Would you agree that someone could certainly get scratched on the back of their head if they were, for instance, dragged on the ground?
It's possible.
You described the open wound to the back of his head as a laceration, which is sort of a blunt force injury that's not the result of sharp force trauma. Is that right?
Yes.
And you'd agree that Mr. O'Keefe's head injury came from some sort of blow to the back of the head, whether it be an object or the ground. Is that right?
Yes.
Objection.
And that injury could be the result of falling backward from a standing position onto concrete.
It's possible.
It could also be the result of being struck with a large object such as a baseball bat or a barbell.
It's possible.
In other words, it was an irregular laceration that resulted from some blunt force trauma.
Correct.
I'd like to sort of circle back to those injuries to Mr. O'Keefe's arm. You testified that there were, again, no fractures, no broken bones, no significant contusions.
Correct.
But you did describe the wounds to Mr. O'Keefe's arm as having discrete linear abrasions, which were caused by some sort of blunt object, correct?
Yes.
What does discrete mean?
It means each one is an individual injury, as opposed to confluent, where it would be all meshed together.
Your Honor, if I could publish what's been previously marked as Exhibit 19, okay? And these are sort of the linear wounds that you're referring to.
Yes.
And you testified that these also sort of appear in clusters or groups. You call
Yes.
them pattern abrasions, is that right?
Yes, I did.
And you'd agree that, for example, road rash does not result in this type of discrete linear wounds.
It could, but not exactly like this.
Well, typically road rash covers sort of a large area of the skin. It would be a large abrasion. I mean, you've seen numerous cases of road rash in your
Yes.
career. And it doesn't look like that.
Correct.
Blunt force trauma can include injuries from various objects, as you testified, including an animal paw, correct?
Correct.
And you'd agree that these discrete linear abrasions are inconsistent with having been struck by a smooth rear tail light at 24 miles per hour.
Objection.
Can you answer that, doctor?
I can't. By
Okay.
smooth, no.
All right, next question.
By a smooth rear tail light, you're saying that is not what you would see at 24 miles per hour, correct?
Objection.
Sustained.
As you testified earlier, you've indicated that based on the facts that were presented to you, you don't know what caused those significant scratches on Mr. O'Keefe's right arm.
I do not.
May I approach, Your Honor? Sure. Do you recognize that photograph?
I do. It's a photograph of Mr. O'Keefe's right hand.
May I mark that as the next morning?
Is there an objection?
May we approach?
Okay.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Permission to publish?
Well, we need to mark it first. So we'll mark it for identification, and then when it's appropriate, it will be transferred to being an exhibit.
Thank you.
But yes, you can publish. Is it also be published appropriately?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay.
Dr. Scordi-Bello, you indicated on direct examination that at least that one of the bruises from Mr. O'Keefe's right hand could potentially be attributed to an attempt to get IV fluid into the hand. Is that correct?
Correct.
During the course of your conducting your autopsy, you reviewed records from the Canton Fire Department and EMS, as well as Good Samaritan Hospital. Is that correct?
I did.
And do you recall reviewing records indicating that the IV fluids in this particular case were administered through the tibia and then later through a catheter at the hospital?
Yes, they were administered through intraosseous lines in both legs, shins, and at the hospital, they were administered through a femoral central line. Yes.
And you'd agree that bruising to the backs of hands is also consistent with defensive wounds.
Yes, that's correct.
And there are actually 4 separate distinct bruises outside of the one that you discussed earlier on Mr. O'Keefe's right hand, correct?
Yes, I would say 3, but I can see how you would say 4. 1, 2, 3. That might be 1 together. But yes, I can see how you would say 4.
And you testified yesterday that there was also an injury to Mr. O'Keefe's left hand.
There was a vague contusion on his left hand. Correct.
You testified on direct examination that you didn't see any sort of obvious signs of the fight because Mr. O'Keefe's fingernails were intact and you didn't observe any fractures on his hands. Is that right?
Correct.
But broken fingernails and fractured hands aren't the only observable signs of a fight. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
In fact, you noted a laceration over his eye.
Yes.
You noticed multiple lacerations on his nose.
Abrasions on his nose. Yes. Yes.
Multiple abrasions on his nose.
Correct.
You noticed a laceration to his tongue.
Yes.
You noted the contusions on the back of his right hand.
Correct.
The injury, the contusion to his left hand as well.
Correct.
And as you just testified, bruising on the back of hands may be consistent with defensive wounds.
It could be.
So in fact, if you have a body that presents with a laceration to one of the brows, a laceration, abrasions to the nose, an egg over an eye, contusions and abrasions on the hands, and a laceration to the tongue, these injuries are consistent with a physical altercation, correct?
Objection.
Sustained.
Are those injuries consistent with a physical altercation?
Objection.
Sustained.
Your Honor, may we approach?
Sure.
Shifting gears for a second, you indicated on direct examination that you reviewed some photographs from law enforcement that showed no footprints in the snow. Do you recall that testimony?
I do.
Were those provided to you by Trooper Proctor?
Yes.
Do you have those photographs with you?
No, I don't.
Do you recall what was depicted in those photographs?
Yes. If I remember correctly, it was the area of the fire hydrant and the area where Mr. O'Keefe's body was discovered. It's the front of the house, the area of the fire hydrant, and I believe the flagpole.
Thank you. You testified that Mr. O'Keefe had multiple fractures to his skull, but they seem to be originating from a single point of impact on the back of his head. Is that correct?
It appeared so, yes.
Are you reasonably certain that all of his injuries were the result of a single impact to the back of the head?
It could be a single impact.
But it also could be multiple impacts, correct?
It could be, yes.
Because as you just testified, Mr. O'Keefe suffered multiple injuries to the front of his face as well.
Correct.
In other words, he could have suffered trauma to the face and then fallen and sustained an injury to the back of the head, correct?
That is possible, yes.
And you testified before the state grand jury that the areas of bruising to the brain were likely due to a fall. Is that correct?
Yes.
In your expert medical opinion, is it possible for someone to get punched in the face hard enough to lose consciousness and fall backward?
Yes.
I'll allow it.
It's possible.
Your Honor, if I could have permission to publish what's been previously admitted as Exhibit 19.
Yes.
Dr. Scordi-Bello, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but there's some redness that you observe on the body by the ribs that we observed in some of the other photographs that were presented by Mr. Lally.
We have just one yard.
Yes.
I'd like to show you what's been previously marked as People's Exhibit 648. Dr. Scordi-Bello, you were shown this photograph by Mr. Lally on direct examination.
Yes.
Do you see the redness sort of next to his rib cage on the bottom? Correct.
Yes.
What is that?
That is livor.
Lividity?
Lividity, yes.
Can you describe to the jury what lividity is?
Yes, lividity is the pooling of blood to the dependent areas of the body after someone is deceased.
So even though it sort of appears to look like a bruise, that's lividity, correct?
That is lividity, yes. It goes all the way down.
And it's not the result of an injury.
No.
Thank you. No further questions.
Okay, the lights, please. Thank you. Mr. Lally?
Yes, Your Honor. And Dr. Scordi-Bello, you did observe a minor abrasion to Mr. O'Keefe's right knee, is that correct?
Correct.
And what part of the knee was that on, if you recall?
It was on the side, on the lateral side of his right knee.
And by lateral, sort of the side that faces away from the body, is that correct?
Correct.
You were asked whether or not the small injuries on Mr. O'Keefe's face could possibly be from a punch, is that correct?
Correct.
You said that's one of the possibilities, is that correct?
Yes.
What are some of the other possibilities?
Could be impact during a fall. It could be coming in contact with any blunt object in the snow.
Would glass be a possibility as far as a blunt object?
It could be under certain circumstances.
Piece of plastic under certain circumstances as far as a blunt object, would that be also a possibility?
Correct, yes.
Now, as far as the abrasion near the laceration on the back of Mr. O'Keefe's head, you were asking questions about whether or not that could be from dragging, correct?
Correct.
Now, as far as injuries or abrasions concerning dragging, would it be typical to see just one isolated abrasion in the area of the laceration?
Not typical, but possible.
Could that also be a result of the blunt impacts or, as one of the possibilities you testified before, from hitting the ground?
Yes.
Now, you were asked about hitting the ground, specifically hitting concrete. Would that impact injuries to the back of Mr. O'Keefe's head also be consistent with striking his head on frozen ground?
I'm sorry.
I'll allow it.
Can you repeat the question?
You were asked a question on cross-examination about the laceration and abrasion to the back of Mr. O'Keefe's head being consistent with striking his head on concrete, correct?
Yes.
Would that also be consistent with striking his head on frozen ground?
Could be, yes.
You were asked about certain wounds as being a possibility of defensive wounds. What are some of the other types of defensive wounds that you would expect to see that you do not see in this case?
I would expect to see, or I have seen, multiple bruising to the, again, posterior aspects of the forearms. I have seen cuts, lacerations, depending on how a person might be defending themselves, the position of their arms.
And would that also include breaks in the fingernails and fractures to the hands?
Watch the form, Mr. Lally. Sustained.
What, if anything else, would that include?
It might include bruising to the knuckles. It might include broken fingers.
Now, with reference to the injuries that you were asked about with respect to Mr. O'Keefe's right hand, would those also be consistent with impact from a blunt object as well?
They are blunt impact injuries. Yes.
Now, again, if I could, just with reference to, you asked about different possibilities with the skull fractures and bleeding in the brain. What is your opinion as to sort of how that was caused and sort of, if you could again just go through your opinion as to the head injuries, the skull fracture.
Objection.
Ask it again, Mr. Lally, in a different way.
You asked about some possibilities. What is your opinion as to how those injuries were sustained or manifested in this room?
I don't know how they came to be. I described them and I stated previously that they are consistent with a fall to the back of the head.
And so I'm sorry, Dr. My question is more geared towards as far as the single impact to the back of the skull and then sort of radiating fractures in the skull. If you could explain that in reference to the subdural hemorrhage, the rapid hemorrhage, and the ecchymoses that you observed.
Again, a single impact with a fall could cause all the injuries that were seen in the brain and the skull.
Thank you. I'm
All right, doctor, you are all set. Thank you very much.
All right, whenever you're ready, Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Rusell, could you please in a loud, clear voice state your name and spell your last name for us?
Hi, Dr. Marie Rusell, Russell.
Doctor, what do you do for a living?
I'm emergency room forensic pathologist, just recently retired.
And prior to your retirement, what was your position?
The immediate position before retirement was chief medical executive at the for the state of California at the Corcoran State Prison.
So, Dr. Russell, I'm going to ask you to keep your voice up, okay?
Yes.
Right.
Thank you.
There's a couple of air conditioners in here. Just keep your voice as loud as possible. What is, in fact, an emergency physician?
An emergency physician is a medical specialist who has completed a residency, internship residency in the field of emergency medicine, which is a field which involves taking care of patients that are sick or injured and go to the emergency room.
Can you tell us what your education, starting with your education training and background is that qualifies you as an emergency physician, starting with your education all the way back to college?
Okay, well, I've completed at least 16 years of formal education beyond high school, which includes college, and then 4 years of medical school, then 4 years of emergency medicine residency and internship, and then 4 years of pathology residency, which includes 2 years of anatomic and 2 years of forensic pathology. And then I treated, I've taken a bunch of other courses and attended seminars.
Let's start with your college. Where'd you go to college? Where'd you start?
Okay. MIT. I did my first year at MIT where I took my pre-med courses.
And then what happened after that? By the way, about what year was that?
Oh, that was in 1972 to 73.
Where did you go after MIT?
So what happened? I was interested in becoming a doctor, and so I took the pre-med courses, and then subsequent to that first year, I learned that my mother had metastatic breast cancer, and so I decided to go home to New York to be with her. After that, she subsequently passed away, and I returned to Massachusetts and decided to take advantage of the time off from school to investigate my interest in law enforcement. And I subsequently became a police officer here in Massachusetts.
So following MIT, did you go to a police academy?
I did.
Which police academy did you go to?
I went to the Boston Police Academy.
And did you end up becoming a sworn officer?
Yes.
For how long?
I did it for 7 years full time.
And what department did you work for?
I worked for the City of Malden Police Department.
What years was that, if you could give me a range?
From 1977 to 1984.
During the time that you were a Malden police officer, did you also go to school and continue your formal education?
I did.
Describe that for us, please.
Well, I took specialized courses through the Massachusetts Criminal Justice Training Council.
Objection, move to strike.
All right, so I'm going to strike that. Jurors, disregard that.
Let me ask you this way. I don't want to get into the specifics.
Okay.
While you were a police officer, did you also take formal education before you were medical training or your college?
Yes, I did.
That's what I'm interested in.
Okay.
Tell us about that.
Oh, yeah. So I attended Northeastern University part-time and received a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology.
After you got your degree in psychology from Northeastern, did you go on to continue your education in medicine?
I did. I attended medical school at the University of Massachusetts Medical School from 1983 to 1987.
Also known as UMass?
Yes.
Did you ultimately end up with a medical degree?
Did. Doctor.
After you became a doctor, did you engage in a residency?
Yes.
What years were the residency, that first residency?
So the first residency was from 1987 to 1991, and that was in Los Angeles at the Los Angeles County University of Southern California Medical Center.
Is that also known as LAUSC?
It was at the time, yes.
And that's associated with the University of Southern California Medical Center, is that right?
Yes.
After your first residency, by the way, what was your first residency in? What was the subspecialty?
So it was in emergency medicine, and USC is a very large trauma center.
How would you describe the size and volume of the USC Trauma Center?
Well, it's one of the busiest in the United States.
After your first residency in emergency medicine, did you do a second residency?
Yes.
What was the subspecialty in that second residency?
So I did a 2 years in anatomic pathology and 2 years as a fellow in forensic pathology at the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office.
So you did 2 full residencies after you became a doctor, is that right?
That is correct.
What's the difference? I don't want to go into great detail, but what's the difference between an emergency physician and, for instance, the residency that you did in pathology, both anatomic pathology and forensic pathology? What are the differences?
Well, generally, the emergency physician treats live patients, and the spectrum of injuries can be wide, or illnesses can be wide, and the forensic pathologist treats or deals with deceased patients generally.
Did you become a fellow at the LA Coroner's Office following your second residency?
No, that was part of the second residency.
Understood. Describe that fellowship.
So that was 2 years of full-time work at the LA Coroner's Office under the supervision of very experienced medical examiners. And what I did was I did autopsies, every day, 1 or 2 autopsies every day, attended conferences, and read journal articles, etc. It was a very formalized education.
Did you also become at some point a professor or an assistant professor at LAUSC, the medical center side, the university side?
Yes. So while I was doing the forensic pathology and anatomic pathology residencies during the daytime, I worked as a full-time ER doc supervisor in the capacity of an assistant professor in the evenings.
Did you also become an adjunct professor at Cal State Los Angeles, California State Los Angeles?
Yes.
You have a separate university?
Yes.
And you had separate responsibilities as a professor in that role?
Yes.
Were you also teaching legal medicine and forensic medicine in that capacity?
That is correct. It was a master's level program.
How long were you an ER physician in total and an attending physician for Los Angeles County USC Medical Center?
29 years in total. 4 of those were in training and the rest were as a supervisor. And
Of your 29 years, 25 of your 29 years, you were supervising others.
correct.
Meaning other doctors.
Other doctors, yes.
Teaching other doctors. Yes. And teaching medical students.
Yes, and seeing their cases. Once they examined the patient, they would present their case or tell me about the case, and then I would go in and see those patients in addition to my patients.
That was my next question, doctor. In addition to teaching, were you also specifically assessing, diagnosing, and treating patients of your own?
Yes, not all the time. Some shifts I didn't have to do that, but much of the time, yes.
For the bulk of the 29 years that you were an ER doc, an emergency physician, in other words, were you also attending to patients as well?
Yes.
Once you left that fellowship with the LA Coroner's Office, did you remain active in any way or connected to the Los Angeles Coroner's Office?
Yes, so I would attend their weekly conferences when I could, when I was available to do so, and I also consulted on some cases with them. So if they had something that was interesting and beyond their clinical expertise, they would sometimes consult me.
During your tenure at LAUSC, did you become the director of any of their sub-programs?
Yes.
Can you describe that for the viewers, please?
Yes, I was a director of the USC Center for Life Support Training. So, that involved teaching other doctors life support courses such as advanced cardiac life support, or that we teach the surgeons advanced trauma life support.
I'm sorry.
Well, go ahead.
Were you also a director for their quality improvement in the early 2000s?
Yes, for the emergency medicine department.
What was the reason for the quality improvement program, if you will, for LAUSC?
Well, for any program, it's ideal to have a quality improvement component, because what you want to do is look at cases that were treated and see if there were any errors, and if so, correct the errors, teach the doctors that involved what went wrong, and try to make systemic improvements or teaching improvements to prevent those errors from occurring in the future.
Were you teaching basically best practices for emergency room physicians as well as trauma physicians and surgeons?
Yes, we tried.
And you were the director of that program, correct?
Yes.
Did you also become the director of LAUSC Jail Medical Services?
Yes.
What is the connection or the tether between the jail system in Los Angeles and LAUSC Medical Center?
Well, LAC Jail Ward was established about 70 years ago, and it was a place that the officers from various agencies such as LA Sheriff's, LAPD, California Highway Patrol, or any of the municipalities around could bring people that they arrested who were in need of medical care.
So the jail system, very large jail system, I'm guessing, in Los Angeles, correct?
Correct, yes.
There have to be medical attendants to that jail system, correct? Yes. And you became the director of the jail medical services for the entirety of that system?
For the hospital component of it.
Understood. In California, you're obviously licensed in California.
Yes.
There is a state medical board in California, correct?
Yes.
And did you ever do any work with that state medical board?
Yes, I worked with them for about 7 years part-time as a regular employee embedded in their enforcement unit. And what that involved was examining cases that were referred to the medical board because of substandard care or illegal activities of the providers. It was for physicians and physician assistants that we regulated.
What was your title with the state medical board for those purposes?
The title was medical consultant. That was the official title.
Okay. And then before your retirement By the way, what years were you the medical consultant for, or a medical consultant for the state board in California?
Oh, gee, I think from 2009 to 2016. I think those were the years. I'm not positive. I did that. That was a job I was doing when I was doing the LA County USC Medical Center job too. It was an extra job.
So you didn't stop working as a physician, an emergency physician at LAUSC to take that position?
No.
You just consulted with them?
I did it once a week, 1 day a week.
Got it. And then with regard to the one of your last positions that you held, did you become the chief medical executive of the California State Prison Corcoran?
Yes.
Tell me about that position and the years that you held that position.
So that was from 2018 to 2023. And as the chief medical executive, I was the supervisor of all the doctors and nurse practitioners that provided care to the inmates.
And obviously the California prison system is a very large prison system.
Very.
Doctor, are you board certified in emergency medicine?
Yes.
Are you a member of the National Association of Medical Examiners?
Yes, I'm actually fellow status, which is higher than member.
Are you a member of the American Academy of Forensic Science?
Yes, again, I'm a fellow there.
Which also is an advancement above just being a member?
Correct.
Have you ever published in the area, and now I'm going to get very specific, have you ever published peer-reviewed articles and done research in the area of animal bites and scratches?
Yes.
Did you author or co-author a peer-reviewed article named Managing Law Enforcement Dog Bites in the ER?
Yes.
About what year was that?
It was in the 1990s.
Late 1990s, 1996, does that
Yes.
sound right? Did you also author or co-author an article called Law Enforcement Canine Dog Bites, Injuries, Complications, and Trends?
Yes.
So given those articles, did you study specifically dog bites, dog wounds on the human body?
Yes, I have a very strong interest in wounds in general, and I have a strong interest in dog bites in particular.
During the course of your career, your professional experience, how many patients would you say you've seen or treated with animal injuries, including bites and scratches?
It's very hard to estimate, but between my own practice and the residents that I supervised, it was, I'm sure, well over 500 and could possibly be double that.
Could be up as many as 1,000.
It could be, yes.
Have you qualified as an expert in emergency medicine in the past?
Yes.
You qualified as an expert in the area of forensic pathology and wounds in the past?
Yes.
Is that both in federal and state courts?
Yes.
Doctor, were you asked to review certain materials related to this case in furtherance of coming to some opinions and conclusions about injuries suffered by John O'Keefe specific to his right arm?
Yes.
What did you review in coming to your opinions and conclusions?
Well, I reviewed hospital records and pictures taken of him in the hospital, when he was in the hospital. I reviewed autopsy records, the autopsy report, and photographs taken during and before the autopsy. I reviewed, let's see, I reviewed reviewed the grand jury testimony of the autopsy pathologist. I reviewed affidavit of Dr. Sheridan. I reviewed the town of Canton dog bite reports about regarding incidents.
May we approach?
Yes.
Doctor, you've listed several items that you reviewed and coming to your opinions and conclusions. Did you also review a toxicological report?
Yes.
And a neurology report, neuropathology report?
Yes.
As well, from the Commonwealth?
Yes.
Based on your review of all of those materials, I don't want to know what your opinion or conclusion is yet, but were you able to come to an opinion or conclusion concerning the injuries specifically to John O'Keefe's arm?
Yes.
Or his right arm? Were there any documents in furtherance of your review from UC Davis?
Yes.
Did you review those as well?
Objection.
Sustained.
With course permission, may we display exhibit 19, please?
Okay.
Doctor, I want to show you a photograph and ask you very quickly, have you seen this before?
Yes.
Is this one of a number of photographs that you reviewed in furtherance of your evaluation of this case?
Yes, it is.
I'd like to just focus your attention on this for just a quick second and ask you, does this accurately reflect the wounds or injuries that you saw on John O'Keefe's right arm in coming to your opinions and conclusions?
Yes, it reflects the injuries that I saw in photographs.
All right. Now, based on your review of all of the data that you've talked about, all of the information that you were given and reviewed, what is your opinion or conclusion about how these injuries were sustained?
I believe that these injuries were sustained by an animal, possibly a large dog, because of the pattern of the injuries.
Could you describe for the jurors, please, on what you based that opinion?
Yes. Well, may I use the?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. There's a number of patterns here. There on the upper part of the arm, there's parallel lines, and those were inflicted by either teeth or claw marks. So there's a number of patterns that could be teeth or claw mark. And so this is one set right here. This is the one further down, closer to the elbow, is another set of parallel marks. Again, probably most likely from teeth marks. And the reason I say that is, in addition to the parallel marks up here, down here, there's also little punctate, incomplete puncture marks here, little round marks right there that were inflicted by the actual point of the tooth.
Okay, that was my question. What relevance does that have to your determination that this was likely caused by an animal?
Yes, and I can explain it in a moment, the various kinds of wounds that animals can inflict. But going on with the picture first. So then down right at the elbow, there's another different series of marks that again have linear abrasions up where the pointer is, and then down below some punctate, superficial, round, small abrasions, again representing upper and lower teeth, in my opinion. And then there are some irregular wounds down just below the elbow. And these are all, by the way, on the exterior surface, or what we call what doctors would call the posterior surface of the arm, which is the part of the arm that would sustain defensive type wounds. So if someone were to protect themselves.
Objection.
So sustain. Next question.
Sure. Doctor, if I can ask another question. Just to clear up what you said a little earlier about some of the wounds close to the elbow, is it your opinion that both the top teeth and bottom teeth could have created some or all of the injuries on that elbow area?
Yes.
Okay, so in other words, instead of the mouth going all the way around the arm, it could have, the top and bottom jaw could have situated itself on this portion that we're seeing, the posterior part of the arm?
Yes. And in this case, the animal did not get a good enough contact.
Objection. Move to strike.
So I'm going to strike that. Ask a different question.
Have you seen contact wounds where the animal, a dog for instance, gets a very solid purchase on the leg, arm, part of the body?
Yes.
Okay, is that this or is this something else?
Something else.
Describe that.
Well, an animal inflicts injuries. The type of injury depends in part on the actual type of contact and how much force is applied by that animal, in addition to any relative movement between the animal and the victim in this case. So, for instance, in the law enforcement dog bites, many of...
Objection.
So the nature, is it notice? Is it, what's one word?
May we approach?
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Without getting into any specifics about police canines, does this appear as the pattern of injuries that you see appear consistent with an animal or a large dog?
Yes.
Does the number of injuries that you see here relegated to just the right arm, is that also consistent with an animal or large dog?
Yes, it can be.
Is the direction of the injuries, or the consistency of the direction of the injuries, the parallel injuries, is that also consistent with an animal or large dog attack?
Yes.
Based on everything that we discussed today, doctor, is it your opinion, based on a reasonable degree of medical certainty, that these injuries were from an animal attack, possibly a large dog?
Yes.
Can I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
That's all I have this time.
Okay.
May we approach?
Okay.
Sure. Good afternoon, Mark.
Good afternoon, sir.
Now, testified that you're certified in emergency medicine, is that correct?
That is correct.
And you're not, nor were you ever certified in forensic medicine, is that correct?
That is correct.
Pathology.
Correct.
And when was the last time that you worked at a coroner's office?
1995 in terms of doing autopsies. Yes.
Now, when was it that you first spoke to anyone from defense counsel in regard to your coming in here and testifying today?
May 17th.
Doctor, I am going to ask you to keep your voice up.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
May 17th, 2024.
May 17th of this year, is that right?
2024.
So about 6 weeks after this trial began.
I don't know when the trial began.
Now, as far as who reached out to who?
I reached out to a district attorney that I worked with with the LA coroner's office.
And then somehow that person put you in touch with Mr. Jackson, is that right?
Yes.
And was that also on May 17th?
17th and 18th, yes.
So I'm sorry, 17th or the 18th? Which one was it that you spoke with Mr. Jackson?
I didn't speak to him.
You did not speak to him?
Not speaking, not verbal. There was some email communication or text communication.
You communicated with him? Was
Yes.
that on the 17th or the 18th?
Yes, both, I think.
Both. Okay. And when did you render this opinion as far as what you've testified to here today?
Shortly after he sent me the files.
Now, in regards to those files, you testified in this court a couple days ago, correct?
I did.
You were under oath at that point, is that correct?
Excuse me?
You were under oath at that point, is that
Yes.
correct? And when you were asked specifically what materials that you had reviewed, you included a number of items, but you did not include anything about a Dr. Sheridan affidavit, anything about a UC Davis report, or anything about any sort of bite history for a canine that lived or resided at 34 Fairview Road, correct?
That's correct, because I hadn't reviewed them then.
And so since then, 2 days ago, now you've reviewed them, correct?
Yes, I became aware that those files existed, yes.
You became aware of those files? Were they not sent to you previously?
No, I think there were technical difficulties regarding me and the computer and downloading from Dropbox. And so, yeah, so they were, I think they were sent to me, but I think I didn't open them.
Now, with reference to these technical difficulties, did you ever express any of those technical difficulties, or, hey, I can't see the whole file, or there's other things in here that are listed that I can't look at?
No, I wasn't aware.
And so with regard to, as far as your reaching out or contact in regard to this case? How did that come about?
I saw an article, I believe it was in the Boston Globe, regarding this case. And I didn't, initially I didn't think anything of it. Then I saw an article that indicated that there was some.
I asked you anything about anything any article indicated. You saw an article in the Boston Globe about this case, is that right?
Yes.
And how did you come upon it? You have a subscription to the Boston Globe?
I did at the time, yes.
You did at the time. What time was this?
In May.
May of 2024?
Yes.
And how long had you had a subscription to the Boston Globe at the time that you saw this?
It was either a 6-month subscription or a year. I don't remember.
And that was the first time that you had seen anything about that?
First time I paid attention to anything like that, yes.
Now, again, you had testified here just a couple of days ago when I asked you questions about this. Is that right?
Yes.
It wasn't in your testimony just a couple of days ago that the subscription was actually for a year or 18 months.
No.
Remember, not 6 months, a year.
So only one person can talk at a time. So was that your testimony, doctor?
No, I don't believe so. I believe that I said it was a 6-month subscription or a 12-month subscription.
But in any event, you saw something. That's the first time that you recall seeing anything in the media about this case was May of 2024?
It was the first time that I recall reading anything about it. Correct.
And did you write a report in regard to your opinions that you testified here today?
No.
And I asked you that a couple days ago as well.
Yes.
Okay, so in the last couple of days, you've had time to review UC Davis report, Dr. Sheridan's affidavit, and any sort of dog bite history, but you haven't had a chance to write a report. Objection.
Sustained to that point.
You haven't written a report, correct?
That's correct.
Why not?
I haven't been asked to write a report, sir.
Did you ever look at anything related to Mr. O'Keefe's head injury?
I looked at.
Objection.
Sustained.
Now, doctor, you testified that you had some familiarity with areas of forensic science. You're on some boards, things of that nature. Is that correct?
Yes.
And as a result of that or any other work experience, are you familiar with a NAS report from 2008?
Not with that limited information, no.
You're not aware of a report issued by the National Association of Forensic Science in 2008, which specifically has a section dealing with.
So I'm going to see you both at sidebar again.
So, ma'am, you're not familiar with that report specifically as it applies to forensic odontology?
So could you say that again, Mr. Lally? What's the report?
The National Academy of Sciences 2008 report in relation to the section referring to forensic odontology.
I'm not familiar with that specific report, no.
So then you're equally unfamiliar with the representation that is not from the NAS report, that is not a reliable science as far as bite marks.
There are certain aspects of bite marks that have been deemed not reliable, and that I believe has to do with saying that this particular person or animal inflicted this particular bite. But that's very specific, and that's what I'm aware of. That recommendation.
You're not aware of any findings in the NAS report that's questioning the value and scientific objectivity of such evidence.
For specifically identifying a bite mark to an individual that might have inflicted the bite mark, I think that's what that applies to.
I'm not asking, again, this is a report. Are you familiar with it or are you not familiar?
I'm familiar with a summary or a abstract of a report that indicates that forensic odontology is not is deemed not reliable when it comes to that particular narrow aspect of forensic odontology.
And so you're not familiar with it also talking about sample data and collection, analyses of these, interpretation and reporting of results. You're not familiar with those areas of the NAS report as well?
What specifically, do you have a specific question about that? Or
first question was whether or not you're familiar with the report. You indicated that you weren't.
I did not read the report.
Mr. Lally, let the witness answer one question at a time, one speaker at a time. Doctor, can you answer that question?
I did not read that report.
Now, you had written some articles that you were asked about in reference to dog bites, canine dog bites in the emergency department. Is that correct?
Yes, co-authored.
Something that you published or authored or co-authored sometime in the late 1990s. Is that right?
Correct.
And in that instance, you talk about law enforcement dogs and a bite and hold technique, correct?
Yes.
Now, part of the reason in writing that article had to do with sort of the applied forces and the unique spectrum of injuries from those kind of dog bites. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that spectrum of injuries would include deep puncture wounds. Is that right?
It can, yes.
Severe crush injuries. Is that right?
Correct.
Large tissue avulsions and lacerations. Is that right?
Yes.
Wounds necessitating surgical debridement. Is that right?
Yes.
Bony injuries ranging from cortical violations to displaced fractures. Is that right?
Yes.
Neurovascular damage. Is that right?
Yes.
And other wounds at high risk for infection, correct?
Correct. But we also put a disclaimer in that article.
I'm not asking you about any disclaimer.
Okay.
I'm asking you about that's what the type of injuries that you were looking at. Is that correct?
Yes, but we saw a skewed population.
Did you skew population in the study? Is that correct?
What we saw the worst of the worst.
Or no? Did
Yes.
you skew population in the study?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the
Did you
question.
skew the population?
We skewed them? Did we skew? No, we reported on all the ones that presented to the emergency room for care. However, a lot of dog bites don't present to the emergency room.
And so from the different cases that you report on within that article, are there any of those cases in which there is injuries to just one aspect of one part of the human body for the victims of dog attacks, dog bites in those cases?
There may have been. That's a summary of the 700 cases, more than 700 cases.
Is it normal in any kind of animal attack for injuries to occur on just one side of one arm of the person that's being attacked, clawed, or bitten?
There are many people who are bitten or scratched.
I'm asking
Only-
if it's normal, ma'am. That's all I'm
Okay,
asking.
so hold on, Mr. Jackson. Mr. Lally, ask a question, wait for the answer, and then start a next question. Do not interrupt the witness.
I apologize. I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm asking for an answer response to the question.
So ask a question and ask it in a manner that you get a responsive answer.
Dr. Russell, is it your testimony that it's normal in an animal attack for injuries to occur on just one side of one arm and nothing else, anywhere else on that person's body?
It can be, yes.
I'm not asking if it can be. I'm asking, is that normal?
I can't say.
Sustained, you have to ask the question differently.
So from your observations, you look at various photographs of Mr. O'Keefe, is that right?
I did.
Did you observe any injuries on any other part of his body that you would attribute to an animal attack, whether it was claw marks or bite marks or anything else?
No.
So nothing on his left arm, correct?
Nothing that identified as a dog bite or
Nothing on
scratch.
his legs, is that correct?
That's correct.
Nothing on his torso, is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, you say an animal attack, possibly a large dog, correct?
Yes.
Can you say what type of animal left these marks that you attribute to an animal attack?
Not with 100% certainty, no.
Can you say where physically Mr. O'Keefe was located when those the animal attack supposedly occurred? Objection.
Can you say that?
No.
Okay.
Can you say when Mr. O'Keefe reportedly sustained these injuries from an animal attack?
Well, to a certain degree, yes. Before it was before death, but not long enough to have a big inflammatory reaction. So yes. So minutes to hours before death.
Minutes to hours before death, but at some point before death, correct?
Yes.
Can you say anything about the breed of dog?
No.
Can you say anything about whether it occurred inside the house, outside the house, anything like that?
No.
As far as some of the different things that you reviewed over the course of your testimony, or the preparation of your testimony, both prior to Tuesday and between Tuesday and today, any of those things contain any forensic reports or phone examinations or anything else related to this case?
Could you repeat that? I didn't. What kind of examination?
Any of
Phone?
the materials that you reviewed, whether it be prior, sometime between May 17th and Tuesday, or anything that you reviewed between Tuesday and today, do any of those materials that you reviewed contain any sort of forensic reports or anything beyond the UC days?
Yes, I saw a photograph.
You saw photographs. And to that point, you never actually saw Mr. O'Keefe's life, correct? You saw photographs.
That's true.
And with respect to the UC Davis report, as far as canine DNA, are you aware that the results of that were that there was no canine DNA on Mr. O'Keefe, on swabbings that were sent to the UC Davis lab?
I'm going to allow it.
Yes, but there was clothing in between.
Okay, but the swabbings came from the clothing with tears in the clothing in the same area as the injuries, correct?
Okay.
Do you know that or no?
I couldn't tell if they came from the wound or the clothing. I thought that they came from the clothing, but
You couldn't tell by reviewing the report whether or not swabbings came from clothing or from Mr. O'Keefe's body.
I know the clothing was sent to the laboratory,
You know the clothing was sent to what laboratory?
to the DNA laboratory.
To UC Davis?
Oh, I don't know that. I'm sorry.
You are aware that that came back as far as negative for any canine DNA, correct?
That's correct.
Now, as far as the injuries that you observed, your testimony is that both the top teeth of whatever animal this is and the bottom teeth of whatever animal this is both made contact with only the top of Mr. O'Keefe's arm or the posterior of his arm?
Both sets of teeth made contact with certain of those wounds, yes, but not all of them.
But neither the top nor the bottom teeth made any contact that you observed, assuming your issue as far as an animal attack. There's no evidence of any animal attack on the bottom of Mr. O'Keefe's right arm, correct?
I'm not sure what you mean by bottom.
Anterior,
Interior? That's correct.
and nothing on the posterior or the anterior of his left arm,
That is correct.
and nothing on his legs,
That's correct.
nothing on his torso,
Correct.
nothing on his head. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, as far as the marks that you did observe that you do attribute to an animal attack, can you even say with certainty whether or not those marks you feel are bite marks versus scratch marks? Do you have any idea which are which?
There may be a combination.
So is that no?
Well, no, I think that the ones that had the linear abrasions above the small round punctate abrasions, I believe that those are bite marks from upper and lower teeth.
Now, you indicated that part of what you had reviewed was a dog bite history for a dog from 34 Fairview Road named Chloe. Is that right?
Yes.
And there were a couple different instances of that dog essentially getting in a fight with other dogs, correct?
Yes.
And at any point in time, did you see anything in there as far as a dog going after a human in which there was no other dog present?
No.
And there were actually photographs contained within that material of dog bites from that dog, from Chloe, correct?
Yes.
Did any of those dog bites that you saw in those photographs look anything like what you observed in the photos that you saw of Mr. O'Keefe's arm?
No, but okay.
Oh, no. Objection, Your Honor.
No, so the answer is no. You can get back up, Mr. Jackson, but the answer to that question is no. Next question.
So is it your testimony that from reviewing what you reviewed, that what you observe on Mr. O'Keefe's arm is consistent with an animal attack to the exclusion of any other possibilities?
To a degree of reasonable medical certainty, yes.
So as far as any other sort of blunt impact injuries, other manifestations of how those scratches got there, you're saying, nope, had to be an animal attack.
I've seen thousands of wounded.
Come on. What I'm asking you is,
All right. So, Mr. Lally, I'm going to let the witness answer.
Go ahead.
I've seen thousands of people with injuries to their skin, and from blunt, from sharp, from all different mechanisms. Those injuries did not look like blunt force injuries.
So it's your testimony that the injuries to his arm don't look anything like blunt force injuries that you've seen before. You wouldn't characterize them as that?
That's correct.
And that's based on some photographs and some other materials that you began reviewing sometime May 17th, 2024.
Yes, I'm an ER doctor. I need to make a diagnosis quickly when I see something, and I'm trained to do that. That's my specialty.
Were you being asked as an ER doctor to come to a quick conclusion in this case?
No,
But you did anyway.
it's how I'm trained.
Nothing further.
Very briefly, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Concerning the forensic odontology report, the NAS report that Mr. Lally asked you about, what is your understanding about the report as it pertains to identifying individuals who left a bite mark? Explain that to me, please.
I believe the report says that is not reliable as it once was thought to be.
Like a fingerprint identifying a human being, DNA identifying a person, or a bite mark identifying a person. NAS said, not the bite mark, doesn't work that way.
That's correct.
Has nothing to do with the pattern of injuries that you've seen 1,000 times from animals, correct?
Correct.
You were asked several questions about the injuries that you saw and studied attended to highly trained canines, police dogs, correct?
Yes.
Very different than just a domestic dog that somebody might have as a pet, correct?
Correct.
And the bite injuries are very, very different as well, aren't they?
That is correct.
You were asked whether or not you were aware, based on UC Davis's report, that there was no canine DNA found on the swabs that were sent to them, correct?
Yes,
Were you also aware that there was pig DNA?
I'm aware of that.
Did that have any impact in did you analyze that at all, one way or the other?
Not to any degree of scientific certainty, no.
But you do know that dogs chew on pig ears sometimes, correct?
Objection.
Sustained.
You've reviewed at least a report, not a series of reports that indicate that a particular dog has an attack history, correct?
Yes,
You were asked specifically by Mr. Lally whether or not the wounds in a dog attack on another dog attack where a human stuck a hand in the middle look anything like these. Correct? Remember that question?
I remember a question like
And
that.
you said no, but, and then you were cut off. Remember that?
Yes,
You finished that answer for us.
yes. So animals and dogs in particular can inflict a wide variety of injuries on the skin, from just individual puncture wounds to abrasions where there's a scratching of the skin to where there's actually a pulling away pulling away of the skin from the underlying tissues, your ripping effect. And so there's a variety of wounds that or patterns that one can see from an animal attack. It depends a lot on the thickness of the skin, the movement of between the victim and the animal, and also the power of the animal and the training of the animal. Yes.
So in other words, not all wounds inflicted by a particular animal are going to look exactly the same.
Correct.
Very dynamic situation, isn't it?
Objection.
Sustained.
Doctor, having seen up to 1,000 bite and claw marks on the human body, and based on your review of the entirety of the case file that you reviewed, including the nature and the pattern and consistency of the injuries you saw on Mr. O'Keefe's right arm, what is your opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty about the nature of those injuries?
Objection.
Sustained.
What is your ultimate conclusion and opinion about the injuries that you saw and that you reviewed and that we saw today?
Objection.
Sustained.
Can you tell the jurors at the end of the day what is your opinion and conclusion about those injuries?
Objection.
Sustained.
John, can we approach? Thank you. No more questions.
You are unmuted. Mr. Lally, you had no more questions?
No.
Okay. All right, doctor, you are all set.
Okay. Thank you.
Good morning, doctor.
Good morning.
I'm going to ask you to, when you testify, sir, please speak into the microphone if you can, loud and clear.
Very well.
All right,
Okay.
thank you.
Is it working?
It should be. All right, thank you. All right, Ms. Little.
Good morning. Can you state your first name and spell your last name for the record, please?
My first name is Frank, and the last name is Sheridan, Sheridan.
And then you can make sure to keep your voice up just because the air conditioner is here.
Yeah, I noticed that. Okay.
Dr. Sheridan, what is your profession?
I'm a physician, and my specialty is forensic pathology and neuropathology, but most of my career has been primarily forensic pathology.
What do you currently do for a living?
Nothing, I'm retired.
What role or position of employment did you hold before you retired?
Okay, I was the chief medical examiner for San Bernardino County, California, and I was in that position from 1991 until 2017. That's when I retired from that position, but I stayed on a part-time basis for another few years to help out because the office was understaffed. But a few years ago, 2021 or 22, I've lost track of the time, I finally stopped altogether.
Dr. Sheridan, if you could just pull the mic up a little bit closer, I don't know.
I'll put myself closer to it, I guess. Okay, is that better?
And Ms. Little, if we need to, just let us know and we'll turn off the air conditioning.
Your Honor. Describe your educational background for the jury.
Okay, well, I was born and raised in Dublin, Ireland, and I had all my initial education there, including primary school, secondary school, and then pre-medical school at the university I was at was the University College Dublin, Ireland, which is part of the National University of Ireland system. So I did my pre-med and medical school training there, and I graduated from medical school in 1971. Then after that, I did a one-year rotating internship, as it's called, of medicine, surgery, and some psychiatry as well. That was a requirement for all doctors for licensure. So that's basically my initial education. Should I go on with my CV or base or not?
Yes. What did you do after medical school to complete your training?
Well, in the years after medical school, I wasn't in training anymore. I was working in Africa, actually, as a medical officer. And that wasn't training, that was a job. And I was there for 3 years in Central Africa. And I was a general medical officer with various duties that included some teaching, but also seeing patients. So I did that for basically 3 years. I then returned to Ireland, and I spent the next 2 years. We're now talking about, by the way, the years I'm about to mention are 1976 to 78. So I was back in my home country, Ireland, and I spent those 2 years doing research and lecturing in pharmacology. Pharmacology is the study of drugs and how they act in the body. And I did that back at the same university where I had originally trained for medical school. So then in 1978, I came to the United States, initially to the University of Oregon, and I spent the next almost 3 years doing research there and lecturing in the field of genetics. It was during the time I was there that I decided to do forensic pathology. So starting in 1980, let me think for a second, 1982, I then had to start what's called a residency program in pathology. And the first part of that, the first year of that, was in Loma Linda University Medical Center in Southern California. I then had to interrupt my residency training, and I had to go and work in family practice for a year. This was because I was going through the immigration system of the United States, and they required that people in my position work for a year in family practice in a manpower shortage area, as they designated it, an area where there weren't enough doctors. So I did that in a place called Yucca Valley, Yucca Valley, California. But then after that year, I returned to the residency program and continued on at Loma Linda University Medical Center. And this training was in what's called anatomic pathology, which in a way you can think of it as general pathology. It involved autopsies, it involved surgical pathology, looking at slides from surgery. It involved a few other things as well. And so I was doing that there at Loma Linda. Then from 86 to 88, I went to Los Angeles County, USC, which stands for University of Southern California. So LA County USC, as it's generally known, for 2 years of training in neuropathology. Neuropathology being disease and injury of the brain, spinal cord, so forth. So that was from 86 to 88. And then in 1988, I went to the coroner's office, as it was then called. It's now a sheriff coroner's office, but at that time it was a coroner's office, and in San Bernardino. I did my 1 year required training in forensic pathology there. When I finished that year, I stayed on at the same office. And then in 1991, I was appointed chief medical examiner for the county. And as I mentioned earlier, I was in that position up until 2017. And I'm board certified in anatomic pathology, which I mentioned before is general pathology in a sense. Also neuropathology, as I mentioned about the brain and spinal cord primarily. And then finally, forensic pathology.
In other words, Dr. Sheridan, you're triple board certified, is that correct?
I am, yes.
And that's in anatomic pathology, neuropathology, and forensic pathology.
That's correct, yes.
Can you describe any relevant teaching positions that you've held?
Yes.
Keep your voice up. I'm sorry, it's hard to hear back here.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, I still do some teaching, actually. First of all, I'm on the staff of Loma Linda University Medical Center, the place where I did my initial training. And I give lectures on a regular basis there to the pathology residents, like I used to be myself. And in addition to that, for a long time, for about 20 years, actually, up until COVID, I was also giving annual, well, no, actually twice a year, courses on forensics at the University of California, Riverside Extension, as it's called. And I did that for, as I said, essentially 20 years, I think. But that stopped with COVID. So I haven't been doing that since the beginning of COVID epidemic. I've also given annual lectures, or not lectures, but courses, 3-day courses, to the California Criminalistic Institute, which is part of the forensic system in California. And then in addition to that, I was associated with another university for a while, but that sort of gradually elapsed. And that's basically it. I give occasional lectures at, well, actually at least once a year at various other places, just individual lectures. I'm a visiting lecturer, in other words, and at community colleges and even high schools, actually. And then I forgot to mention one more thing. For 2 years, I was a visiting professor at a university in China, in what's called Hangzhou, H-A. I don't know if I pronounced it correctly even to this day, but Hangzhou, H-A-N-Z-H-O, whatever, H-O-U. It's a big city in China anyway, somewhere. And I was there for 2 years, on two different years, I mean, giving courses on forensic pathology.
And Dr. Sheridan, are you a member of any academic or professional societies?
Of societies? Yes, I've been a member, although I've let it lapse recently intentionally, but I've been a member of the National Association of Medical Examiners for many years. I'm also a member of the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, and also the American Forensic Institute, or the AAFS, American Academy of Forensic Science. I'm also a member there.
And have you authored any peer-reviewed articles or publications in the areas of forensic pathology or neuropathology?
Yes, but not recently. When I was working, it was too busy to publish. But yes, I did author a few papers earlier on in my career. One of which it wasn't really neuropathology, but it was neurology more than. Well, it was actually neuropharmacology. And then I did author another paper on that was related to my forensic pathology work on organ donation, organ and tissue donation for transplantation. Those are the two main ones. But there were a couple of other lesser papers.
Can you describe your duties as the Chief Medical Examiner of San Bernardino County?
Yes, as Chief Medical Examiner, I had some administrative responsibilities. Fortunately, not too many, because there were other people to do it. But most of my responsibility there was supervising the medical part of the coroner's office. In other words, the autopsy section. And I was supervising other pathologists, but I was also working full-time doing autopsies myself. So I spent most of my time actually performing autopsies. But I did have, as I said, administrative roles and the role of supervising colleagues. And of course, as a medical examiner, as a forensic pathologist, I frequently had to testify in court, rather like I'm doing now. So that was another part of my duty.
And during the course of your professional experience, approximately how many autopsies do you believe you conducted?
It's between 12 and 13,000. I think it's closer to 13,000.
And have you qualified as an expert in the areas of forensic pathology, neuropathology, and anatomic?
In courts, yes. Yes, well over 400 times.
How many was that?
Over 400.
And did you review materials related to this case in furtherance of coming to an opinion and conclusion about Mr. O'Keefe's injuries?
Yes, I did. I reviewed quite a lot of materials.
What did you review?
Okay, I reviewed the autopsy report on this case. Along with that, there was the neuropathology report, which was separate. There was a toxicology report. There were autopsy photographs. These were all of primary importance to me, all these things. Then I also reviewed the complaint in this case, outlining, in other words, the basic details of the case. I reviewed photographs taken at the scene of death of Mr. O'Keefe, photographs of the vehicle that was allegedly involved in his death, photographs of the decedent himself before the autopsy, while he was at the hospital, at Good Samaritan Hospital. Then there was also some videos of the scene of death. I also saw the death certificate, a document by CERT, S-E-R-T, police reports from Canton Police Department. Am I missing anything out? I don't think so. Yeah.
Your Honor, permission to publish what's been previously marked as Exhibit 19.
Sure.
Dr. Sheridan, is this one of the photographs that you reviewed in reaching your opinions and conclusions in this case?
Yes, it is.
Can you describe the injuries that you see in this photograph?
These injuries that you're looking at here on the arm are abrasions, which are friction injuries, basically. We classify them under the general category of blunt force injury, but these particular ones are abrasions. The abrasions being where the outer layer of the skin, the epidermis as it's called, has been scraped off. These are friction injuries, essentially.
And based on your review of the information discussed earlier, can you tell, as well as your review of these photographs, can you tell whether these injuries were sustained before or after death?
These injuries were sustained before death. We call them ante-mortem, A-N-T-E, mortem meaning before death. And that's based primarily on their color. And you have to take other things into consideration, but that's the basics of it. If these had been post-mortem, they would have a more yellowish orange color, usually yellow.
In your professional opinion, based on a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, are those injuries consistent with being struck by a vehicle while holding a drinking glass?
Objection.
Sustained.
May we approach, Your Honor?
Sure.
Dr. Sheridan, are these injuries consistent with a motor vehicle accident, in your opinion?
Sustained.
I would say in general, no. I think,
So that objection was sustained. I think Ms. Little's going to put it to you in a different way.
I'm sorry.
If you could assume, for purposes of this question, that this individual was involved in a motor vehicle collision as a pedestrian, based on your review of his photographs, are those injuries consistent with having been struck by a vehicle?
Objection.
Sustained. Why don't you come back on that?
Dr. Sheridan, how many autopsies have you conducted on individuals who were involved in pedestrian vehicle motor collisions?
Involved in what pedestrian vehicle? Of course, yeah. Well over 100.
What other experience do you have in terms of conducting autopsies with individuals who have been involved in motor vehicle collisions?
Well, I mean, if you take motor vehicle accidents in general, they'd be probably nearly a quarter of my total number of autopsies. So in other words, that'd be close to 3,000. Yeah, that's about right.
Based on your professional experience, what is your opinion regarding whether those injuries are consistent with a pedestrian being struck by a motor vehicle?
Yes.
I'm going to allow it.
You can answer that question.
Hmm?
Can you answer that?
I can answer it, yes.
So go right ahead.
Okay. Okay. The question was to be precise. Can you just rephrase it? I mean, I said yes, I can answer it, but I can't remember exactly how you phrased it.
Yes, based on your extensive training and experience, what is your opinion regarding whether those injuries are consistent with an individual being struck by a vehicle?
If you mean struck in that part of the body on the arm, like
Yes.
directly, I would say no, it doesn't look like that at all. Mhm.
And can you explain that?
Well, if you're hit by a vehicle, whichever part of your body is hit, if it's a significant impact at all, you're going to get bruising. And we don't have any bruising here. We just have what I would call linear abrasions without any bruising. So that does not look to me at all remotely like an impact from a motor vehicle.
What would you expect to see if an individual's arm were struck by the rear of a motor vehicle?
Well, as I just said a second ago, primarily a lot of bruising. And that's what we don't see here. You might see, well, depending on the circumstances, you might see other things like a fracture or fractures, but you would at least expect bruising.
In your professional opinion, based on your many years of experience, have you conducted any autopsies involving individuals who were involved in any sort of animal attack?
Animal attacks in general, yes, quite a few actually. Well, when I say quite a few, it's not an enormously common event, but I've done probably at least a dozen or so involving deaths where an animal was involved one way or another.
Have you conducted any autopsies in which any individual was attacked by a dog?
Yes, I have a few.
Can you describe that?
Well, I'd have to just refresh my memory out of the blue here. But first of all, I had a number of cases, 3 or 4, I think, over the years involving children, primarily children who were killed by feral dogs. And the dogs attacked the kid and killed them. So I had that a few times. But then I've also had cases where an animal or a dog particularly was involved, but wasn't the actual cause of death, so to speak, but they were involved in something that was happening and left some traces of their activity in the form of bite marks or scratch marks.
In your professional opinion, are those injuries consistent with an animal attack?
Are they consistent with what?
An animal attack.
I would say they are, yes. I'm not 100% sure about this, but my initial reaction when I saw this photograph was that it was probably an animal mark, and most likely I would say a dog. Scrape marks with the paws, and possibly also a bite mark from the teeth as well. Possibly. I'm not 100% sure. I didn't get a chance to analyze it right there on the spot, so to speak. But my basic impression is that these are consistent with marks caused by, say, a dog using his paws or claws, if you want to put it that way, and possibly the teeth as well.
And if there's a pointer up there, would it be possible to direct the jury to the injuries that you're referring to on the screen? There should be a little laser pointer up there, I believe. Using the laser pointer, can you indicate the injuries that you just testified are consistent with scratch marks?
Actually, in a sense, they're all consistent with scratch marks in the sort of the more generic sense of whether it's the paws or the teeth, they're going across the skin rather than going straight into it. So they're all of these marks are generally consistent with, if you want to call them scratch marks. So I don't know if this will work on the screen, but you basically got what looks like there's one pair there, with possibly a third one in the middle. There are 2 very clear parallel marks there, with another one fainter in the center. Then you have, going closer to the elbow, you've got another 2 or 3, whichever way you look at that. But at the elbow itself, you have, that part of the elbow there is what I would think is the most likely candidate here for a bite mark, because it has something of the configuration of the outline of teeth. And then the ones on the forearm are a little bit less obvious, but they're still consistent in general with, I would say, claw marks or maybe from the teeth.
Dr. Sheridan, if you assume that the decedent was standing with his arm extended in this manner, and he was struck with the rear taillight of a 7,000-pound plexus only on the arm, such that it spun him around and propelled him 30 feet, do you have an opinion as to whether or not these arm injuries are consistent with that scenario?
Objection.
All right, I'll see you at cycle.
Assume the decedent was standing with his arm outstretched like this and was struck by the rear of an SUV, only in his arm at 24 miles per hour. Are the injuries exhibited consistent with that scenario?
No, I do not think so.
Can you describe that?
Well, as I think I've already mentioned before, one thing that's not there, that should be there, given that idea, that scenario, is there should be bruising, at least bruising, if not perhaps even more than that, but bruising for sure. Secondly, the appearance of these injuries, their pattern, if you want to call it that, the way they're distributed, doesn't seem to fit the idea of the rear of a vehicle being the impacting object.
And at 24 miles per hour, would you expect to see fractures or breaks in the arm?
You could do. There'd be other factors involved it would depend on a lot of things, but it's possible, yeah.
I'd like to direct your attention to the injury that Mr. O'Keefe sustained to his head. Do you recall that injury?
To the head?
To the head.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
Can you describe that injury for the jury?
Well, there were a few minor injuries on the face, but the major injury, and indeed the main cause of death, was an impact to the back of the head, slightly to the right of the midline at the back of the head, and where there was a laceration. A laceration is another type of blunt force trauma, but this is a laceration is where the skin is actually opened up or split, so you get bleeding from a laceration. So there was a laceration, as I said, in the back of the scalp, in what's called the occipital area, and beneath that, when the skin was moved away as part of the autopsy, there was extensive bruising, hemorrhage, in other words, in the scalp at that same point. There was a fracture that started at that point in the skull, but traveled all the way forward to the frontal areas of the skull. So you have the impact. The impact site is clear because, as I said, you've got the laceration. That's where the impact was. So you have that the impact with the scalp hemorrhage there and the skull fractures. Then the brain itself. It had injuries, significant injuries. First of all, there was bleeding on the surface of the brain, and that's very common in situations like this. But in addition to that, there were extensive bruises. Contusions is the real word, actually, but they are essentially bruises of the brain substance itself. And that they were in several different parts of the brain, including the frontal areas, which are near the forehead, and also the temporal, which are towards the side, more or less. And then there was also hemorrhage deep inside the brain, in the ventricles, which are open areas in the center of the brain. All of these things were described in the neuropathology report, and you can see them in the photographs that were part of the neuropathology report as well as the autopsy. As a result of, I should say, the injury to the brain began to swell, and that's what it usually does after major trauma. And as a result of the swelling, you had what's called herniation, where the brain if you want to think of it this way, the brain is trying to expand, but it can't because the skull is around it. So it begins to put pressure, pushing, especially downwards towards the top of the spinal cord. And eventually, as happened in this case, it's quite clear from the photographs, the brain herniated downwards, the brainstem particularly herniated downwards, and this would have been the final straw, so to speak. That's what would lead to respiratory failure and death. So this was a fatal injury for certain.
And what impact would that type of injury have had on the individual after sustaining it?
Yeah, once this injury occurred, once this impact occurred, Mr. O'Keefe would have been unconscious. He would still be capable of breathing for a while until that brain swelling took over and pushed the brainstem down. But he would immediately from the point of impact, he would have been unconscious for sure.
Would he have been able to stand up, move, or walk?
No, he would have been unconscious completely.
Do you have any opinion regarding whether that injury is consistent with having been struck on the ground on dirt or grass?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
I'll rephrase it. That was a poorly worded question. Is that injury consistent with striking dirt or grass?
Like, for example, falling onto grass?
Yes.
No, I don't think so. If there's a fall involved here, and there could be, it would be onto a hard surface. But the grass, and as I understand from all the material I reviewed, there was also some snow, and so that might even cushion the impact even a little bit more. But even without the snow, grass is basically too soft for somebody falling and hitting their head on it to get the injuries I've just described.
In addition to focusing on the injuries that were present, what significance do you place on the absence of injuries when conducting an autopsy?
What significance do I place on what?
In addition to focusing on the injuries that are present, what significance do you place on the absence of injuries when conducting an autopsy?
Well, as you put it there, it's a rather general question, but I mean, when you're doing an autopsy, you obviously want to see what is there and what's not, and everything can be relevant, including absent things. Now, in this particular case, there are a number of features of things that are absent that are important. I've already alluded to one, and that is on the arm. If that was an impact from the vehicle, I would expect bruising. But do you want me to continue?
Yes.
Yeah. But if Mr. O'Keefe was struck with it depends obviously what part of the body is theoretically involved. But if a vehicle hits you, whether it's the back of the vehicle or the front, you're going to have, as long as it's not going extremely slowly, if it's going at any speed at all, any significant speed, it's going to cause at least bruising. And that in this particular case, one of the things that struck me was that there was a distinct absence of bruising on the torso. There's the chest, abdomen, hips, whatever, and also. In most cases that I've ever been involved in where a pedestrian was hit by a vehicle, there are injuries on the legs, including fractures, which are very common on the legs. So the absence of all of these things in this case, I think, is important.
Have you conducted autopsies involving individuals who are involved in fights or altercations?
Yes, many times.
Approximately how many?
Gosh, I have no idea. It's a lot. I mean, I've done, I said earlier that between over 12, maybe 13,000 total autopsies. Of those, I'm going to give you estimates here, but over 1,000 would have been homicides. Of those, probably maybe a fifth, so about 200, would have involved blunt force trauma instead of, for example, a firearm or something like that. And in those cases, and of course, so all of those, and other cases involving sharp force, homicides involving sharp force may have evidence of a struggle as well. So it's in the hundreds. Yeah.
In your expert medical opinion, are Mr. O'Keefe's injuries consistent with a fight or a physical altercation?
In a general sense, they can be. They could be, yes. He had, I alluded to it just briefly before, but the head injury, the major head injury I've described, but he also had a laceration over his right eyelid. He had some scrape marks on his face. He also had some bruises on the back of his right hand, which that kind of injury on the hands can be what we call a defensive injury. In other words, an injury that occurs when you're protecting yourself and you're hit hit either with another fist or with a hard object, and you're protecting yourself. So, I would say that some of these findings I've just mentioned are consistent with the possibility of a physical altercation. Yes.
Thank you. If I could have one moment.
Sure.
No further questions.
Okay, Mr. Lance?
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Injuries that you were just testifying about with regard to Mr. O'Keefe, they were on his right knee, his right arm, as well as the back right side of his head. Is that correct?
Yes, I forgot to mention the knee, but yes, there were injuries in those places. Yes.
And understandable, but this isn't an autopsy you performed yourself, correct?
I did not perform myself. No.
You never saw the body. You're looking at photographs and reports, correct?
Yeah, I'm going by the photographs and the autopsy report. Yes.
And contained within the materials that you reviewed, did you ever look at Mr. O'Keefe's medical records from the Good Samaritan?
Look at whose medical records, Mr. O'Keefe's?
Yes.
I looked at the medical records from Good Samaritan Hospital where he was pronounced dead. Yes.
Okay, so you did look at those as well.
I did look at those. Yeah, I thought I mentioned it earlier. Maybe I forgot.
Now, with regard to what you reviewed of Mr. O'Keefe's injuries, you saw no injuries to his left arm, correct?
To his left arm? No, I don't think so. No.
No injuries to his left leg, correct?
No.
Injuries to his torso that you saw?
That's correct.
And no injuries to the back left side of his head, is that correct as well?
That's correct, yes.
Now, you indicated that you observed or reviewed the autopsy reports as well as autopsy photographs and the death certificate, correct?
I did, yes.
Now, do you agree with Dr. Scordi-Bello's determination as to the cause of death being multiple blunt force type injuries in conjunction with hypothermia?
I do agree with that, yes.
And you reviewed also the neuropathology report by Dr. Stonebridge?
I did, yes.
And do you agree or concur with the findings of Dr. Stonebridge contained within that report?
Yes, there were photographs taken during the neuropathology examination, which were independent confirmation for me of the things described in the report. Yes.
Now, with regard to autopsies that you performed in the past, well, let me ask you this first. As far as the injuries that you observed in the photographs to Mr. O'Keefe's right arm, they were not the cause of Mr. O'Keefe's death, correct?
No, they were not.
With regard to autopsies that you performed in the past, in regard to there being some sort of animal involved, as you were testifying before, is it normal to see just injuries related to an animal attack on just one portion of one piece of body?
Yes, in a general way. I mean, as I mentioned, I think when I was answering the question about the cases I've done involving animals, I tried to divide them into two groups because there's an important difference. Some of those cases were cases where the animals were responsible for the death itself. As I said, a bunch of feral dogs in one case, particularly that I remember. Another was a case where it wasn't a whole bunch of them, but there were two dogs, large dogs, and they killed the victims, children. So those individuals had multiple injuries, including deep bite marks that were fatal, particularly in the neck area. But they also had, and I'm stretching my memory a bit because it's a while since I did these cases, but I do have a general recollection that in in those cases, I should say, in addition to the fatal injuries, there were also some non-fatal sort of things like paw marks. And I can't remember the distribution though on the body.
Can you remember as far as whether or not these injuries that you observed, and not taking the child fatalities with the dog's maul, I'm presuming that those involve injuries to significant and extensive parts of the body, is that correct?
Yeah, those are the ones where the animals caused the death, yes.
So in the other instances that you were talking about, do you recall even whether or not those injuries that you observed were ante-mortem or post-mortem?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last part.
The other ones that you were talking about as far as the other animal attacks that you've seen,
yeah.
Do you recall whether or not the injuries that you observed in those instances were ante-mortem or post-mortem?
Well, ante-mortem. Well, actually, in one of the cases that comes to mind, the marks appeared to be post-mortem, and that was this person was actually a homicide victim, and they were lying outdoors, and their own dog. This was according to police, though, who came on the scene. When they arrived, there was a dog that turned out to be the victim's own dog, was pawing at the body, and the person was dead. But in another case that I can think of, the scratch marks from dog paws were ante-mortem, and they were confined to one place only. I'm trying to remember what part of the body. In this case, I had to testify later on. In this case that I'm thinking of now, the paw marks were limited to just one location. I can't remember exactly where they were, though, whether it was the leg or the arm. I can't remember.
And that was post-mortem injuries that you're talking about there, right?
No, in the second case, they were ante-mortem. So in other words, There's been postmortem and antemortem, yes.
The injuries that you observed on Mr. O'Keefe's arm are to the posterior part of his arm, correct?
Yes, basically, posterior.
No injuries that you observed on the anterior portion or the other side of the right arm, correct?
That's correct, yes.
No other injuries that you observed consistent with what you're talking about as far as an animal attack on any other part of Mr. O'Keefe's body, correct?
That's correct, yeah. Mhm.
And from what you observed from the reports and the photographs, you can't say definitively what type of animal, correct?
That's correct, I can't.
And you can't say even if it was an animal or was a dog, what breed of dog that was. Is that correct?
No, but if I had to try, and if I said,
Not asking you to try, sorry. I'm just asking whether or not you can say whether or not that what breed of dog it was.
no, I can't tell you what breed, no.
You can't say whether or not those injuries were inflicted inside a house or outside of a house. Is that correct?
Yeah, I have no idea. Mhm.
You can't say when they occurred, correct?
Only that they were when he was still alive, yeah. But other than that, no. And they are fresh looking. I mean, this generally, so they look like they happened very shortly before death.
And when you say short time, you're talking about hours,
Minutes to hours, I would say.
minutes, hours. But you can't
I mean, I'm talking just based on the injuries themselves alone, leaving anything else out. You can't time injuries as exactly as you might think from CSI or one of these television programs, but they are generally fresh for sure. And but just looking at those on their own, I would have to say minutes to hours, yes.
Now, at some point, were you given or did you review any files from a lab at the University of California, Davis?
I'm not sure. In relation to what?
So are you aware that the State Police Lab in Massachusetts swabbed areas of the sleeve on the right arm of Mr. O'Keefe and sent samples from that in the areas of where the injuries occurred on his right arm and then sent that to a lab at UC Davis? Are you aware of that?
I'm not sure that I remember that, no.
And so you're equally unaware then that when that was tested, there was no canine DNA found from any of those swabbings in the area where the injuries that you're describing as scratch marks or bite marks occurred?
I wasn't aware of that. I must have missed it.
Are you aware of any sort of bite history or a specific animal at 34 Fairview being involved in attacks on other dogs?
I'm sorry, I don't think I understood that question.
Were you aware that there was a dog that resided at 34 Fairview Road?
Am I aware that there was a dog there?
Yes.
I was informed there was, yes.
Were you also informed that that dog, months later, after January 2022, was involved in an incident in which it attacked another dog, humans intervened, and one of the humans was bit?
No, I didn't know that.
Were you aware that there were photographs of an actual bite mark from that actual dog months after January 29th? Have you shown any of that?
No, I don't believe I was.
And so did you write a report in relation to what you observed or anything in regard to your opinion or your testimony that you're testifying to here today?
I didn't write a report as such, but I signed a declaration early on in my involvement in this case.
And that was a declaration or an affidavit that you signed under the pains and penalties of perjury back on January 31st, 2023. Is that correct?
Sorry, what's about that?
When you're talking about a declaration, you're referring to an affidavit that you filed with the court under the pains and penalties of perjury in January of 2023.
I didn't think it was January, but however, there was only one, so whatever you have.
Now, at any point in time were you made aware that there were microscopic pieces of the defendant's tail light as small as 1/60th of an inch by 1/60th of an inch that were found in Mr. O'Keefe's clothing?
Objection.
I'll allow it.
That were found in Mr. O'Keefe's what?
Mr. O'Keefe's shirts.
I don't remember that specifically.
And that those pieces were then found to be consistent with the defendant's tail light.
Like I said, I don't remember that particular part.
Were you ever shown any material indicating that there was DNA from the defendant's tail light housing that was consistent with Mr. O'Keefe?
I asked about that myself, but I think the answer I got was no.
Now, were you ever told about a piece of human hair that was found on the right rear quarter panel near the area where there was a dent on the back right of the defendant's vehicle?
No, I don't remember that.
And one also said that that was then sent out for mitochondrial DNA testing and was consistent with that of Mr. O'Keefe to a degree of 99.895%.
You talk about a hair sample now. Yeah. No, I didn't have that.
Now, doctor, would you agree that in blunt impact injuries, the characteristics of a blunt object can then be transferred to the victim in the form of pattern abrasions that match the characteristics of that blunt object?
Yes.
Now, of the photographs, you reviewed photographs of the scene, photographs of the vehicle, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
You're aware that there were a number of different pieces of the defendant's taillight that were photographed as well. Did you notice those?
I did, yes.
You recall seeing any piece of a clear plastic taillight piece that was recovered on January 29th, along with Mr. O'Keefe's sneaker that had dimpling on the outside of that clear piece of plastic?
I can't. I remember seeing the pictures of the glass fragments, but I don't remember any more specifics than that.
Do you know what a compression abrasion is?
What?
Compression abrasion.
Yeah, although it's not a term we use all the time, but however, yes.
And a compression abrasion can occur when there's direct pressure from a blunt object together with slight rubbing movements that produce skin and epidermal crushing. Is that correct?
Yeah, you have to have some lateral movement as well, though, to get an abrasion.
Now, when you were talking about prior autopsies that you've done involving pedestrian collisions, is it fair to say that most of those pedestrian collisions that you were doing autopsies on involved pedestrians being struck by the front of the vehicle?
Yeah, mostly the front. Mhm.
So mostly it's pedestrians who are crossing the street or standing in the street who've been struck by the front of the vehicle, correct?
Yeah, I think they were all. I have actually done a couple of cases where children were hit by the back of a reversing vehicle. This was in the days before they had the rear videos on cars that they have now. But so those cases were impacts against the back of the vehicle. But most of the pedestrian cases, yeah, are, as you say, the front of the vehicle hitting the person.
Yeah, just briefly on that, as far as the defendant's vehicle itself, are you aware that there were rear backup cameras and a 360-degree overhead view on the back of her vehicle?
I remember reading that, yes. Mhm.
Now, understanding what you're talking about as far as a rear vehicle pedestrian collision, is that typically sort of the wear on the vehicle? Let me ask you this first. When you are doing an autopsy in relation to a pedestrian collision, much of the information that you're gaining about that is what you receive from the investigating agency, whether it's the police or something like that, correct?
It varies a lot from one case to another. Sometimes you get or virtually no information about the accident. Because some of these cases I've done, some of them were witnessed, some weren't. Let's put it that way. Yeah. So when they weren't witnessed, and when the person was just found later or sometime afterwards, you wouldn't have necessarily any. The vehicle would typically not be there. These would be hit and run type situations, and so in those cases, you wouldn't have all that kind of information. So it varies. It varies.
And understanding that it varies, but primarily what I'm saying is whatever information as far as the body comes in and you're going to conduct an autopsy, there would be some information from law enforcement or witness statements or something as to what type of death this is, as far as gunshot wound, stabbing, pedestrian collision, something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. But like I said, in those unwitnessed cases of pedestrians, I might be given the information that it's probably a pedestrian fatality from a car.
And when it comes to pedestrian collisions, and most of which that you've seen are, again, from the front of the vehicle striking a pedestrian on the roadway, is that correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And are you familiar with what role sort of the center of mass of that person versus the center of mass of where they're struck plays in reference to their injury?
Yeah, that can have a big effect on how the body reacts to the impact. Mm-hmm.
So most of the time when you're talking about sort of lower extremity injuries or pelvic fractures or things like that, that's in a frontal collision with the pedestrian, correct?
Most of them were, yeah. I mean, the ones that involved being backed over, and they were children. I can't remember the exact distribution of their injuries, except the vehicle went right over them. I do remember that. But anyway, the answer to your question, maybe I'm wandering my mind, so can you ask me again?
I think you've answered it. So my next question, sir, is when it comes to the rear end collisions, primarily being children, you agree with me that they have a lower center of mass than a 6'1", 200 something?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so as far as them being run over, they're going to get struck, they're probably going to fall to the ground, and then the vehicle's going to go over, correct?
That's right, yeah.
And so how many autopsies have you conducted in regard to pedestrian collisions where they've been sideswiped by the back of the vehicle?
I can't remember.
Can you remember any?
Not off the top of my head, no. Mm-hmm.
And so if someone is struck by the right rear portion of a vehicle and then projected away from the vehicle based on speed, based on force, based on whatever, would you then expect to see those same type of pelvic fractures or lower extremity injuries that you talked about with a frontal collision?
Well, it depends on the exact position of the victim at the moment of impact. And of course, it could be a lot of different things. They could be, the victim could be facing the vehicle, they could be sideways on, they could have their back. But you're going to see bruising somewhere in that area, in one of those areas, either on the back, the side, whatever, or the front. I would expect to see bruising, significant bruising.
But as you testified earlier on direct, it's sort of dependent or variable depending on how the victim pedestrian interacted with the vehicle. Isn't that correct?
Yes, but I'd expect bruising for sure. I mean, whether you get fractures and so forth will depend on, or for that matter, internal injuries, depends on a variety of factors, but you're going to get bruising for sure.
Now, you did see bruising on Mr. O'Keefe's right hand, correct?
Yes, a small bruising. They look like two, possibly three, almost confluent or close together bruises.
Were you aware from the materials that you reviewed that Mr. O'Keefe was last seen sort of on video exiting from a bar at about 12:11 a.m. holding a cocktail glass in his right hand?
I beg to remember that, yes.
Were you also aware that there were pieces of a cocktail glass with Mr. O'Keefe's DNA on it that were found right in the general vicinity of where his body was found?
That I don't remember.
You talked about a couple of different patterns to the injuries that you observed on Mr. O'Keefe's right arm. So my question for you, doctor, is it your testimony that those, what you're terming as animal bites or scratches, were they caused at one time or multiple times, or how many times are we talking about?
You mean on different occasions?
Yeah, as far as there are multiple abrasions as you've termed them, and you're attributing them to an animal attack, correct?
I think that's the most likely explanation for these, yes.
And so my question is, sir, is that from the dog or the animal or whatever it is scratching Mr. O'Keefe once, more than once, based on what you observed in
Well, it's more than once. When I had the laser pointer here, I think I pointed to roughly, 1, 2, 3, 4 different areas. So it looks like, and you have, there's an additional, the ones on the lower forearm, I should say, are harder to figure out. But it looks like 4, maybe 5 separate.
4 or 5 separate sort of swipes, whether they be with mouth or claws or whatever.
Yeah, that's correct.
And so is it your testimony that it's not possible that Mr. O'Keefe received that from some part of the motor vehicle, or a glass shattering, or shattering from a taillight, or any sort of metal pieces underneath contained within that taillight housing as far as his interaction with the vehicle?
They don't look remotely like that to me.
So it's not possible, is that correct?
In my opinion, no.
You were asked about some questions with regard to the surface of the ground as far as dirt or grass. Are you familiar with what the weather was like at the time that Mr. O'Keefe you testified earlier you were familiar that he was found in the snow, correct?
Yes.
Do you know what the temperature was like as far as, my question is this, sir. Understanding cushioning of grass and dirt under normal conditions, but if the ground is physically frozen based on the temperature of outside, would that impact as far as your understanding of the injuries to the back of Mr. O'Keefe's head?
No, I mean, even if there was a small coating of ice, I wouldn't change my opinion based on that, no.
I'm not talking about ice, sir. What I'm talking about is the ground itself being physically frozen based on the temperatures outside.
Objection.
Now, as far as the hard surface that you're talking about, would that include asphalt pavement?
Yes, it could.
And as far as those injuries, the speed, if Mr. O'Keefe was struck by a vehicle and was projected away from that vehicle and then struck his head on the ground, would that be sufficient force, in your opinion, to cause a skull fracture on the back of his head?
If all that happened, yes, and onto asphalt or something like asphalt, yes, if that's indeed what happened. But like for other reasons, I don't think that is what happened.
Now, you testified, or you asked some questions about your opinion as to, or consistency with the physical altercation, is that right?
Yes.
And the sort of swelling in Mr. O'Keefe's eyes as far as ecchymosis is concerned there, that was related to the brain injury, is that your understanding?
Well, the skull injury rather than the brain.
Skull injury, which leads to the bleeding of the brain, which then leads to the swelling of the eye.
Well, yeah, but no, I mean, let's be clear about this. I mentioned the fractures earlier on that came from the back and went all the way towards the front of the skull, including what are called the orbital plates, which are the bones, the parts of the frontal bone that are right over the eye sockets. And the bone there is very delicate. It's the thinnest part of the skull. Anyway, but the photographs and the autopsy report clearly show that the fracture involved that on each side, both orbital plates, in other words. And it's that fracture, it's not the brain itself, but it's that fracture which leads to the bleeding that causes the black eyes, if you want to call them that way.
And as far as what your review of the medical records, your review of the autopsy report, photographs, things like that, you observed nothing as far as fractures to Mr. O'Keefe's eye sockets, correct?
Well, the orbital plates, in a sense, are part of the eye sockets, but they're the roof.
Were there any fractures to the orbital bones?
There were no fractures that appeared to be coming from the front, no.
As far as the sclera, was there any broken blood vessels or anything that you observed in either the notes or the reports or the photographs or anything else that you saw?
Broken blood vessels were?
The sclera.
Huh?
Sclera of the eyes? You know what that is?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Just couldn't hear what you said, yeah. No, there was just, as far as I know, the eyes were clear, yeah. The eyes themselves were clear, yeah.
Now, as far as the minor injuries that you were talking about, as far as the eyelid or the nose, as far as those minor lacerations you were talking about, there was no bruising around any of those lacerations, correct?
The eyelid laceration, don't forget, is in the same area where they had the other injury, and it's a little bit hard to figure out whether how much hemorrhage, how much of that black eye could even be from related to the laceration, because you've got two possible explanations for the black eyes. One is the skull fracture I've already mentioned, but that doesn't rule out his getting an impact as well on the front, but there's no way you can separate them.
But as far as around those minor lacerations that you're talking about, you didn't observe or see any record of any bruising or any broken bones in those areas whatsoever?
No, the main one that I was relating to when I spoke about the altercation question was the laceration on the eyelid. That's not related to the head injury that we've been discussing. So it's a separate injury, and it's from some kind of blow to the front.
The minor lacerations that you observe, would they be consistent with being struck by broken pieces of glass or broken sharp pieces of plastic?
If it was indeed a laceration, as it was described, then no, because lacerations by definition, although this is a term that's often misused, by the way, even by some doctors, but a laceration by definition is an open wound caused by blunt force, not sharp.
So blunt force, as far as what I'm asking is it possible that the lacerations to his face were caused by a blunt object that then shattered and caused the lacerations to his face?
I find that hard to imagine. I find that very hard to even conceive of.
So it's not conceivable, is that what you're saying?
To me, no.
And from your review of whatever reports and medical records and everything else, what, if anything, did you see? Or did you see anything that had to do with an animal being present on scene or an animal being near Mr. O'Keefe's body or Mr. O'Keefe being inside the house?
I don't know. I mean, but I heard there was an animal somewhere around the place, a dog. I think you mentioned the dog earlier.
So somewhere around the place, but no evidence that you've seen that animal interacted with Mr. O'Keefe in any way?
No, I wasn't there, obviously, and all I can say is what I've already said, but I don't know any more than that.
I know you weren't there. What I'm saying is, from the material that you reviewed, was there any indication or any evidence of that animal ever being near, close to, or interacting in any way?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
I'm nothing further.
Well, thank you. Your Honor, if I may approach. Sure. Dr. Sheridan, if you could just take a look at that photograph. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I saw this photograph before.
Can you describe that photograph for jury?
It shows the decedent's knees taken from the right side, but you can see both knees.
Your Honor, permission to mark this and then publish it?
Mark it, put it into evidence. Okay, are there any objections, Lally?
No, Your Honor.
Dr. Sheridan, you were asked on cross-examination about injury to Mr. O'Keefe's knee. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes.
Is this the injury that you were testifying about earlier?
Yes, this has been mentioned before. It's an abrasion.
And that's the extent of the injury to Mr. O'Keefe.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, in that area. Yeah.
Thank you. No further questions.
All right, Dr. Sheridan, you are all set, sir.
Very well, thank you, Thank you, Your Honor.
So we are done for today. That's the doctors. Russell and Sheridan were pretty convincing. I'm gonna have to go back. I missed quite a few things. I was trying to take notes as quick as possible. I have 18 pages of notes for today. Tomorrow is the final day of trial 1 rewatch testimony, or for the first time for me. Trooper Paul, crash reconstruction is over 4.5 hours. Dr. Wolf, ARCA is a little over 1 hour. And Dr. Rentschler, also from ARCA, is the final defense witness, 40 minutes. I think they testify a lot longer in trial too. Then closing arguments are 2 hours and 56 minutes. So that's a total of about 9.5 hours. I will do it at 1.5 speed. I don't know what that's going to be, like maybe 6 to 7 hours. So if you want to show up tomorrow for that part, I'll see you there. Any final comments? Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thank you, Sensei Wackadoodle, for moderating. At this point, I'm not sure what to think. Do I have writer's cramp? I'm looking forward to getting out of this chair and taking a little bit of a break. Fern's mom, Trooper Paul, is comedy gold. All right, I'll have tomorrow to look forward to. He didn't come back for trial 2, right? They had Judson Welcher, I guess, replace him. I guess Judson Welcher, they spent $400,000, including buying a new SUV to match Karen's. I don't know. Thank you, Lily. All right, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Actually, it's 1 hour earlier than normal. Tomorrow's July 4th in the United States. I know most of you are not in the United States, though. I guess I'll see some of you tomorrow. If not, I'll see you when I see you. Thanks again for joining.